Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of what if Deku's mental health issues were treated somewhat realistically. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku had woken up that day not expecting much. He tried not to expect anything from any day anymore because that was just asking for disappointment. It was asking for the impossible. It had taken him years to realize, but he would never be worth anything. This was a fact he was absolutely certain was true. This was why he desperately wanted to be a hero. If he could help people, he was worth something, even if it wasn't much. Of course, there were other reasons, like how his mom smiled when he did chores for her, like how even when people weren't happy he helped them. There wasn't a way to hide their instant, pleased relief. The point was, if he could become a hero, he would feel like something. He wouldn't feel like he was just going through the motions every day. And he didn't feel like that now exactly. It was just that at school it was hard to not feel like he was the star of a reality TV show called Will They Help? And the answer was always no. Izuku woke up every morning, received a flicker of joy when his mom kissed him on the forehead on her way to work, got ready for school, went to school, dragged his feet through the insults and pranks that pulled at his shoes like sludge, came home, did his homework, made dinner for him and his mom, and then updated his notebooks while he idly gauged how long he could stay up before he went to sleep. Today he had woken up and his mom had left a note on the counter. It was on a pastel blue sticky note, because that was her favorite color, and it said that she had to do overtime today because one of the interns had messed up the paperwork for a case she was working on. His mother being gone was not a tragedy, he told himself as he pulled his shoes on. This would be a day like any other day. He numbly reassured. I'll be fine, he repeated as he went down the apartment stairs and toward the train station. He was wrong. His day started the same as it always did. He moved silently through the halls and people ignored him, or sneered at him, or laughed at him. They never talked to him in the morning. He got through morning classes easy enough. Only a few paper balls and airplanes launched at him that he quickly dismantled and put into the scrap paper section of his journal. During lunch, one of his classmates stole his lunch before he could walk out to the courtyard and wouldn't give it back. He added a new bento box to his shopping list. He checked his grade during lunch and saw that he had a 0 for one of his assignments that he was certain he had turned in, and sighed. His teacher called on him to answer a question during math, but when he stuttered in giving the answer, the class laughed and the teacher rolled his eyes before calling on someone else. It was the same as usual. It was the same insults that were carved into his desk. It was the same tactics they had used since he started middle school. It was the same until the end of the day, when their teacher was going to check over their high school applications. Izuku had applied to a variety of high schools, though he hoped to get into UA, where they would teach him how to be worth something. But Izuku's smart decisions meant nothing compared to his mistake of applying to UA. When he looked back, he almost couldn't believe he had the audacity to even hope that someone as useless as him could ever help people, could ever deserve a chance in the hero course of a school that churned out the top heroes of every generation. What a joke. Bakugo was leaning back in his chair, the perfect picture of the likable bad boy to everyone in their class, including Izuku. Despite the years that he had tortured Izuku, finding him behind the school to insult him, blasting his school supplies away when he tried to work on things during lunch, watching with no emotion as his friends left bruises, sometimes leaving burns. Despite all of that, Izuku thought that Bakugo would be an amazing hero. Determination oozed from Bakugo like the sweat that powered his quirk, guaranteeing that he would not leave anyone behind, that he would save as many people as he possibly could. This sentiment held steady even when Bakugo glared daggers at him when the teacher announced Izuku's hopeful application to UA. It held steady as Bakugo snarled at him, crowding Izuku against the wall. It held steady when he threw Izuku's smoking analysis notebook out of the window. It held steady as Bakugo singed his uniform, burning away a layer of his skin and leaving the wound exposed to the cold air as he turned away. This sentiment shattered when Bakugo looked over his shoulder, his eyes blood red and burning with rage and yet ice cold at the same time. Here's a word of advice, nerd. Don't even think of applying or else. Bakugo said this easily, a small smirk pulling on one side of his mouth. The boy beside him spoke up as Izuku pushed his back harder against the wall, trying desperately to ground himself. That's just sad. I thought you would have at least some fight in you. He scoffed. The breaths Izuku was taking sped up imperceptibly. They just had to leave. They just had to leave the room and then he would be able to breathe. He would be able to cry. The tears burning in his throat froze solid when Bakugo said his parting lines. You know, if you really want to be a hero that badly, there's actually another way. Just pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. A feral grin stretched his mouth wide, his eyes tracking Izuku's expression. Apparently he didn't react enough to keep Bakugo's attention, however. because he quickly turned around to leave, his cronies cracking up behind him. Today was not the same as any other day. He managed to get himself together to go home. He pushed his discarded desk chair back into place, put his day shoes in their cubby, and then wrung as much water as possible out of his notebook. He couldn't get the idea out of his head though. Bakugo probably thought he was the first to suggest suicide to Izuku, but he wasn't. Many of his peers had enjoyed the pain on his face when they suggested it. Take a swan dive off of the roof, jump in front of a train, drown yourself in the bath, hang yourself, slit your wrists, jump into a villain attack and let them do all the work. No, it was not the first time someone had told him to kill himself. And it was most likely not the last. Despite the short amount of time he planned on having left, he was sure that someone else would give him the advice. What had made this time so much more scathing than all the other times was that it was Bakugo. It was his childhood friend. It was Kaken, the only one besides his mother who used to see anything in him at all. It didn't feel like anything snapped. To Izuku, this final straw felt more like a gentle wind, finally blowing a feather off of a cliff. It felt almost like he was floating. He had finally been coerced off of the cliff, and the fall was gentle. The rocky shore below the cliff was dark and welcoming, and the feather swayed side to side with grace as it made its way to the bottom. It was bound to happen eventually. He wasn't even mad. He was almost disappointed. If he went through with it, and he did plan on going through with it, Bakugo would feel terrible for saying that. Izuku paused on his walk home, looking up at the cobble of the bridge he was passing under. Would Bakugo feel bad? This thought should have been striking, but it was more revealing than anything. If he didn't do it at school, then surely Bakugo might never find out the exact circumstances of his death, and even if he did, the distance would be enough to relieve Bakugo of any guilt. Izuku nodded to himself, the tears on his face drying slightly as he made plans. Maybe he could even make it a spread in his journal. The best way to kill himself without any collateral damage. The logistics of Deku's suicide. That sounded like a good title. He was almost out of the tunnel when the lid to a sewer popped off. Izuku startled, turning around quickly only to be engulfed in slime. The lack of air already apparent when he tried to gasp and realized that all there was dark green slime. So rancid smelling that he wanted to gag, but couldn't because there was slime over his mouth. Izuku struggled because this was not how he wanted it to go. He wanted to write a note to his mother, and he wanted to do it himself. He didn't want to be more of a victim than he already was. And then he was saved. And then All Might, the #1 hero, told Izuku that he could not be a hero. Izuku doesn't know why he asked. He had felt that same spark of joy that he gets from mornings with his mother when All Might signed his journal and he got carried away. The life temporarily returning to his cheeks as he gushed over All Might's strengths. All Might brutally reminded him that he would never have. Even if I don't have a quirk, can I become a hero? All Might cut an imposing figure. The setting sun silhouetted him on the roof so that his face was in shadow as he answered. His hand came up to touch at his side as he spoke, his muscle-bound shoulders tightening. I'm the symbol of peace. People everywhere have to think that I'm never afraid. All Might began, but honestly, I smiled to hide the fear inside. It's just a brave face I put on when the pressure is high. This job isn't easy. Pro heroes are constantly risking their lives. Some villains just can't be beaten without powers. So no, I honestly don't think you can be a hero without a quirk. His voice was firm, certain in his stance. I see. Izuku managed to respond. And then another gust of wind pushed the feather even harder. The feather was no longer anywhere near the cliff. Now it was floating toward the dark waters over the open sea. The cliff out of reach, due to the breeze pulling the feather even further from the edge. If you want to help people, there's plenty of other ways to do it. All Might soothed him, an uncomfortable expression on his face. You can become a police officer. They get crap because the heroes capture most of the villains. But it's a fine profession. It's not bad to have a dream, young man. Just make sure your dreams are obtainable, realistic, do you understand? And then All Might left, launching himself off of the roof and in the direction of the police department, the bottle of sludge villain clutched in his hand. Izuku wanted to laugh. He really did. Because All Might, the #1 hero, had left him on the roof of a very tall apartment building. A very tall apartment building with no one else around right after telling him he couldn't possibly achieve his dream. He managed to get a single breath of laughter out before it turned into a sob. All of the emotion that he had been pushing down, deep down into his heart sprung to the surface and he cried. His knees finally collapsed. A squish sound rose from the ground alongside a dull thunk as he did so, his uniform still soaked in sewage. He let his forehead rest against the ground and let everything out. 30 minutes later, he knocked on the door of the stairwell of the apartment building and apologized profusely to the annoyed woman who opened it for him. On his way home, he habitually looked at the hero news and was relieved to see that All Might had been able to turn in the slime villain despite Izuku's impulsive actions. There was already a small fulf piece about All Might's sudden appearance in front of the station. He was filled with shame, the feeling itchy and prickling under his skin by the time he unlocked his apartment door. The note was still on the counter. Izuku traced his fingers over his mother's neat kanji, and he pressed down harder on the small heart she had doodled in the corner. He had to do it now. It was the perfect time. His mother wouldn't be home until at least midnight, and he had ample time to write a note. His original plan of getting the details right flew out of the window as he assessed the opportunity here. He had to do it now. He wrote a letter, and he put it on the counter next to the note his mother had written that morning. It was full of love. There was only one mention of his death, and it was only there to assure her that it was not her fault. Izuku hoped it would be enough. He felt silly, but he didn't want to die in his school uniform. He changed into some jeans and a black shirt. Not his favorite, but white felt inappropriate for the occasion. As he made his way out of the house, he grabbed another sticky note and folded it in half, for Katsuki, written on the front. He didn't want to let this window of opportunity go to waste. But he also didn't want Bakugo to feel like it was his fault. With how closely his suicide would coincide to Bakugo's teasing, it felt imperative that he leave a loophole for Bakugo to alleviate himself of any guilt he felt. He left his shoes at the door. Izuku walked up the cold cement stairs slowly, trying to imagine solutions to his problems, just to be certain. He was on the last step when he was sure there were none, or at least none that would affect the present, his current reality. The wind was light, the sky was dark, and Izuku felt relief slowly unfurl inside of his chest. He wouldn't have to do anything anymore. He wouldn't have to pretend. He wouldn't have to worry about taking up space and being useless. He would be free. He clambered over the railing of the building and didn't hesitate. He took a small bunny hop off of the building and started to lean back so that his head would his first. He felt the wind rushing past his hair, and for a second he was the feather. The wind cradled him gently as it lowered him to the ground, and then there was a sharp pull on his ankle that, by now, was facing the sky due to his aerial movement. He opened his eyes slowly, looking down first to see that he was 2/3 of the way toward the ground. Any slower and the meddler would have been too late. But as it was, even if Izuku struggled out of the grip on his ankle, the impact would most likely not be enough to kill him. He turned his green eyes up, following the stripe of gray wrapped around his ankle to the man who leaned over the railing of the building, his hair floating away from his face in an inkai black aura, and his eyes a bright blood red. How unfortunate, Izuku thought. The haze from shoving his feelings back down after his cry on the roof of the other apartment building came back. He kept his face neutral as the man started to slowly let Izuku down to the ground. His head and then back made contact with the cement in slow motion, it seemed. Because there was no pressure, no impact, the exact opposite of what Izuku had set out to accomplish. Tears sprung to his eyes again. He couldn't do anything right, could he? He couldn't make friends. He couldn't get good grades, no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't blend into the background. He couldn't even kill himself. The hero scaffolded down from the building, his extremely long scarf still wrapped around Izuku's ankle. Izuku planned out what he would say, something respectful, because from the hero's perspective he had just saved Izuku. It had to be something reassuring to make sure the hero left him alone. This planning was why when the hero finally stood above Izuku, his hair no longer floating, Izuku gave him a tearful smile. It wasn't actually supposed to be tearful, it was just that Izuku didn't have the energy to either push the tears back down or let them fall. He gave the hero the best smile he could muster, and he said, "Very good work, sir. I won't be throwing myself off another roof anytime soon, so you can go back to your business." This was not a lie, Izuku told himself, because he most definitely would be using a method where heroes would be less likely to interrupt him as soon as this hero left him to his business. The hero raised an eyebrow. The scarf did not remove itself from Izuku's ankle, and Izuku did not make any move to get up as he waited for the hero to leave. Contrary to Izuku's hopes, his carefully chosen words did nothing to relieve the hero of any worry. In fact, they did the opposite. Izuku was showing almost no emotion. The shaky smile on his face and his tear-filled eyes contrasted his monotone voice so harshly that it was uncanny, and he had no reaction to the fact that his ankle was clearly swelling. Izuku, coming to the bleary conclusion that the hero couldn't remove the scarf from the Izuku's ankle himself, finally sat up and removed the gray scrap of fabric. Izuku stood up, the hero's eyebrow climbing even further on his face as he balanced himself as evenly as possible. The pain of his ankle was hitting him now, but the hero had to leave if Izuku wanted to get this done with before his mother came home. "I'm all right, sir," Izuku reassured the hero, his plastered-on smile trembling. "Sorry for the inconvenience," he said over his shoulder, turning quickly toward the door of his apartment building. Gray strips of fabric caught at his limbs. The hero's eyes were unreadable. He made his way closer to Izuku and put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing. "I highly doubt that you are all right," the hero said. And then there was a sharp hit to the side of his head. And then there was nothing. "Shota," Present Mike screeched at his longtime best friend, though not at glass-shattering levels, as he was being mindful of the teenager wrapped up in Shota's capture weapon. "You cannot just abduct a suicide attemptee. He doesn't even have any ID on him." Actually, he did. Aizawa Shota grumbled, trying to set the kid down on the waiting room couch in a way that wouldn't make his limbs fall asleep. It was just his middle school ID. It doesn't have any information aside from his name. Aizawa adjusted the kid's legs and then stepped away from the couch. The kid, Midoriya Izuku, was unusually small for a teenage boy in his last year of middle school. He was completely swallowed by Aizawa's capture weapon. The excess piled up under his head as a makeshift pillow. Even in his sleep he looked unassuming. Monotone is the most dangerous way possible. Present Mike, otherwise known as Yamada Hisashi, has gone quiet. His eyes also turned toward the child on the couch. Did he leave a note on the roof? Yamada asked softly, worried over how Midoriya's pale and freckled face seemed to blend in with the gray of Aizawa's capture weapon, like it belonged there. No, Aizawa replies gruffly. There weren't even shoes on the roof. Around them, people sat in the waiting room reading magazines and yawning. The walk-in clinic that Aizawa had brought the boy to was mainly used by off-duty heroes for injuries that happened outside of hero work. Just glancing around the room, Yamada saw a few vaguely familiar faces, though it was hard to tell when no one was in costume. It had been about an hour since Aizawa had first called Yamada and explained about the kid. Aizawa had been out on patrol, on his way to investigate an area around the park that had seen frequent muggings lately. From the corner of his eye he had seen Midoriya walking across the roof. At first he brushed it off. The sun was setting. The figure was probably just there to watch it. But as the figure walked steadily toward the edge of the building, Aizawa had changed direction without thinking, a feeling of urgency finding its way behind his collarbone. Using his capture weapon to catapult himself across rooftops, he skid to a stop just in time to see the kid. It was definitely a kid. He was so short, climb over the railing and take a small hop off of the building. Aizawa had rushed forward and just managed to snag the kid's ankle in time for him not to become a splat on the ground. Aizawa told Yamada that the kid had tried to brush the whole thing off. Yamada couldn't really imagine the brass it would take to do something like that. If it was him, he would have started sobbing immediately. But the kid had tried to go back inside, had told Aizawa that he did a good job saving him but that he was just fine now. Yamada had been gaping on the other side of the phone when Aizawa recalled this. After that, Aizawa had asked Yamada to meet him at the clinic. He knew he wasn't the best at being comforting, and he needed someone to watch over the kid while he tried to figure out his identity. This had been before Aizawa checked the kid's pockets and found his school ID in his phone, which surprisingly didn't have a passcode. So, Aizawa didn't need to figure out the kid's identity and Yamada didn't have to watch him, but they still stood over him together, waiting for him to either wake up or for the doctor to call them back to check out his ankle. Yamada stared at Midoriya's bare feet. It was an odd detail to focus on, but he could perfectly imagine the kid's ankle slipping out of Aizawa's grasp without a shoe or even a sock to stop the slide of the scarf. He was so lucky. Yamada couldn't help but think that Aizawa's captured weapon wasn't as slippery as it looked, and that Aizawa had perfect aim with it. Next to him, Aizawa was fiddling with Midoriya's phone. Yamada glanced over and saw the contact page. Only 3 numbers entered. "Geez, kid," Yamada muttered under his breath. He read the names, Mom, Aunt Mitsuki, and Kaken. Aizawa clicked the contact that said Mom and held it to his ear. Yamada listened to it ring from next to him and then sighed in disappointment when a robotic voice instructed Aizawa to leave a message. "Midoriya-san, your son is currently under my care at a clinic because of an." Aizawa paused here, trying to decide whether it was appropriate to tell a woman that her son tried to commit suicide on the phone. He decided that no, it wasn't, and continued. "Injury. He is in good hands. Pro hero Present Mike is here and I am also an underground hero. We will watch over your son until you can come get him." Yamada noticed the kid starting to stir as Aizawa gave Midoriya-san the address. "Hey little listener," he called out once Midoriya had opened his eyes all the way. Aizawa came to stand beside him and the duo watched as Midoriya wiggled inside of the capture weapon cocoon that Aizawa had encased him in. After deciding that he was not going to get out of the cocoon anytime soon, he looked up at them, his eyes immediately widening. "Present Mike," he squeaked out, big green eyes moving rapidly back and forth between Yamada and Aizawa and sweeping the rest of the room in between. "That's me," Yamada responded, sticking a thumb out and pointing at his face. Silence. A yawn from the other side of the waiting room. "Where am I?" Midoriya choked out. Aizawa and Yamada exchanged a look. Aizawa knelt down next to the kid so they were closer to eye level. "I brought you to a clinic to get your ankle checked out," he said calmly. Midoriya seemed to find some purchase with this clarification. "Thank you, sir," he started. "But you really didn't have to do that. It doesn't hurt that much." Aizawa slid his gaze up to Yamada, giving him a "can you see what I was talking about" look. And yeah, he could kind of see what he was talking about. Midoriya seemed completely sincere. His ankle, that was swollen beyond belief and probably dislocated, didn't hurt that much. Yamada laughed, trying to break the awkward silence that had fallen after Aizawa turned to glare at the kid. "What? Do you have a quirk that lets you not feel pain?" he said with fake mirth. Midoriya flinched into the makeshift pillow, a scrap of the scarf falling over one of his eyes from the harsh movement. I don't have a quirk," Midoriya stuttered, averting his eyes and wiggling in the cocoon uncomfortably. "Oh," Yamada said. The shock of receiving this answer was apparent on his face. "Aizawa," a man sitting at the help desk called out. Aizawa nodded to the man and then grabbed a handle only he could see in the cocoon and hauled Midoriya up, the scarf untangling around him until the kid was standing unsteadily on his bare feet. Before Midoriya could say anything, Aizawa settled a hand on his back and started pushing him toward the door, Yamada keeping pace behind them. Yamada was going over the numbers in his head. Admittedly, he wasn't really a numbers kind of guy, but even he knew that the probability of a 14-year-old being quirkless in Japan was low. Very, very low. 20% of the whole world was quirkless as of the last census. That meant that in Japan, a place that embraced quirks early on, the percentage of quirkless people was even lower. Beyond that, that small percentage was mostly made up of the elderly. The fact that a teenager without a quirk existed was almost unfathomable. A doctor appeared by Aizawa's side as he pushed Midoriya into the room they were pointed toward. And then Aizawa manhandled the kid into a chair. "So, you wrote down here that there was swelling on the ankle," she said, glasses poised on the end of her nose as she looked at the paperwork and closed the door. "Yes," Aizawa said gruffly. "That'll be easy for me to fix," she said easily. "As long as I have permission to use my quirk on the patient, that is." "What is your quirk?" Midoriya asked quietly. "I like that you're making an informed decision." She laughed. "My quirk is called Back in Place. It allows me to slot any one thing back into its rightful position while reversing any damage done. So, if someone tore a chunk out a loaf of bread and I touched that chunk, it would just slot back into place." Yamada kept his eyes on the kid throughout the doctor's explanation. Some life seemed to come back to the kid as he listened, his eyes focused intently on the doctor. "So if I..." Midoriya leaned over to the jar of popsicle sticks and took one out, promptly breaking it in half and then holding it out for the doctor. "Oh," she said, surprise flickering across her face. "I'm not quite sure. No one has ever. Usually it's actually part of a whole, like the bread metaphor." Midoriya just held out the popsicle stick from his seat, stretching his arm a little further. "I suppose I could try," the doctor said, pushing up her glasses as she grabbed the two halves of the stick. Yamada watched, fascinated, as the popsicle stick glowed a light orange color and danced out of the doctor's hand and back into the jar. And the doctor let out a delighted hum. "I've been using my quirk since I was 4 years old and I had never thought about what was considered a hole." She clapped her hands together in glee, her white hair swishing behind her as her ponytail swung from the sudden movement. "So, can I?" She gestured toward his ankle. However, Midoriya was looking at the popsicle jar. He grabbed another one and broke it and then held it behind his back. "Do you think if you touch the other ones, that would activate your quirk?" He had sparkles in his eyes as he asked. The doctor raised an eyebrow and humored the kid, leaning over to touch the massive popsicle sticks. They all watched as the stick floated out of Izuku's hand and into the jar. "Well then," the doctor looked at Midoriya. "That's 2 things I didn't know before, but I must insist on fixing your ankle. It looks rather painful." "Right," Midoriya squeaked, probably embarrassed over stalling, and easily mollified by the doctor's curt persistence. Midoriya scrambled to lift his ankle up so that she could touch it more easily. Aizawa and Yamada watched as the swelling disappeared from Midoriya's ankle, the same light orange briefly flaring around his ankle and then receding. "Do you have any other injuries that you need treated while you're here?" the doctor asked while she pulled back her hand. "No," Midoriya began to say before Aizawa talked over him. "I think he has an injury on his shoulder. When he was asleep he was favoring his left side." Aizawa cut another glare toward the kid. "Well, let's have a look then," the doctor said, seemingly unaffected by the weird energy in the room. Midoriya nodded and pulled the neck of his black t-shirt back to show her a burn that covered almost his entire right shoulder. "Christ," Yamada said upon seeing it. The kid turned his face away from them. "This looks like it's only 1st degree, but I would like to bandage it for you. If you want your," she hesitated, "guardians to step out of the room, we can arrange that." The doctor was gathering supplies as she spoke. "Yes please," Midoriya said, glancing over at them. Yamada looked over at Aizawa, and seeing the stubborn look on his face made an executive decision. "Sure thing, little listener. We'll be right outside," Yamada yelled as he pulled Aizawa out of the door with him. As soon as the door was fully shut, Aizawa turned his glare on Yamada. The kid clearly wanted some space soda. Yamada found himself on the defense immediately. Right, because leaving a kid who not 3 hours ago threw himself off of a building alone is a good idea. Aizawa responded. "He's not alone. The doctor is in there with him." Yamada threw back. Aizawa's shoulders slumped at this and he leaned against the door. "I'm sorry, Hisashi." He dragged a hand down his face. "I just don't like how this looks," Aizawa admitted. Yamada shook his head and reached over to link their hands. "I don't either." Izuku was so tired. It seemed improbable that only a few hours ago he was so close to never being tired ever again. A quiet anger was simmering under his skin at the man dressed in black with the weird scarf. It was quiet because logically he knew why the man had stopped him. If he was looking at it from an outside perspective, he could acknowledge that the hero had done the correct thing. However, he was not on the outside. He was on the inside, and he felt trapped, since he had woken up the hero and present Mike, like actually the pro-hero present Mike, had been hovering over him. The only alone time he had was when the nice doctor bandaged his burn and thankfully didn't say anything about the faint bruises littering his body from past beatings that week. After that, though, the two of them sat on either side of Izuku while they waited for his mom to show up. It was awkward. Present Mike had made an attempt at conversation, but after getting minutely excited by the doctor's quirk, Izuku couldn't bring his energy back up. That interaction had stolen the rest of the life that he had left in him after ending it. Except, again, he didn't end his pathetic life because someone had caught him. The anger bubbled up briefly before he glanced to the left and saw the hero had his eyes closed and was leaning his head against the wall with exhaustion. Abruptly, any anger that he had left disappeared. The hero was just doing what everyone would agree was right. He couldn't have known that Izuku was just a waste of space. He had no idea that Izuku was just following through on years of advice. This was a setback, yes, but a temporary one. He just needed to get out of this without his mom finding out the specifics of his injury, and then he would be free to try again. Izuku wondered why the hero hadn't told his mother what had happened over the phone. He had woken up just in time to catch the tail end of the hero's message to his mom. Maybe he considered it inappropriate to tell a mother that her son had committed suicide over a phone message. A calm settled over him. He still had a chance then. The feather, that had been caught up in a torrent of wind attempting to stop its descent into the water, was finally spit out of the gale. The feather was higher up than before, but it was still steadily floating toward the dark water. He mindlessly picked at his fingernails while he thought about his approach. Clearly, they wouldn't let him leave alone, that much was certain. His mom hadn't called back, but he was certain that she was on her way by now. As soon as she listened to the message, she would have been out of the firm and speeding toward him. The heroes would probably try to confront her, tell her what had happened. But his mom trusted him. He just wouldn't give them a chance to explain. This is why Izuku burst into tears as soon as he saw his mother running up to the glass doors of the clinic. Crying had always come easily to him. Before quirklessness became his fatal flaw in the eyes of his schoolmates, crying had been the thing they teased him about. Common insults like crybaby, wimp, and facet face were things he had become accustomed to by 5. When his quirklessness was revealed, the insults shifted and became much more vicious. This ultimately led to more crying until he became desensitized to most forms of name-calling. But the truth was that he always felt like crying. He had gained a lot more control over his leaky eyes since being 5, and he barely cried unless he was alone in his room anymore, but he could always feel it. A lump in his throat that made him choke on his words. A heat at the back of his eyes that made it hard to look at anyone head-on. A trembling of his lungs when he got overwhelmed. Crying, he was confident, was not something that would be hard for him to fake because really, he wouldn't be faking it. When the first silent tears streamed down his cheeks in hot rivulets, he was focusing on the blurry image of his mom through the doors. However, he could still see the dual flinches of the heroes sitting either side of him. Present Mike was already leaning forward, reaching out a hand to put it on his now shaking shoulder. Izuku didn't let that happen. As soon as his mother saw him, he could see the sympathy tears forming in her own eyes. She rushed forward, her arms open for a hug that he jumped into instantly. This created distance between him and his mother and the waiting heroes. "Baby," Inko cried, sinking a hand into his hair and petting him as he let out a sob into her shoulder. "Baby, what happened?" This was the hard part. "I fell." He forced the words out through his tears. "You fell," Inko repeated gently, her hand still gently carding its way through Izuku's hair. Izuku wasn't facing the heroes, but he could imagine their faces as they watched him and his mother have this conversation. Present Mike, confused and hesitant. The hero with the scarf, stoic. "I got home early and I decided to go for a walk, and I went up on that bridge that I usually go under on the way home because I realized I've never walked on it before instead of under it, and then I wanted to sketch out the street, but while I was doing that I lost my balance." Izuku let more wetness leak into his voice as he continued. "And fell off, and I must have landed wrong because my ankle hurt really bad, and then I fell on my shoulder, but then the hero was there to help me, but I wasn't sure if I should go with him because he's never been on the news and I didn't recognize him." But then he let his voice fall away completely into hysterical sobs. He felt his mother's arms tighten around him. She was careful not to disrupt the bandages that she could see winding their way around his shoulder. "Oh baby, I'm sure you did the right thing. He called me while you were getting treated and he explained the whole thing. You're okay, sweetheart. I'm so sorry that you got hurt. You really have to be more careful." Izuku, just like he expected her to. His mother started off on a tangent, her instincts to console him overriding any suspicion she might have had about his story. Midoriya-san, he heard the scarf hero start to talk and sobbed louder. "Can we just go home, Mom?" He pulled back from the hug so that all of her attention was on him. "I'm so tired, I just want to go home." He threw in a sniffle at the end for good measure. Of course, baby, she said to Izuku, taking his hand before turning to the heroes. Thank you so much for looking after him after he got hurt. Have a nice night. They were already halfway through the door before the heroes started to react. Present Mike threw out a frantic wait, miss that's not, and the scarf hero was moving forward very quickly like he was going to grab her shoulder. But then Izuku was pushing open the glass door and breathing in the night air. And he could see his mother's car parked right on the curb. As his mom started the car, he leaned forward in the passenger seat to see the stoic hero standing in front of the glass doors, a murderous look on his face and Present Mike at his side as they both watched the car drive away. Did he just? Yamada started to say, incredulous at what had just unfolded. Yes, Aizawa gritted. His jaw was clenched so tight that Yamada could see a vein standing out on his forehead. He was so quiet that whole time I didn't think he would. Yamada continued. I didn't either, Aizawa confirmed. What do we do? Yamada cried out. I don't. Aizawa began. I mean, you know his apartment complex, but that was a really big apartment place and we can't go knock on every door. I mean, we have hero stuff to do and the school year isn't over yet. And Yamada took in a large gulp of air. And you have his whole name. But who's to say he's the only Midoriya Izuku in this prefecture, and on the crazy chance that he is? Even then, who can say that we'll get Persimmon to track him when you're the only witness to the event? And we all know that the commission doesn't really care about civilians as much as they care about villains, and like, sure, his story was good. I mean, I would have been convinced, but he still didn't have shoes on. Will she figure it out on her own, or will she not even notice? I mean, Hizashi, Aizawa barked out. Yamada stopped talking, taking in the look on Aizawa's face. Inverse to his husband's normally slumped posture, Aizawa was holding himself taut, his shoulders hitched up and his hands and fists by his side. Aizawa's jaw was still clenched, and now that he was looking, he could see that Aizawa was just as lost as Yamada felt. We couldn't have been prepared for that, Yamada said, quickly switching from his own external spiral to pulling Aizawa out of his internal one. The kid clearly planned that, Aizawa replied. He was in tears right when she walked through the door. He had a story and he physically removed her from making contact with us at all. We can't read minds, Shota, Yamada soothed, reaching out to take one of Aizawa's fists into his hand and pry the fingers apart. It's out of our hands now. Not completely, Aizawa replied, relaxing into Yamada's hold. What do you mean? When I gave the kid his stuff back, I gave him my business card. So, maybe he'll reach out, Yamada said, a grin splitting his face. I doubt it, Aizawa replied grimly. When they got home, the first thing Izuku did was make sure he was inside before his mom was. He sprinted from the doorway to the counter and snatched his letters off of the counter, shoving them into his pants pocket and wrinkling them horribly. He heard his mother laugh from the hallway before the sound of the door closing behind her echoed throughout the apartment. He made his way in front of his room. I know you're a tired sweetheart, but running to bed and walking to bed won't really change how much time you get to sleep. Throughout the car ride, Izuku had managed to raise the energy enough that his mom was no longer sending him pitying glances. Izuku laughed too. His mother couldn't tell the difference between the empty kind and the real kind, because he had been using the former for far too long. As she passed him in the hallway, she ruffled his hair. Get some sleep, Izuku. I'll probably have to stay late again tomorrow since I left early today. Just a heads up. She was shuffling down toward her room by the end of the sentence, yawning. Okay, Mom, Izuku replied. Sleep tight. You too, baby, she called. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, Izuku sagged against the wall. He couldn't believe he had just lied to his mother's face right in front of two pro heroes. He felt guilt wash over him. The feeling sinking into him like a bucket of it was just poured over his head, starting with his head, bogging down his thoughts, and then making its way down his face, furrowing his brow and guiding his lip between his teeth so that he could gnaw on it. The feeling settled in his toes, making every step he took into his room feel heavy. He had just lied to his mother's face because he wanted to try again. He didn't let her know what happened because he had fucked up the first time and selfishly wanted a second chance. He peeled off his shirt and started to put on an oversized All Might shirt to sleep in, but stopped halfway through. The fabric was soft and the image of All Might was so blurry from so many washings that he could barely see it, except for that he could because All Might's face was now ingrained into his brain after meeting him in person. His bright blue eyes, his chiseled face, his tall muscled form that screamed power. He clutched the t-shirt tighter as he held it in front of himself and let All Might's words echo in his ears. You cannot be a hero. Izuku swallowed thickly and shoved the t-shirt back into his dresser. It was warm out anyway. He would have been too hot with it on. As he took off his jeans in exchange for red pajama shorts, he emptied his pockets, setting his phone on his desk to charge like always and putting his school ID back into his backpack. He put the letters in his desk drawer, idly thinking about how he would revise them, and then check to make sure his pockets were the right way in. The fingertips of his right hand ran into the hard edge of another piece of paper. Digging it out, he expected a mean note from his classmates that he had habitually slipped into his pocket when he found it, but no. It was a sleek business card. The only thing on the front was Eraserhead. He flipped it over to find a name, Aizawa Shouta, and a phone number. It must be the Scarf Hero's card, unless it wasn't and Izuku had picked up someone's card and was now being incredibly rude for not remembering them. No, it was probably the hero's card. Probably. Izuku put it in his desk drawer and turned off the light and climbed into bed, and the feather drifted. Izuku woke up the next day not expecting much. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, today was just another day of the lifelong game show titled Push Izuku past his breaking point. No one knew that Bakugo Katsuku already had the grand prize. Today was another normal day, and the day prior was included in that same category. For everyone else, yesterday was not the day that they finally decided to kill themselves because their childhood best friend had suggested it. It was not the day that they had gotten attacked by a slime monster and been unable to do anything to save themselves. It had not been the day that they had met their lifelong hero, who then told them that they could never accomplish their dreams. It was not the day that they had thrown themselves off of a roof only to be saved by a mysterious stranger who turned out to be a pro-hero named Eraser. It was not the day that they then proceeded to be knocked out by said hero and taken to a clinic where the present Mike, asked them if they had a quirk and they had to say no and probably made it really awkward for present Mike. It was not the day that they had lied to their own mother's face about committing suicide and then drove away while seeing the pain on two heroes who just wanted to help them's faces. No, that was just Izuku's yesterday, and the way his day had gone so far proved that. He woke up, got ready for school, and didn't receive a forehead kiss from his mother as she left the apartment a bit earlier than usual to get a jump start on the paperwork she didn't finish last night. He walked to school, got shoved around as he put on his day shoes, sat down in his homeroom and tried to decide if it would be worth it to talk to his math teacher about the missing assignment that he had most definitely turned in. This was something that happened fairly often. Izuku shared all of his classes with Kaken, and Kaken was going to be a hero. Some teachers wanted to see Kaken on the top of the grade book because they thought it would increase his chances of being accepted into a good hero school. They were probably right. So, sometimes if Izuku was doing particularly well in a class and he edged out on top of Kaken, he would suddenly find an assignment marked down or missing and his grade would drop just enough that Kaken was once again on top, where he should be. Despite Izuku's shocking revelation yesterday that Kaken might not be prime hero material, what with suicide baiting someone and all, Izuku didn't begrudge him for this. Kaken would probably be furious if he found out that the teachers were letting him win. A tiny smile formed on Izuku's face as he thought about Kaken shouting obscenities at their frail old math teacher. Even though Izuku's reality felt very changed, his goal in life being entirely different from yesterday, he could depend upon his classmates and teachers to stay the same. Sure, Izuku didn't bother raising his hand to answer questions, but the teachers still called on and then dismissed him anyway. People still threw paper balls at him and tripped him when he went to sharpen his pencil. Izuku hadn't bothered to bring a lunch today, half because he still didn't have a new bento and half because he just didn't. Today was a normal day. Izuku went home, did his homework, made dinner for him and his mother because she ended up not having to stay late again, and then retired to his room. His room was covered wall to wall with All Might posters. This was something that had not been important to Izuku until after yesterday. He didn't hate All Might. All Might was his hero. He was the hero. Izuku was pretty sure that you would have to be some kind of supervillain to hate All Might. And yet, standing in his room surrounded on all sides by All Might's wide grin, Izuku suddenly felt like he was suffocating. Izuku set his backpack down next to his desk and then stood in the middle of his room and tried to breathe. It wasn't happening though. He took in a large breath through his nose and it was like his lungs rejected it. He took in a gulp of air through his mouth, but it went down the wrong pipe and the air was in his stomach and he felt like he was going to puke. He couldn't get enough oxygen and he was wasting what little he could get by swallowing it. All Might's eyes stared at him from all sides. Izuku gasped and shook, and then one of his hands was tearing at a limited edition poster, and then the poster was in shreds on the floor and Izuku was fully crying now. Not the showy sobs of last night, but silent tears and hiccups as he stared down at the brightly colored paper that littered the ground. He had waited in line at a comic shop for hours to get that poster and he didn't even feel bad, and that made the air in his stomach condense into stone. He didn't feel bad. Why didn't he feel bad? Izuku's hands dropped from the wall and he clutched them together. This wasn't right. He needed to scream to get the frigid air turned to stone out of his stomach, or he needed to talk to someone, but Izuku pulled his gaze away from the torn remnants of All Might's smile and crossed his room, smacking the light switch down violently. His hands were still shaking. He could feel them tremble even if he couldn't see them. His room descended into complete blackness. Without all of the eyes on him, he felt his breathing slowly return to normal. He flexed his toes against the floor, pressing them down as hard as possible to anchor himself. Izuku hovered in front of his light switch for what felt like hours, his now steady hand trailing down the wall to fall at his side at a snail's pace. That was fine. He was just overwhelmed. He was just but by what? Izuku's emotions swirled around underneath his skin in an incomprehensible whirlpool. He managed to navigate to his backpack in the dark and he pulled out his notebook and pencil case. He set them down on his bed, then blindly shucked off his clothes. Izuku turned numbly to his bed and burrowed under the covers. He turned on his phone flashlight, illuminating the little cave he had made, and shuffled around what he had dragged with him until his notebook laid open to a blank page and he had his pencil in one hand. He scrawled out a title in shaky handwriting. What now? And that was the question, wasn't it? Izuku had spent today like he had spent any other day, but it had felt worse than any other day before it. Izuku sketched out a box and then started to draw a whirlpool in it. His pencil lead splintered, small slivers of it flaking off as he dragged the tip in circles that left both a line and an imprint in the paper. Izuku had thrown himself off of a building. He put a bullet point next to the box with the whirlpool and wrote that out. He was pretending that he hadn't. The next bullet point was drawn. He wished that he had succeeded. That was the third point. He drew a long rectangle that went from one margin to the other underneath the whirlpool box. In all capital letters he wrote, "Prerequisites to a second attempt." His mother needed to be out of the house. It would be completely traumatizing for both of them if she walked in on him. This would be the hardest prerequisite to meet. His mother and him usually left the house at the same time, and Inko arrived only 2 hours after Izuku got home from school. And Izuku was uncertain if that would be long enough. Maybe, just don't do it at home. But it couldn't be in public. Or, at the very least, not a residential or commercial area that heroes commonly patrolled in. He had learned his lesson with Eraserhead. He couldn't risk another hero's intervention. He doubted he would be able to talk his way out of whatever he tried next. That was it really. 2 simple things that ultimately boiled down to no interruptions and as little collateral damage as possible. He opened an incognito tab in Chrome and Googled best way to commit suicide. The first thing that came up was a helpline. The phone number was large and bolded on the screen. Izuku scrolled past it. Talking to a stranger about his problems, especially one who didn't already know he was quirkless, someone who couldn't possibly understand what he was going through, did not appeal to him. The second result was another self-help website. The third result was a Wikipedia article titled Suicide Methods. It had 17 different methods listed. 1/3 was immediately cast out of his options because they would have to take place in crowded areas. Another third was discarded because they were inaccessible to him. He had no way of acquiring a gun. He didn't have any drugs to overdose, and it was just stupid to try and dehydrate himself to death. That would take forever. Of the methods left, Izuku found himself most drawn to drowning. Initially, he had thought he would slit his wrists, but there were too many unknown variables involved in that. How long would it take him to bleed out? Would he be able to make cuts that were deep enough? Would he have a place to bleed out where it was unlikely someone would find him? There were just too many things about cutting that seemed dramatic and unnecessary to Izuku. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He just wanted to stop being here. So, drowning. Izuku wrote out, "drowning," underneath the rectangle, and started writing out his thoughts. Obviously, the biggest issue here was that he needed a place to drown. He didn't want to risk drowning in his bathtub. His bathtub wasn't deep and he had no way of anchoring himself under the water efficiently. Maybe the beach. There was a beach not far from his apartment complex that was covered in trash that could potentially be made into an anchor. There was still the issue of wading out into the water far enough to properly drown without being spotted. But people tended to avoid Takoba Municipal Beach Park because it was depressing. Maybe there was a dock or pier and Izuku just couldn't see it because of the trash. Izuku drew an arrow that branched off from the whirlpool box and traveled along the side of the page until it pointed to his next sentence. Scope out Takoba Municipal Beach Park as a suitable location for attempt number 2 final attempt. Izuku felt better. The pressure that had manifested when he walked into his room was fully gone, leaving in its wake the empty cavern that his chest usually was. He put his pencil case and his notebook back into his backpack, got into bed, turned off his phone flashlight, and stared at the ceiling. Izuku woke up the next day. He got out of bed, he showered, he got a kiss on the forehead from his mother, he went to school, got through the day. Then, he walked to the beach, checking the time on his phone every few minutes out of an anxious worry that he wouldn't have enough time to get home and make dinner if he stayed out too long. He desperately didn't want his mother to notice any patterns. The beach was disgusting. The piles of trash and scrap metal reeked of decay and rotting fish. Izuku couldn't help but think he fit in. His uniform was black and that matched the tears on that rusted car. He was pale, that matched the sand and the various papers that were scattered about. His freckles matched the grime on those papers. His hair was dark green, a green that matched the wet seaweed draped over empty pizza boxes and rusted blenders half buried in the sand. His red shoes were the only thing that really stood out as he picked his way through the piles of trash toward the coast. If there was a dock that he could use, it would be easiest to spot from the edge of the water. Sand and glass crunched under his footsteps, and every now and then he had to divert from his straight path to get around a particularly large trash pile. When he did reach the water's edge, it was easy to spot the pier. It was farther down the beach than he thought it would be. It would take him a good amount of time to walk down the beach to it from the entrance. That would give him ample time to find a good anchor, though. Even far away, he could see how the wood sagged with rot. Seaweed and empty soda bottles littered the long walkway into the ocean. Izuku briefly wondered if he was capable of fixing it up, but quickly dismissed the thought. That would be a long project. He did not want to be around much longer. He got his notebook out of his backpack and made a few notes on the beach's layout and how far the dock was on the same page as last night. He checked the time on his phone. He went home. He made dinner. He did his homework. He went to his room, and he did not turn on the lights as he got ready for bed. He revised his letters inside of the blanket cave he made. He went to sleep. Izuku woke up and he hoped that it would be the last time he did so. He left the letters on his desk. He got ready for school. He got a forehead kiss from his mother. He walked to school. He sat through his first few periods and did not speak a word. He did not eat lunch. He did not bring lunch, but also he got called down to the guidance counselor's office. His classmates let out oohs and ahs as soon as their homeroom teacher called out to Izuku from the front of the room. Izuku tried not to let his anxiety consume him. There was no way the school could have found out about his attempt, and even if they did, they wouldn't care. Someone tripped him while he made his way to the door. He barely found it in himself to recover instead of just letting his face smash into the linoleum. But that would cause a scene, so he did find it in himself to reduce the effect to a stumble. Laughter echoed after him as he made his way out of the classroom and through the crowded hallway to the guidance counselor. His schoolmates whispered and nudged each other mid-conversation as he passed by, giggling behind their hands. The office was, comparatively, quiet. The white walls were adorned with posters that told him to hang in there and embrace your quirk-ass. The guidance counselor was a nice enough woman that he called him Ai-sensei. She smiled at him as he closed the door behind him and gestured to the chair in front of her desk. He sat down. Midoriya-kun, we're finalizing all of the high school application forms now, Ai-sensei began, and Izuku thought, oh, it's just this again, and the panic that had built up during his walk dissipated into nothing. He and Ai-sensei used to have a lot of disagreements, but Izuku figured that wouldn't be an issue today. And I just wanted to make sure that your choices were absolute before we sent them out. Izuku just tilted his head at her, allowing her to fill in the gaps of the conversation. I know you've said before that you're set on at least trying for UA, but that's just so unrealistic, dear. I want you to be applying to as many schools within your reach as possible, and UA is taking up a spot that could go to a better option for you. Her eyes were completely sincere, wrinkling around the corners as she gave him a pleading smile. A quick jab of bitterness stabbed him in the back of the throat. He coughed into his elbow to get rid of it before he replied. His hands were gripping each other tightly from where they came to rest in his lap. Okay, he said. A look of surprise crossed Ai-sensei's face for a split second before she settled on being pleased. Oh, Midoriya-kun, I'm so glad that you've come to your senses. She clapped her hands in front of her and took a pen out of the jar on her desk to edit his forms. He watched as she crossed out UA with one thick red line. She tapped the paper with the pen and hummed under her breath, turning toward her computer and typing something in. What about Yamamura Kokusai High School? She asked, turning toward him, already picking up the pen. It's pretty close to where you live and their acceptance rate is very high. Izuku nodded. He could perfectly picture the words she had just typed into the search bar. High school that accepts quirkless students. He had searched it up once too, and Yamamura Kokusai High School had been the first result. Ai-sensei grinned at him again and wrote it down right where UA had been. I'm so glad that we got this sorted out, Midoriya-kun. It makes me feel so much better about your future. Izuku nodded again, then stood up and gestured to the door, silently asking if he could be dismissed. Oh, yes, dear. That's all I wanted to discuss. Have a good day. She called after him as he walked out. He wanted to laugh or cry or punch the wall. A good day was not something that was allowed for Midoriya Izuku. The rest of the day passed quickly, the only thing of note being that another Deku was carved into his desk, probably done while he had been in the office. He decided to go home before heading to the beach. He would change out of his uniform. It could always be sold as a hand-me-down, and make sure he had some kind of ID on his person so that his body could be identified. He unlocked the apartment with trembling fingers. He didn't know why he was trembling. He walked through the empty apartment slowly, not bothering to turn on the lights. When he reached his room, he changed, put his ID in his pocket, and straightened the letters on his desk. He was about to leave when his eyes adjusted to the light, and suddenly he was staring at All Might's smiling face for the first time in days. The sun hadn't gone down and the light that came through his window was just enough that he could make out the merchandise in excruciating detail. The breathless feeling swarmed him again. Why was he? He didn't hate All Might. He didn't even resent him. All Might had just told him the same thing that everyone else had always told him. Izuku couldn't understand why he was having such a visceral reaction to seeing the man's face. He didn't feel this way when he saw Kaken, or any of his classmates, or even his mother, who had all said basically the same thing to him. So why was All Might so different? He needed to know. The whirlpool that lived under his skin made itself known again, pulling all of the air into him but not allowing him to get oxygen. But he couldn't ask anyone. No one would care. And his mother shouldn't know. She couldn't, because Izuku didn't want to hurt her even more than he was already going to. And yet the urge pulled at him to dissect this terrible feeling and understand it, the same as he understood why he didn't have a quirk or why quirkless suicide rates were so high. He shuffled over to his desk without thinking. There was a wetness on his face, but he couldn't remember starting to cry. It was just suddenly there. He saw a drop of water hit the inside of the drawer that he had opened and reached his hand in. He pulled out the card. It felt like he'd had it for years now, when in reality it had barely been 2 days since the hero had given it to him. He tried to clear his head while he shakily typed in the number. Was this what he know? This might not even be the scarf hero. And if it wasn't, then what would he do? Even if it was him, would he want to talk to Izuku? What if he didn't even pick up the phone? But Izuku could still barely breathe, and so he hit the call button. Aizawa was feeding the cats when his cell phone started to ring. He just got home from a long day of teaching and was dishing out food before he went off on patrol. He placed the last bowl on the ground, watching an orange streak barrel into it, and pushed the bowl up against the wall with a loud meow. In thanks, the phone had rung a few times at this point, and he wondered if whoever was on the line would hang up before he could dig it out of his pocket. He leaned against the counter and lazily brought the screen up to his face to see who was calling. But it was an unknown number. Aizawa's brows furrowed in annoyance. It was probably a student's parent complaining about his recent assignment. He almost let the call drop, but at the last minute he decided that he had to be responsible. He clicked the accept button and brought the phone up to his ear. Aizawa shouted, speaking. What do you want? He didn't need to be that responsible. It was after school hours after all. On the other side of the phone there was a quick inhale of breath. Aizawa's eyebrows lowered even further at the noise. Then there was a hiccup, like whoever was on the other side of the call was crying. Hello? Aizawa asked. He turned so that his elbow was braced against the counter. Hi. I was calling to, the voice stuttered out between gasps for breath and sniffles. Aizawa interrupted. Are you okay? Are you sure that you have the right number? No, I shouldn't have called. I'm sorry, Eraserhead. I didn't mean to waste your time. The voice said. A jolt went through Aizawa upon hearing his hero name. Who was this? Who was calling Eraserhead while they cried? No, wait, Aizawa said quickly. Just breathe with me, okay? You don't need to worry about wasting my time. In, Aizawa breathed in, listening and waiting for the person on the other end of the call to do the same, and out. He let out an exaggerated breath. He repeated this a few times, until the person on the other side of the call was breathing steadily. Okay, now, Aizawa said, trying very hard to make his voice gentle. Who is this? The person took another ragged breath. This is Midoriya Izuku. The kid. It was the kid from 2 days ago. The kid who threw himself off of his apartment complex and then acted like he was completely fine. The kid who had easily steered his own mother away from 2 pro heroes who just wanted to help him. That kid. Aizawa felt so relieved. Midoriya, I'm glad you called, he said. Midoriya's voice trembled. Why would you want me to call? There was something so honest and desperate in the kid's voice as he asked. Aizawa slouched further against the counter. Because I was worried about you, Aizawa said, not pulling his punches. I stopped you from committing suicide, Midoriya. And from what I saw, it seemed like you fully intended to try again. I am glad that you called, because that means you are still alive. There was a pause as the kid digested what he said. Right, Midoriya responded. You're a hero. Of course you would be worried. I just wanted to ask you a question because I don't really understand something. And I usually do, understand. As he listened to Midoriya speak, Aizawa felt something clench in his chest. His hand tightened on the phone. You're a hero. The kid had said it matter-of-factly, like that was the only reason Aizawa would be worried about him. Go ahead and ask then. Aizawa kept the emotion out of his voice. I'll try my best to answer. Oh, okay, I guess. Well, you already know that I'm quirkless, right? Midoriya sounded surprised that Aizawa would be willing to listen. There was some shuffling on the other side of the line. Yes, Aizawa replied. Well, even though I don't have a quirk, I've always wanted to be a hero. I mean, who wouldn't? Aizawa hummed, walking out of his kitchen and down the hall to the living room. Yamato was sitting on the couch and opened his mouth to say something, but stopped when Aizawa put a finger against his lips and pointed to his phone. Yamato frowned at him, probably thinking that the person on the other side of the call was a parent calling after hours, just like Aizawa had assumed. I know it's stupid, but I even have these journals that I analyze heroes in, and I called them hero analysis for the future. I was that deluded. Midoriya sounded so tired. Aizawa put his phone on speaker very carefully, and then typed out a text to Yamada. Shota, the kid on the phone is Midoriya Izuku. Be quiet and just listen, in case we need multiple witnesses. Midoriya kept talking as Yamada checked his texts and looked over at Aizawa in shock. But a few days ago, one of my childhood friends told me something that a lot of people have told me before, but it felt different coming from him. He told me to take a swan dive off the roof. The kid let out a pitiful laugh, like that was something that could be considered even remotely funny. Aizawa and Yamada wore matching expressions of concern. I guess I realized then that they were right. I would never be useful. I would always be a Deku. I wasn't gonna do it that day actually, but on the way home a villain attacked me and All Might saved me. The kid breathed in raggedly. Aizawa could hear the tears in the kid's voice as Midoriya cleared his throat to get rid of them. I asked him, All Might, if I could be a hero, just to make sure, because he would know he's the #1 hero. He said no. Yamada gasped quietly, putting his hands over his mouth immediately afterward. And that's fine, Midoriya said quickly. That's what everyone has always told me. It's not like it was anything new. He was just doing what he thought was best, I'm sure. And he's right, I couldn't possibly be a hero. Aizawa had to clench his fists to keep from interrupting. Anyway, the question was, I have a lot of All Might posters in my room. Aizawa saw Yamada flinch out of the corner of his eye, but he kept his gaze focused on the phone. And I don't resent All Might at all. He was just telling the truth, but the kid trailed off briefly as he tried to find the words. When I see the posters now I feel like I can't breathe or something. But I don't know why. Aizawa took a long breath through his nose. He calmed himself before he responded. You said you had a lot of All Might posters, right? Aizawa asked. Came Midoriya's response. Would you say you admire All Might? Is he someone you look up to? Yes, of course, Midoriya said. Who wouldn't look up to All Might? He's amazing. His rescue rate is the highest of any hero in history, and the amount of property damage he creates is one of the lowest that someone with a strength-based quirk has ever managed to maintain. He's an astonishing hero, right? Aizawa said. And then, this amazing hero told you that you couldn't be like him at all, ever. It's the same as how what your childhood friend said felt different. You admired All Might. Admire, Midoriya corrected. Right, Aizawa agreed slowly, keeping the judgment out of his voice. You admire All Might, and he said something to you that hurt you. It's only natural that some part of you is going to panic in response to seeing him. He crushed your dreams, Midoriya. Midoriya hummed on the other side of the phone. Yamada was biting his nails. I guess that makes sense. I think I understand now. Thank you, Eraserhead. The kid had bounced back to that empty voice from when they first met. Midoriya, Aizawa said before the kid could hang up. Oh yes, Midoriya asked pleasantly. I want you to call me tomorrow. Aizawa told him. Oh, I will. Midoriya stumbled over his words. If you don't call me tomorrow, Aizawa continued, I'm going to be very disappointed. He could only pray that the kid's deep-seated need to please the people around him overruled his desire to kill himself. Midoriya sounded panicked again, but that was better than him sounding numb. I can't promise, but I'll try. Midoriya sounded uncertain. Try your best, Aizawa said back. Goodbye, Eraserhead. Goodbye, Midoriya. I expect a call at the same time tomorrow. The kid hung up. Yamada burst into tears. Shouted, you can't just do that. Yamada yelled. I was in the middle of reading reviews for the last episode of my show, and then you come in with your phone and you're being all cryptic, and then you put it on speaker, and someone, who you then inform me is the kid who tried to kill himself 2 days ago, is telling a very, very sad story, and I didn't tell him to call me when you were reading reviews. We're lucky that he did it all. Aizawa was breathing hard. The hand that held his phone ached from the amount of pressure he was exerting onto it. Good God, Yamada said, wiping tears away from his face. That kid better fucking call you back. I won't. I think I'll die if he doesn't. I know how you feel, Aizawa said back dryly. Shut the hell up, Shouta. Yamada snapped. Seriously, I feel like we should be able to do more. But I know that anything we do outside of what you've already set up would push the kid farther toward the edge of whatever cliff he's on. Yeah, Aizawa ran a hand over his face. Yeah, I know. Will he called at what? 4. Aizawa checked his call log. 4. We'll watch the clock tomorrow, and if he doesn't call, we'll call the police and they can maybe get to him before he does anything. I don't want to betray his trust and do anything before, though. He's obviously a secretive person. He didn't even let his mother know about all that shit he just told us. That's a good plan. Yamada scooted over on the couch toward his husband. He wrapped an arm around Aizawa and stroked up and down his shoulder. This is good. This is good, Aizawa repeated back. Izuku stared down at the phone in his hand in shock. I want you to call me tomorrow. The words echoed in his head, bouncing off of his skull and filling his ears. I want you to call me tomorrow. Izuku knew that this was just a tactic to keep him alive for 1 day longer. He looked at the clock. 5. It was already too late to leave without his mom coming home before he was fully dead. He stood up from where he had sat down at his desk and walked to the kitchen to start dinner. Izuku knew that it was just a tactic to keep him alive for another day. It would be a horrible thing for a hero to do, to not even try to save someone who was clearly suicidal. Eraserhead was just doing his civic duty, Izuku thought as he got out the ingredients for fried rice. And yet, Eraserhead had listened. Izuku could tell that he had really, truly listened, and he had answered Izuku's question. And he cared. Izuku knew that someone caring about him shouldn't be so out of the ordinary. His classmates all cared for each other. Strangers on the streets even cared if they saw someone trip. It was different for him. No one cared about him easily. It took effort to give a shit about Midoriya Izuku. His mother cared about him, loved him unconditionally, but he knew she had moments. Moments where Izuku looked into her eyes and he could tell that she was struggling. It wasn't her fault, of course. He was just hard to love, to like, even. He was lucky that she cared about him 99% of the time. 1% of error was nothing. Eraserhead made it sound easy. He knew Izuku was quirkless. He knew that Izuku was a selfish monster who was going to kill himself just because he didn't want to be around anymore. He knew that Izuku was stupid for believing he could be a hero for so long. And Eraserhead said he wanted to talk to him tomorrow anyway. The rice in the pan sizzled. Izuku flicked his wrist to keep it moving as he added the vegetables and meat. Would he? Izuku wondered. Did he want to talk to Eraserhead again? He probed deep into the whirlpool in his chest, letting his thoughts get sucked down into the center as he grabbed a spatula. Eraserhead was probably just pitying him. He was probably just doing what he thought was the right thing to do. He probably didn't have any particularly strong feelings about Izuku one way or another. That was refreshing. Izuku had found, through 14 years of experience, that people often fell into categories around him. Category 1, disgust. This was the most common category. Most of his classmates and teachers fell into this category. People in the disgust category are characterized by their outright hatred of Izuku. They will usually go out of their way to prove to Izuku that he is a terrible person who is worthy of their hatred. People in this category will most likely have an aversion to any quirks that they consider villainous, like heavy mutation quirks or mental quirks, in addition to their disgust toward quirkless people. Category 2, pity. This was a less common category. The people who fell into this category do not remain there long and will later move into a different one. People in this category are characterized by their empathetic nature. They feel bad for him, not because of the actions of those in the disgust category, but because of his existence. Mai-sensei was a good example of someone who fell into the pity category. They don't see him often, and when they do, they just want to help him. Category 3, indifference. This was the second most common category. People who fall into this category are often moved there after a brief bout of pity. They are characterized by nothing. The classmates of his that were not in the disgust category fell into this category. They don't care and will feel no empathy toward his situation after a while. This was probably Izuku's favorite category because they usually didn't bother with him at all. Category 4, protect. His mother was currently the only one that fell into the fourth category. It was a category he had made for her. Midoriya and Co. did not pity him. Not really. She saw him as incapable of his ambitions, much like the pity category people, but she still tried to support him, to protect his mental health by not giving up on him or trying to change his mind to something she saw as more realistic. The thing that edged Inko out of the pity category and into this one was the amount of time she spent around him. She had moved past her initial pity "I'm so sorry Izuku" and into a more loving and protective state of mind. Eraserhead didn't truly fall into any of these categories. He knew that Eraserhead was just doing what he thought was right, so pity would fit him well, if it wasn't for the fact that he seemed more concerned with Izuku's suicidal tendencies than his quirklessness. All of Izuku's categories were built around people's reactions to his quirkless status, because that is usually what determined how people acted toward him anyway. Izuku grabbed some spices from the counter and mixed them into the dish. As he set them back in their place, his fingers briefly caught on the cabinet handle. Eraserhead hadn't given a reaction to Izuku being quirkless. Not over the phone and not at their initial meeting at the clinic. Izuku was sure that Eraserhead would fall into one eventually. He would just keep talking to him until he could puzzle it out, or until Eraserhead got tired of him. Izuku tapped the counter twice to finalize his decision. Then he got out bowls and split the food evenly for him and his mother. Just as he finished putting the extra into a Tupperware to be put in the fridge, he heard his mother coming through the door. She gave him a wide smile when she came around the corner and they ate dinner together, Izuku asking after her day at the firm. The next evening, Izuku found himself sitting on the steps that led down to Takoba Beach. They were not particularly comfortable steps, just made from concrete and covered in sand and discarded candy wrappers. Izuku had to clear a spot before he settled in to ensure he didn't get his uniform pants dirty. His phone was already held up to his ear, the rings echoing in time with the distant waves. "Midoriya," came the rough voice of Eraserhead as soon as the call was picked up. "Eraserhead," Izuku said back. "I'm glad you called," Eraserhead told him. Of course, sir, Izuku replied, and then the empty cavern that was his chest flooded with just a trickle of water and he let himself say what he really wanted to say. I'm sure that eventually you'll get tired of talking to a depressed, quirkless kid anyway, so I just have to last that long. There was silence on the other side of the line. A seagull cawed. Well, Eraserhead began, he sounded amused. I don't have to talk to you every day. It could be a once-a-week check-in or I could just start calling you randomly to check in on you. That's a good point, Izuku replied. Check-ins would be a much more efficient use of your time. I don't mind talking to you, Midoriya. You can call me if you don't understand something, Eraserhead said. Sure, Izuku found himself saying. Already getting up from the steps, I'll do that. Good, Eraserhead said. I do expect a call tomorrow though, just so you know. Izuku laughed and kicked a plastic water bottle off of the concrete ledge and into the heaps of trash where it belonged. Okay, I thought you might have a different schedule on the weekend, Midoriya said when Aizawa picked up the phone. I made sure I had a window open to take your call. Aizawa replied. It was true. He sat on his couch in full hero gear with a jelly packet in the hand holding his phone. This call was his break. And, Midoriya started, you operate at night usually anyway. I looked you up. Aizawa raised an eyebrow even though the kid couldn't see him. There's not that much about Eraserhead online. I'm an underground hero. Yeah, that just meant it was more fun to find what was real. And what did you think was real? Aizawa questioned. Well, it helped that I've seen your quirk in action. It made it a lot easier to find the posts that were accurate even if they didn't mention your hero name. It's kind of ironic that you saved me, since your quirk is to erase someone's quirk and I don't have one. Midoriya was talking a lot more than their last phone call. That's the basics of it, Aizawa said. From what I saw, and from the posts I found that I would consider reliable, your quirk is based on line of sight. A lot of the posts talked about you wearing goggles. I can only assume that's so that people don't know who you're looking at while you fight a group, but you didn't have them when I met you. Midoriya rambled out, barely pausing to breathe. Aizawa blinked in surprise. The kid had gotten pretty far from just a few posts. They were getting repaired that night. Oh, that makes sense. There was an energy to the kid that Aizawa had not detected at all the last few times they had spoken. They're yellow, right? The posts I saw said you usually had them hidden in your scarf, so I thought that might be the case, but you used a lot of it when you caught my ankle, so then I thought that probably wasn't the case that night. Anyway, your hair. Have you ever considered cutting it? Aizawa could barely keep up with Midoriya's sudden topic change. No. Well, maybe you should, because just from watching you when you stopped me I could tell that the whole levitating hair thing was a part of your quirk activating. You have the goggles to hide the red eye thing and to obscure your gaze, but maybe you could get a hair tie or something. Because then it would be almost impossible for people to tell if you're using your quirk. Aizawa opened his mouth to respond, but Midoriya was already talking again. Oh, I also wrote down here that your quirk probably wouldn't work on mutation-type quirks. Is that accurate? Midoriya seemed to be shuffling papers around on the other side of the line. Yes, Aizawa confirmed. That makes sense, Midoriya said absent-mindedly. Your quirk is based on line of sight, but in actuality it's more likely that your quirk uses your eyes as a, canary of sorts to know when you'll be overwhelmed by erasing someone's quirk for too long. So your eyes are like the switch, but really you're releasing some kind of energy, or pheromone or whatever, that affects the quirk factor. But with mutation quirks, their quirk factor isn't actually attached to their physical mutations. Those are just a result of genetics, so your quirk wouldn't get rid of the physical aspects. Mutation quirks are so complicated. Midoriya let out a huff of frustration before he seemed to come back to himself. Oh, sorry, Eraserhead. He didn't sound numb, or sad, or tired, he just sounded sheepish. Like how a normal kid would sound if they ate too much at dinner. That's exactly how it works, Aizawa found himself saying. He leaned forward from his relaxed position on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees. Where did you read that? I can't have that kind of information just out in the open. Oh, no, that wasn't on any of the posts I read, that was just my analysis. I told you I had that as a hobby, didn't I? I know it's stupid, but since I'm actually talking to you I figured I might as well. Midoriya trailed off. A hobby. As a hobby, Midoriya picked apart quirks until he understood them down to the genetic level, or as much of the genetic level as a 14-year-old middle schooler had the brain capacity to understand. I'll get a hairband or something. Aizawa grunted out. Really? The kid sounded way too excited. You're gonna take my advice? Oh my god, wait, I had another note. Aizawa could clearly hear the sound of pages turning now. You probably get dry eye, right? From keeping your eyes open for so long. You should carry around eye drops so that. I already do that, Aizawa interrupted. Oh, Midoriya sounded disappointed. Listen, Midoriya, you said you had a whole notebook of these, right? Yeah, would you send me some pictures of your favorites, or what you think is your best work? Aizawa was already pretty impressed with Midoriya's work. He had found all of that information, and come to his extremely accurate conclusions within a 12-hour period of their last call. He could only barely imagine what the kid was doing with unlimited time and heroes that had a lot more public appearances available to analyze. They're not that good. I haven't had the energy to keep them updated. Midoriya sounded meek again. That's fine, kid. I'm just curious. Curious if Midoriya was secretly a suffering genius or something. Okay, Midoriya agreed. Okay, call me tomorrow. Bye, Eraserhead. Bye, Midoriya. What the fuck? Yamada whispered. His eyes were impossibly wide, and his sunglasses slid down his nose as he looked at Aizawa's phone. I know, Aizawa said from where he was standing over his shoulder. Yamada was sitting at his desk in the teacher workroom, his lunch out in front of him. Aizawa also had his lunch on his desk, but he had put that on pause to come and hover over his husband as he read through the pages that Midoriya had sent him. Yamada spluttered, this isn't the best analysis I've ever seen, but it's good. Too good for a middle schooler to make in his free time without actual resources. Around them, the other teachers went about their work. Kayama was hunched over her desk muttering about something. Kan was digging through one of the filing cabinets. You should have heard him telling me about my quirk. His notes are far more organized than what comes out of his mouth. Aizawa reached around Yamada to grab his phone. You should send those to Nenzu or something. Like, seriously, the kid has potential. Yamada swiveled his desk chair around to look Aizawa in the eyes. Aizawa hummed. The real problem is that the kid doesn't see his potential. Yamada deflated. Right, he said. The quieter he did try to kill himself less than a week ago, we can't push him. But, Aizawa said, looking at the picture of a handwritten analysis on his phone, he's passionate about something. Maybe it's not the most healthy thing to be passionate about, but it means that he still has something to look forward to. Midoriya, Eraserhead. Izuku listened as Eraserhead cleared his throat. How was your day? The hero seemed uncomfortable. It was fine, Izuku replied. Why are you asking? Hazashi told me. Eraserhead coughed. My husband told me that if I was going to be talking to you every day, I should get better at small talk. This surprised a laugh out of Izuku. Okay, I can help you out. I'm pretty good at small talk. How was your day? It was fine. Izuku laughed again, a light breathy sound, like his laugh had eroded over time until it was just a thin airy thing. You have to give more detail than that if you want to keep the conversation going. For example, Izuku decided to help him out. Today I had a test in my math class that was really easy. So did you score 100? Eraserhead asked. Oh, I haven't looked yet, Izuku replied, briefly putting the phone on speaker so that he could check out his grade on the app that their school used. No, I didn't. Close though. Eraserhead seemed weirdly invested in his math scores. No, I have a 0. Izuku exited out of the app and brought the phone back to his ear. How? Eraserhead asked. I guess I didn't understand it as well as I thought I did. Izuku gave the excuse easily. That's impossible, Eraserhead said. Even if you didn't understand it, there's no way you could get a 0 on a test that you at least tried on. Izuku hummed in response. He picked at a seam on the shorts he had changed into when he got home. Izuku pulled on it until his forefinger and thumb hurt from how hard he was squeezing them together to keep the thread within his grasp. It wouldn't come loose. Neither of them spoke for a moment. So now you have to give me a detail about your day, Izuku said. The best kind of small talk is when you and the person you're talking to give the same amount of information. Sure, Eraserhead did not sound like he believed that. I had lunch with my husband and I showed him those pages you sent me. Izuku squeaked. Oh, well, that's cool. Actually, kind of embarrassing. Izuku paused. What did he think? What did you think? We were both impressed, Eraserhead told him. Izuku felt pride expand in his chest before the whirlpool sucked it down. This was probably just pity. Eraserhead wanted him to have more confidence in himself so that he might see something that was worth keeping himself alive. I'm glad you liked them, Izuku found himself saying. He could hear a frown in Eraserhead's voice when he spoke again. Really, kid, they were impressive coming from a middle schooler. Thank you for the compliment, Eraserhead. I think I should start on dinner now though. Call me tomorrow, Eraserhead demanded. Of course, Izuku replied. Then he hung up the phone. Then he set his phone down on his desk, scooted out from under the desk, set his elbows against his knees, and let his head fall into his hands. The worst thing about talking to Eraserhead was that it made Izuku painfully aware of what was going on around him. The rest of the time he was the feather. He was drifting through the air, making loops and swirls on his way to the water. He was so far from the cliff he barely registered the insults and shoves anymore. They were just the downward wind, helping him fall. When he was talking to Eraserhead, it felt like he was back on the ground again. Like a harsh breeze had scooped him up in its embrace and delivered the feather back onto the cliff, paces away from the edge, where he could feel the full force of gravity pushing him into the ground. The rest of the time Izuku could move through his life like he was meant to. He took everything thrown at him and he liked to think he took it gracefully. He got hit with paper planes and then used the paper to write his essay on. He got tripped in the hallway and he stumbled instead of just letting himself fall. He ducked his chin down when people insulted him and tried to show them what they needed to see. When people call you a name, they want you to feel it. So he flinched when Kaken called him useless. He turned his face to the side when his deskmate whispered that he was quirkless scum. He looked down at his shoes in the hallway when people giggled behind their hands that he was the kid people called Deku. He wasn't sure when the reactions had become artificial. When he had accepted those words as fact instead of insult, when he had to start faking his hurt for their benefit. When he was on the phone with Eraserhead though, the hurt wasn't just a practice dance anymore. When Eraserhead asked about why he had a 0, instead of the normal feeling of numb acceptance, he had been hit with a tidal wave of resentment. It was a similar feeling to what he used to get when he wasn't as good at hiding bruises, and his mother would scowl down at his ribs and tut about how kids really should play nicer. It was the feeling that, yes, people should play nice with him. They shouldn't trip him or call him names or give him 0s for no reason or torment him when he had done nothing to deserve their ire. It was a horrible feeling because it was a lie. He didn't want to start lying to himself again. I think you should take down the posters, Eraserhead told him after their customary greetings were finished. What? Izuku sat up from where he was lying down on his bed, in the dark. I think you should take down your All Might posters. Why? Izuku could feel Eraserhead's eye roll through the phone. Because the first time you called me it was because you were having a panic attack over them and I'm trying to help you improve your mental health. Izuku swallowed. I thought we were working on your small talk. Eraserhead's unimpressed silence said enough. Izuku squinted through the darkness at the shredded paper that was still on his floor. Oh okay. You don't have to hang up to do this, you can just put me on speaker, Eraserhead told him. Izuku felt instantly comforted, and then felt kind of mad that he felt comforted. He put Eraserhead on speaker. This might take a while. Izuku called to the phone while he walked toward the light switch. That's fine. Eraserhead's voice sounded so much smaller coming from his shitty phone speaker across the room instead of being directly in his ear. He could do this, Izuku told himself. All he had to do was turn on the light and take down the posters. His pointer finger rested against the bottom of the switch and his thumb landed on top. He had never been so aware of the positioning of his hands. All he had to do was push up. He closed his eyes. All he had to do was turn on the light. He pushed up. He took in a deep breath. He opened his eyes and stared at the white paint on his wall. Now he just had to take them down. There were a lot, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Most of them were put up with sticky putty. He could just peel them off quickly. Only a few had tape over the corners from when he was younger. Izuku turned stiffly toward where he knew the first poster was. It was a group shot of the top 10 heroes from when he was 8. The backdrop was green. All Might stood front and center, his hands on his hips and a giant smile on his face. It was held up with tape. He brought a shaking finger to the edge of the tape, his fingernail scraping on the wall where the corner of the tape was. It took a few scratches to start peeling the tape from the wall. He didn't want to risk removing any color from the poster, so instead of trying to take the tape off, he folded the sticky sides down so that they were wrapped around the corner. He repeated this process 4 times, until he gingerly held the poster, now free from the wall. He set it on his desk, upside down. Okay, Izuku breathed in. That wasn't that bad. He breathed in again. Yeah, that was fine. He doesn't know why he had been so nervous. He breathed in again, and then realized that he hadn't breathed out, and that he was maybe hyperventilating, and that his cheeks were wet. Izuku cursed under his breath, which wasn't that hard because he was breathing pretty hard now. He scrambled toward where the phone was lying on his bed. As soon as he got close enough that Eraserhead must be able to hear his panicked breaths, the man spoke up. Calm down, Midoriya, Eraserhead told him. When you breathe and count to 7, then hold it for 2 and then breathe out for 7. Izuku followed the instructions. After a few repetitions, he had his breathing under control again, but the tears were still falling. He elected to ignore them as he flopped down onto his bed face first. Are you all right, Midoriya? Eraserhead asked, completely casually, like he didn't just talk a middle schooler through his second panic attack over posters, of all things. He propped himself up on his elbows so that his voice wouldn't be lost to the bedding. That was only one poster. That was only one, and I'm already being a baby about it. Eraserhead's sigh was long-suffering and distorted when it came through the speaker. You're not being a baby, you are reacting to trauma. Izuku let out a wet laugh as he dropped his face back into his pillow. Trauma, he repeated. If it's any consolation for you, it'll probably be easier to take down the rest. I'll call you back tomorrow, Izuku told him, and then he snatched his phone up and ended the call. Izuku scrubbed his hands over his face a few times. Then he took down the rest of the posters. Midoriya Inko stared at her son's room in shock. She had an empty laundry basket on her hip, having come in to collect her son's dirty clothes so that she could do a full load of whites. She hadn't expected the drastic change to the interior of Izuku's room. Mom, Izuku glanced over at her from his desk that only had his open notebook and a pencil cup on it. No hero figures. There was no hero stuff anywhere anymore. He had taken down all his posters and stickers and figurines. Without the hero decorations, the room was dull. Inko hated to admit it to herself, but her son looked like he had no hobbies without the posters up. Then she caught herself. Does Izuku have hobbies? It had been so long since he had changed. She still pictured him as a hero-obsessed little kid, reading comic books and begging for the news to be put on, but she couldn't remember the last time she had seen him do either of those things. Her mouth felt dry and she had to unstick her tongue from the roof of her mouth to speak. I need your whites, sweetheart, so that I can run a full load of laundry. Izuku nodded and hopped out of his chair. She watched as he got up and dug through his hamper, pulling out t-shirts and underwear and putting them into the basket she was holding. As the hamper became heavier, so did her heart. When he was done, he went back to his desk and started writing again. Baby, where did all of your posters go? She asked, her fingers slipping against the plastic lip of the laundry basket. He turned to her, so that he was blocking her view of his notebook. I took them down, Izuku told her. Everything is in a box in my closet. I didn't throw them away or anything undrastic. Why did you? She cleared her throat and hoisted the basket higher up against her hip. Why did you take them down? Izuku hummed and then shut his notebook as she came deeper into the room. When did she do that? She wondered. The notebook, she couldn't help but notice, had the title scratched out on the cover. Where it used to say Hero Analysis for the Future number 13, black scribbles marked it up to read only Analysis number 13. There was the usual nervousness that her baby always seemed to have. I guess I've just outgrown them. I don't. He looked away from her, toward his window. I don't really want to be like them anymore. Inko felt her eyebrows crease in response and fought to keep her expression neutral. You don't want to be a hero anymore. She felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. Was he finally moving on from such dangerous aspirations? Well, no, I still want to be a hero. And help people, just not like that. A smile pulled at Inko's lips. Oh, of course, she said, leaning forward and using her free hand to smooth back Izuku's curls. You were born to help people, she laughed. It's been in your nature ever since you were little. Izuku pulled away from her touch just slightly. All right, he replied, his smile looking more like a grimace. I am not even applying to UA anymore, he told her. I'm thinking about something like you. Quirk law, maybe. After high school. He seemed hesitant. Inko rushed to reassure him. That's wonderful, sweetheart. You definitely have the head for it. Thanks, Mom. Inko hummed, turning to leave him to his homework or journaling or whatever it was he did nowadays. Maybe he was analyzing quirk law now. A bubbly feeling erupted in her chest as she closed his door behind her. He was moving forward. He's not moving forward, Aizawa told Yamada as soon as he hung up the phone. He took down the posters because I asked him to. And he's been doing the analysis I recommend, but he's not actually invested in any of it. He's just doing it because he doesn't have anything else to fill his time with until I give up on him. Aizawa was nearly growling by the end of the sentence. Yamada set aside his crackers. You're worried about the break, Yamada deduced. Aizawa sighed. Yes, I am too, Yamada admitted. It seems like his mom still works over school breaks. That gives him a lot of free time without her or you or his school keeping tabs on him. Exactly. Aizawa sunk further into their sofa. It's not for a few months still, Yamada reminded him. I'm sure that by then he'll trust you enough to accept your offer. I fucking hope so, Aizawa replied. How was your day, Midoriya? Look at you. Your small talk skills have gotten so much better these past few weeks, Midoriya replied, his polite tone trying to hide his topic change. You're changing the topic, Aizawa told him with an eyebrow raise. Yep, the kid said, popping the P with false cheer. Well, Aizawa couldn't entirely tell if it was false, but context clues pointed to yes. Do you have another 0? Aizawa gritted out. This was a trend that he had caught on to. Sometimes Midoriya would offhandedly mention a missing assignment or a 0 in place for a test that just didn't make sense with what he knew about the kid. Aizawa was almost certain that this was a purposeful effort by his teachers to lower his grade. Fucking bigots. And no, nothing like that, Midoriya said hurriedly. Then tried to change the topic again. I'm at the beach right now. Why? No reason really. Now that he was listening more closely, Aizawa could pick up on the sound of waves crashing and birds calling. Aizawa hummed, trying to think of a way to steer the kid back to whatever made him not want to talk about his day. It's the one covered in trash, Midoriya told him. When I first came here I wanted to fix the dock. This surprised Aizawa. Why? He asked again. I dunno. The kid sighed. Probably some really sad and introspective force was compelling me to. Like, if I can fix something so damaged, maybe I really do have some use. Or something like that. Then do it, Aizawa said, his voice taking on a steely quality that it usually only got when he was talking to his students. I guess, Midoriya trailed off. You're not going to like what I'm about to say, but you did tell me to be honest with you, so. Aizawa scoffed. Go ahead and say it. It could be an interesting race, Midoriya said. If I can finish cleaning the beach and fixing the dock before you get bored of talking to me. Aizawa hissed. Not intentionally. I did tell you weren't gonna like it. I do still want you to do it, even if your motivations aren't what they should be. Okay, Midoriya hung up. Izuku wasn't completely sure how he had found himself in his current situation. It had been nearly 2 months since he first met Eraserhead. 2 months since he had decided to kill himself. 2 months minus 2 days since he had put that on pause because a strange hero on the phone told him to call him the next day. And the day after that, and the day after that. The beach was excruciatingly hot, the barely visible sand burning when his bare skin brushed against it. Izuku had started with small things, plastic and paper, that he put into a sack and then ran to the closest garbage can. By now he was onto bigger things, rusted blenders and baby strollers. Without anyone knowing that he was doing this, aside from Eraserhead, he didn't have easy access to a place to dispose of these larger things. He had found himself walking back and forth between the giant dumpster that belonged to his apartment complex and the beach a lot. It wasn't the most effective method, but it was the easiest for Izuku's anxiety to deal with. Currently, he could not imagine himself asking anyone for help with hauling trash, mostly because it was disgusting and he would feel bad for forcing someone to help him. Not that anyone would want to help him, Izuku thought as he grabbed another glass bottle. He was currently playing a game called, "How many glass bottles can I deliver to the recycling bin in one trip?" The answer was unclear so far. He had one in each of his pockets, and because he was wearing cargo shorts that meant he had 4 bottles in his pants. He also had 3 bottles clenched under his left arm that was held across his chest, and 1 under his right arm. His old record was only 6 bottles, but with the addition of the cargo pants he was already blowing that out of the water. He had figured, if he was going back and forth from his apartment complex anyway, he could at least change into clothes that were maximally efficient for picking up trash. He was running a race. Midoriya, Eraserhead said, very seriously. "Yeah?" Izuku asked. "Do I have your permission to show this analysis to present Mike?" Eraserhead sounded grave. "Ooh, yes. You two are friends, aren't you? I forgot that he was there that night." Izuku responded absent-mindedly. He pushed his earbuds firmly into place with one hand as he jogged. The other hand was occupied by a giant sack of assorted metal parts. "He would really benefit from some of your notes," Eraserhead replied. "If you say so," Izuku responded, hefting the sack into a cardboard box labeled junkyard that was filled with similar bags. "I know so," Eraserhead said, "especially this bit about whistle pitches, that's amazing." Izuku shrugged. Not a very good shrug because he was now sprinting back toward the beach, but it was the thought that counted. Or no, it wasn't, because this was a phone call. Izuku made a noise that was the sound equivalent of "I don't know." Eraserhead scoffed. "This week, I think you should try and analyze a villain." "Okay," Izuku said, because what else was he going to do with his time? "Can you have one done by tomorrow?" Eraserhead sounded curious. Probably, but it wouldn't be as good as it could be." Izuku skid to a stop at the beach stairs, breathing hard, but definitely not as hard as he had the first time he had made the trip. Eraserhead hummed, "I want to see it tomorrow, but then keep working on it until Friday." "Okay," Izuku said. "Talk to you tomorrow," Eraserhead said. Izuku remembers his first day of middle school vividly. It was a day of hope. When he started elementary school, it was an unspoken rule that as an icebreaker the teacher would have them go around and introduce themselves by their name, one of their favorite things, and their quirk. Even then Izuku had known that this would be social suicide for him, except he didn't think of it in those words. He thought, if I tell them I'm quirkless no one will want to play with me, just like Kaken. Little Izuku had tried to hide it. He forgot to mention his quirk and scuffed his red sneaker-clad feet against the ground in embarrassment when one of his classmates helpfully called out his mistake. Kaken had been there too, grinning from his seat at Izuku and waiting for the truth. Izuku sometimes looks back and wishes he had just said it because those were the kids that he would be spending the rest of his elementary school years with, and letting the teacher say what she said was almost worse. When his teacher had seen his distress, she put a comforting hand on his shoulder. Izuku hoped that he was getting sent back to his seat, but her grip was firm as she started speaking for him. Izuku-kun didn't tell you his quirk because he doesn't have one. He's quirkless, and because of that you all have to be gentle with him, okay? He doesn't have a big strong quirk to protect him like you all do. She had said this all with zero hesitation, a pleasant smile on her face that came from years of working with children and being assured in her actions. She had no idea she had just condemned Izuku to playground hell. The categories that at that point Izuku could only barely recognize held true. The kids on the playground either actively bullied him, shoving him down in the sandbox, throwing his toys away, forcing him to be it for the entirety of recess, or they were nice, except it was the kind of nice that feels like it's not actually for your benefit. One girl, a classmate who had moved away or switched schools at some point, used to let her tag him whenever the rest of the kids refused to acknowledge his pads transferring the runner. She would come up to him and smile and hold her hand out and tell him to go rest. Izuku liked her fine, because back then he didn't know how to hate, he was just a child. But now, he could recognize that the weird fluttery feeling he felt whenever she came up to him wasn't a crush like his mother told him, it was annoyance. Her hand held out like a peace offering stood for everything that the kids who were mean to him believed in. It said, I know you can't actually do this, so let me do it for you. It said you could never do this on your own. It said they are right. Izuku, even then, knew that she was just trying to spare him from the kids' teasing, but sometimes he would ignore her held-out hand and tag someone else. He would run past her and then look back to show her that he didn't need her help. It was the other kids that were incapable of playing the game right. But she would just still be smiling and walking toward him with her palm toward the sky. She was the most direct example of the kids that pitied him. At the beginning, the class was divided in half. Half of the kids immediately disliked him for his quirklessness, and the other half thought he was a tragedy. They were all in first grade, of course, so they didn't know why they felt so strongly about him. Sometimes a kid would try to be his friend. Usually kids that were new that year and felt like he needed a friend. But after they realized that being friends with him meant they couldn't participate in games during recess, this usually stopped. They always left with a pleading look on their face, like they were begging him to understand. Izuku had hoped that things would be different in middle school. There would be a lot of new kids and they didn't have recess anymore and they were older and cliques wouldn't be a thing yet. He had a lot of hope. Even after icebreakers, when his condition was revealed, he had hope. Sure, half of the class was already shooting him glares or looks of sympathy, but some of them didn't look at him at all and some of them were just looking because everyone else was. The people directly around his seat didn't like him, sure, but there were 17 other people in the class. At least 1 or 2 of them would be okay with eating lunch with him, right? He was right. When lunch came around, a boy with light pink hair sat down in the seat behind him and introduced himself. They had both brought their lunch and the boy was in the middle of asking him if he wanted to swap something when Kaken came back from the bathroom. Izuku had hoped that Kaken would be in a different class, but it was an empty hope. They had been in every single class together since first grade and there were no complaints filed, so in the school's eyes it was an act of mercy to place childhood friends together. Kaken had taken one look at the boy poking through Izuku's lunch and Izuku's tentative smile. And he laughed, long and loud and pointed enough that everyone in the room tuned to look at him. "You did hear what he said, right?" Kaken had asked the boy, who looked nervous under Kaken's stare. The boy had started, glancing at Izuku with a "help me, what is going on" look on his face. Izuku couldn't help him though, because whatever Kaken was about to say was going to be true. He said he was quirkless. Kaken pointed out, "He told everyone here that he's a quirkless, useless Deku, and you're going to associate with him?" This was when the boy understood what was going on. He got a hard look in his eye and turned away from Kaken to Izuku. His pink hair shifted so that he had to push a piece behind his ear to get it out of his eye. Anyway, the boy started, "I think I'm gonna ask my mom for," but he never finished because Kaken had stomped over and shoved a hand into the boy's shoulder, pushing him back in his chair. "I know that you don't want to be friends with a Deku, Pinky, so you should just leave him alone before he infects you with his uselessness." It was a bad insult. It was a bad intimidation tactic all around, but it had been Bakugo's first and most effective. After that, no one had approached him. The pink-haired boy had sent him a look the next day from where he was eating lunch with a boy with completely white eyes and a girl with blue polka dots on her hands that told Izuku that it would be best for him to stay away from anyone else that year. His hope was gone by the time he walked into his mother's arms after school with a fake smile on his face and a fake story about a new friend who ate lunch with him 2 days in a row. Midoriya had started a new notebook. This one had nothing written on the cover. However, the first page declared Midoriya Izuku's villain analysis, Case 1 in Midoriya's neat handwriting. The pages were as follows. Analysis of the villain currently being referred to as Suicide Pill. This villain is registered as an S-level threat and has been labeled as SK villain. SK stands for serial killer. A serial killer is someone who commits at least 3 murders over more than a month with an emotional cooling-off period in between. What separates Suicide Pill from being categorized as a SK villain rather than an SK criminal is the fact that, on multiple occasions, Suicide Pill has publicized videos of their victims' bodies after they have been killed. The videos are uploaded onto a different YouTube account every time, often using the email of the victim to make the account in the first place so that the villain cannot be traced. The act of antagonizing the public through these videos is one of the reasons why Suicide Pill is considered a villain rather than a criminal. Another reason is that within these videos, Suicide Pill will make appearances. Suicide Pill is always wearing the same mask, alongside tactical gear in similarly themed colors. The fact that Suicide Pill is wearing gear that has been specifically made as a costume is another reason that they are classified as a villain. The last THNG that marks Suicide Pill as a villain rather than a criminal is that they have had at least 5 encounters with a pro-hero and has gotten away each time through evasive maneuvers. The videos that Suicide Pill posts are always taken down by the police or the Hero Commission. Or maybe just the website administrators. The videos are taken down quickly and efficiently. However, I was able to find one by searching through some message boards that I don't normally frequent. I believe that the video was of Suicide Pill's 5th kill. Their 5th victim was a teenage girl in her 2nd year of high school named Horiachi Ayano. Horiachi is similar to Suicide Pill's other victims. As far as I can tell, all of Suicide Pill's victims have been in high school, have been girls, and have had blonde hair. Suicide Pill clearly has a type, and that, alongside the fact that they are a serial offender, suggests that there is a sexual aspect to Suicide Pill's kills. I looked up what having a type usually means for SK villains, and that makes me think that Suicide Pill would be classified as a sexual sadist. Sadism is defined as the infliction of suffering for sexual gratification. Sadists enjoy watching victims squirm from fright. This is oftentimes the only way that the killer can get off. The worst types of sadists are the sadistic serial killers, like Suicide Pill. They usually spend their entire lives fantasizing about and thinking of new ways to make a person suffer. The fact that alone gives me a lot of information about Suicide Pill. First of all, serial killers are almost always men, and if they are women, they usually kill either older or younger men, not teenage girls. Suicide Pill has worn a mask and concealed clothing in all of their videos, but I feel it's safe to assume that he is a male. His victims also reveal a lot about him. Teenage girls are, like, an easy choice. I guess they're kind of the safe victim choice or low risk because they probably won't be able to fight back against someone older than them who has training like Suicide Pill does. This implies that Suicide Pill is highly intelligent. That despite the flaunting of his kills, Suicide Pill is choosing victims and taking measures to not get caught. He is not acting out of blind rage or because of a quirk malfunction. He is motivated to kill these girls for his own gain and wishes, and because of this will probably continue to do so for as long as possible. Suicide Pill is also probably around 17-28 years old. This is based on the youth of his victims. Despite their young age, there has been no signs of pedophilic behavior. This is also based off of Suicide Pill's physical capabilities. In footage that I reviewed of him running from Pro Hero Ice Storm, he is very agile and also not that tall, which suggests youth. And, although in the videos Suicide Pill almost always has his voice modulated, he acts with familiarity behind the camera and has shown to be very proficient in his use of modern social media sites, meaning he probably interacts with them daily. There are other conclusions that can be drawn about the kind of person Suicide Pill probably. However, this analysis has to be ready by tomorrow, and I really want to talk about what I think his quirk is, so see page. Quirk. Suicide Pill is called Suicide Pill because his signature is that the victim is missing one tooth, a molar tooth. Back in the pre-quirk era during one of the world wars, I think, Suicide Pills disguised as a tooth were fairly popular because there was a lot of espionage. I haven't done too much research into Suicide Pill's inspirations yet or the origins of his villain name, so my first thought, and the main theory on message boards and news outlets, was that Suicide Pill could create poison or convert a tooth into cyanide or something similar. However, that doesn't account for some of the wounds that I saw in the video. I didn't manage to find any autopsy reports, but from the video, I could see a lot of shallow, thin cuts on Horiuchi's exposed skin. They didn't look like they were done from a knife though, so I believe that these cuts were made using Suicide Pill's quirk. Suicide Pill's outfit covers all of his skin. From head to toe he is decked out in neon colors. At first glance this could allude to poison easily, as they are toxic-looking colors that are commonly associated with acids and chemicals. I don't think that's it though. Another interesting thing about Suicide Pill's outfit is that despite all other parts of his face being covered with a mask, his mouth is left exposed. This choice leads me to believe that his quirk has something to do with his mouth. In the video I watched, I noted that Suicide Pill's teeth were tinted red, but there are no teeth marks on the body and no excessive amounts of blood drawn that he could have ingested. I think that the bright colors on his costume allude to dangerous insects. My top theory for his quirk is that he can manipulate his teeth, and maybe others' teeth, animating them into bug-like creatures that he then uses to torture and then kill his victim. I know it's a bit of a stretch to say that his teeth become bugs specifically. He could just use them as tiny sharp daggers or something, but the size of the cuts leads me to believe that the teeth develop smaller instruments to administer the wounds. This is further backed up by the fact that there are so signs of forced entry into the girls' homes. Perhaps these enamel insects are used to pick the lock in an undetectable way. Suicide Pill has never been shown using his quirk against pro-heroes when he encounters them. I think that this is because his teeth, though animated to an incredible degree and strong enough to cut through flesh, are not durable enough for him to risk them getting crushed underfoot or destroyed in a fight. I believe that Suicide Pill must have contact with the teeth to transform them to this state, like a 5-point touch quirk but with his tongue. It's possible that he can manipulate other things that have similar chemical composition to teeth if he licks it. There might be a certain amount of time that his tongue has to be in contact with the tooth. That would track for why the girls are only missing one tooth. Why not add more to his arsenal? Why only use them to kill the victim and not take them as a souvenir or a weapon? Maybe he has to keep contact with the teeth for a very long period of time, so he would have to have the teeth in his mouth to use them, and that's inconvenient. It's a horrible implication that he stuck his tongue in those girls' mouths too. Either way, I think that if I was able to obtain an autopsy report, it would be noted that each victim had one of their own teeth lodged in their heart or windpipe or something as the cause of death. You don't have to keep calling me by my hero name, Aizawa told the kid. He had his phone balanced on his shoulder, his arms up to the elbow in soapy dishwater. Midoriya hummed into the receiver. Seriously, Aizawa said. It could be a risk to my identity when we start training together in person. He heard Midoriya cough and grinned at the bowl he was scrubbing out. Yamada shot him a look from where he was leaning against the counter drying the dishes. What do you mean training? The kid sounded genuinely confused. I mean that you have potential, Midoriya. The villain analysis that you handed in today is impeccable for only one day of work and limited resources. I do wish you hadn't chosen a villain that is so gruesome, but that also showed gumption. You're a hard worker, you can read people easily, and you're good at diverting attention. Kid, you're an underground hero in the making. Yamada shoots Aizawa an aggressive thumbs up. On the other side of the line, Aizawa heard the familiar sound of sniffles. Do you really think that? Aizawa sighed and extracted his hands from the water, taking the rag from Mike to dry them off as he spoke. Yes, the kid sniffled some more. Despite only seeing Midoriya once before, Aizawa could perfectly picture the kid wiping at his eyes. When his hands were completely dry, Aizawa took the phone from its wedged position and held it to his other ear. I know it's hard for you to believe me, Midoriya, but you are one of the brightest kids I've ever met. Despite no formal training, you have a strong grasp on strategy and you think about quirks in the same way a quirk consultant would after years of experience. Your intellect, combined with your kindness, makes you the perfect hero material. A large sob made its way out of Aizawa's phone speaker. Aizawa held the phone away from his ear as he listened to the kid cry. I want to train you. I know that you know that this is partially about keeping an eye on you over the break. But it's also about keeping an eye on you in general because I think you could do amazing things with the right teacher. He was standing in the middle of his kitchen, his cat jukebox rubbing himself against Aizawa's legs. Yamada braced against the other side of the counter with a painfully proud and hopeful expression on his face. He didn't know where the kid was, but despite all the domesticity that surrounded him, Aizawa felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Midoriya choked on another sob. I'll think about it. Aizawa took the phone from his ear and stared at the call-ended screen. Kid, a voice called out. Izuku tried not to look too startled as he looked up at a woman with neon orange hair. She had watched him come to leave scrap metal in her donation area for the past few weeks. Where are you getting all this shit? Is someone in your family a hoarder or what? Izuku thought she looked like the kind of person that could be on the cover of a magazine. She held herself in a way that spoke of confidence and comfort. The way she was leaning against the metal wall of her office building made her look almost limp. Her head lolled to the side as she stared at him. He was immediately nervous. No ma'am. Izuku looked away from her and focused on setting the donations he had brought into the donation zone. He mumbled the rest of his sentence. I'm cleaning the beach. The junkyard was located on the edge of the warehouse district. The office that the woman had been watching him from for the past month or so was made up of sheet metal and stationed just inside of a large chain link fence that surrounded the yard. Across from her office was a small square of dirt surrounded by a short metal fence made up of what looked like car bumpers with a sign that read donations here. You gotta speak up, Pipsqueak. She leaned forward from her relaxed pose and came to stand across from him with her hands shoved into her overall pockets. Izuku swallowed and straightened up to face her. I'm cleaning the beach, ma'am, Izuku told the woman. Her face crushed up in confusion, reminiscent of a crumpled piece of metal pipe that Izuku could see in a pile deeper in the junkyard. What beach has this much scrap metal on it? Usually they just have like water bottles and soda cans, right? Izuku looked down at his red shoes and fiddled with his fingers anxiously. Yes, ma'am, but I'm cleaning Takoba Municipal Beach Park. Her eyes widened comically. You, a shrimpy-looking middle schooler, is cleaning a beach covered in mountains of trash. She looked around the junkyard and out the gate, and seeing no one else, raised her voice an octave. By yourself? Yes, ma'am, Izuku replied politely, easily masking his amusement and slight annoyance at being called both shrimpy and pipsqueak within a 10-minute period. There's no way you can do that on your own, she shouted, but Izuku didn't flinch. She wasn't saying it because she believed it or because she wanted him to know he couldn't possibly accomplish such a feat. She seemed happy to say it. A grin split her face and she settled both of her hands on his shoulders. The way she moved made it seem like a foregone conclusion that her hands would land there. But Izuku felt himself stiffen up at the touch. He shuffled in place and felt a nervous sweat break out on the back of his neck. I'll tell you what, kid. You're bringing me a lot of good stuff. Well, it's rusted stuff, but it's still usable, and that's all that my customers look for, and it's almost better for me because, well, anyway. She flipped him around and started pushing him toward her office. You probably don't know how a junkyard actually works, but usually we don't take the shit that you've been bringing in. Most junkyards only deal in car parts. I know that when you look at it, it just looks like a bunch of metal pieces piled together, but there's a method to the madness that car dealers can see through. The woman paused her spiel to push Izuku down into a chair that she had in front of her desk and then walked over the other side and scooted forward in her chair until her elbows were braced against the wood and she could hold up her cheek with one of her hands. Lucky for you, I don't just deal in car parts. The 3 warehouses that surround this place are all mine, and they're all storage for scrap metal for anyone who's looking to buy at a reduced price. Now, you're probably thinking, Asami, I've been coming here for. She cut herself off and her lax expression shifted to one of contemplation for a moment before she seemed to throw aside whatever she was thinking and move on. For however long, and I've only ever seen you here. How do you manage all that? Well, here's the thing, Pipsqueak. My quirk is called Rust Sense. I know the name is fucking lame, right? But it's all those doctors could come up with, I guess. Anyway, I can sense and manipulate anything that has rust on it within a 100-meter radius of myself. At this, Izuku's eyes widened. The applications of that. I know, Asami shouted, slamming one of her hands down onto her desk when she saw Izuku's interest. It's pretty cool. Not that anyone in my high school thought that. But what it means is that it's really easy of me to keep track of and sort all this old stuff. It would be a kinda useless quirk anywhere else though, so it's pretty lucky that I've always been into cars. Izuku nodded. Asami tilted her head further to the side, so that her neck was almost at a complete 90-degree angle. Where was I fucking going with this? You right. She pointed at Izuku with the hand not holding up her broken neck. You've been bringing me a lot of good stuff for my customers, but you're all alone so you can't carry that much at a time. As she spoke, she straightened up and ripped a page out of a notebook that was on her desk and started writing. If you just text me when you have a bunch of stuff, I can come and pick it up in my truck instead of you having to walk down here all the time. It's probably not very efficient if you're trying to clean a whole beach. Izuku felt overwhelmed at all of the information she had just given him and saw his hand reach for the paper from outside of his body. When his fingers wrapped around the folded paper and pulled, Asami didn't let go. You seem like a good kid, she told him. Her relaxed expression was suddenly serious. So I trust that you're not just gonna hand this number out or put it on a bathroom stall or something, right? Izuku's face heated up instantly and the hand not holding the paper came up to his cheek in a vain attempt to cool himself down. I know, ma'am, why would I ever do that? I don't know. Asami laughed, her head tilted back and her orange hair falling over her shoulder with the motion. She let go of the paper and leaned back into her chair, one of her legs coming up for her to wrap her arms around. She rested her chin on the knee, grinning a movie star smile. You should have seen your face. Izuku put the paper into his pocket and squashed down the hot feeling in his stomach that always seemed to appear when someone laughed at him. You should probably get going now, huh? It's a school night and all that blah blah whatever. She lifted a hand and wiggled her fingers at him. Off you go. All right, Izuku stuttered out. Thank you for your help, ma'am. Bleh. Asami stuck her tongue out. Don't call me ma'am, that makes me feel super old. You should call me Asami-chan, like we're old pals or something. And I'll call you Midoriya. Asami gave him an unimpressed look when he started to close his mouth. Izuku-chan, Asami said easily. I'll see you when you ring me up for my services then. Asami winked at him and Izuku skittered out of the building hurriedly, followed by her chuckles. He only vaguely remembers the train ride back to his apartment building. That was not. He had been coming there for weeks and he hadn't expected her to ever talk to him. Back in his room, with its plain walls and tidy shelves, he unfolded the notebook paper. In black pen, not even lined up with the lines of the paper, was her name, Kanai Asami, and underneath that a number. A warm breeze swept through Izuku's heart. He had half expected it to be a prank. Was it really appropriate to call her? Izuku's fingers crinkled the paper where he was holding it. He shouldn't, right? But it would be so helpful. And she seemed like she wanted the parts. He was getting tired of having to hide his piles of scrap metal in the bushes when it got big enough that the landlord started to ask questions. Izuku took his phone out of his pocket and put her number into his contacts. It felt surreal, like he was living a life that wasn't his own, or like he had stolen someone else's identity. She was so nice and it seemed like she had liked him. She had called him a good kid. Eraserhead told him that he had potential. Izuku stood up abruptly and started pacing the room. His phone and the paper lay forgotten next to his pillow. He thought about the scribbled whirlpool he had drawn in his notebook and the research he had done on what it felt like to drown. He thought about his mother telling him that she was sorry, Kaken smacking his hand away when he tried to help him up and shouting at him that he was useless and couldn't help anyone. Aunt Mitsuki yelling at Kaken to be gentle with him and always putting more vegetables on his plate than on Kaken. His guidance counselor pleading with him to pick a more realistic career path. All Might saying the same thing, telling him that he could never be a hero. He thought about if it would be fair to Eraserhead to let him train him when Izuku was going to inevitably disappoint him. He thought about his progress on the beach and the dock that was still in hideous disarray. He thought about how Eraserhead had texted him lol with a screenshot of his analysis of present Mike with one of his doodles zoomed in on. He thought about how his mother seemed so happy to talk with him about quirk law and how she had been coming into his room more and more often to check in on him and ask after what he was up to. He thought about Eraserhead and Asami both expecting a call from him. It would be okay to try and make them happy for just a little while longer, wouldn't it? He wasn't doing the best job, and they would get tired of humoring him eventually, just like everybody else, and then he would figure something out. But for now he had already put his plans on pause anyway. So what should I call you, if not Eraserhead? Aizawa let out a sigh of relief. Aizawa-sensei, I assumed this was your way of letting me know you agreed to my proposal. Yes, Midoriya replied. His voice was small. Just don't get your hopes up too much. Aizawa bit back his reassurance. You are aware that this means your mother and I will be having a conversation? By the noise that Deku made on the other side of the phone, Aizawa was certain that he had not been aware. Is that really necessary? She doesn't. Midoriya cut himself off before continuing at a less frantic pace. She doesn't know everything that you know. Aizawa glared out of his window. I won't tell her about that. I'm not going to betray your confidence. She just needs to know what I have planned for you, how and where you'll be spending your time, that kind of stuff. Well, I need to know that too, right? So I could sit in. Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose between his fingers. No, Midoriya, I think this needs to be a private conversation. She might. Midoriya cut him off. You don't know how she's going to react, so you don't want me to be there in case she says no. Aizawa glared even harder out of his window, watching a bird land on a telephone pole. This kid was too intuitive for his own good. He would have to rework his current plan, because at this rate Midoriya would skip over the whole learning to read people unit. Yes? Oh, okay then. Midoriya conceded surprisingly easily. Okay then. Aizawa repeated. I trust you, Aizawa-sensei. You wouldn't cross a line like that. Aizawa briefly wondered if this was a way to ensure he didn't. By reiterating Midoriya's trust in him, Midoriya was reminding Aizawa of all the consequences if he did betray Midoriya's confidence. He quickly swept that aside. As bright as Midoriya was, he was still just a middle schooler. I wouldn't. Aizawa agreed. Midoriya-san, this is her. May I ask who is speaking? Inko replied. She was standing in the hallway and could hear the running water in the kitchen and the soft scraping sounds of Izuku doing the dishes. This is Aizawa Shouta. I met you and your son a few months ago when I took him to a clinic. The man, Aizawa, trailed off, letting her fill in the blanks. Oh, Inko leans around the corner of the hallway, sneaking a peek at her son. He was completely distracted, his sleeves rolled up and his head bowed as he scrubbed at a pot. Inko goes deeper into the hallway. I was in such a rush to get him home I barely thanked you. I always tell Izuku to be more careful when he's out chasing heroes and drawing or whatever he does these days, so I really do appreciate you taking the time to help him. Not everyone would do that. He let out a gentle laugh. Of course, Midoriya-san. I'm actually calling to talk about your son. What about him? Inko tucked some hair behind her ear. How did you get my number anyway? Did Izuku give it to you while you were waiting for me to pick him up? Aizawa seemed uncomfortable. Yes, your son gave me your number. We've been in contact for a while. I'm a teacher at UA and your son. A teacher at UA. Inko repeated. She quickly peeked back around the corner to look at Izuku and make sure he hadn't heard her exclamation of surprise. What does a teacher at a hero school want with my son? He told me he wasn't interested in being a hero anymore. I don't think that's true. There was a pause. Midoriya-san, can we talk in person? Aizawa asked. Inko felt her heart pull in two different directions. One half wanted to trust her son's word and dismiss this odd caller. Izuku had moved on to better, safer, more realistic things. He was going to move on from the dream that would have ended in his death. He was. The other half was whispering all of the things that she had noticed lately. Izuku's bare room, devoid of the colorful hero posters and figurines, devoid of anything that she could look at to see what her little boy was interested in. He still wrote in his journals, but he didn't talk about heroes anymore. He didn't talk about much of anything. When he stopped talking about heroes, she realized that that was the only thing he used to talk about. No talk of friends or how his classes were going. Nothing about girls or even boys that he might have a crush on. Nothing about himself. He would ask after her, how her job was going, what she wanted for dinner that week. So maybe he was lying to her. Maybe he still wanted to be a hero and he was trying to save her. She had never been shy about her distaste in him chasing hero fights. He had come home more than once with scrapes and bruises that she could only assume were from him running around trying to get closer to these dangerous fights. It wasn't good for him to be doing things like that. He needed to stay safe. He needed to. It was exactly the kind of thing Izuku would do. Drop his one passion just for her sake. Ever since he was little, he would try to make her smile. When his father left permanently, Inko hated to admit that she was a bit of a mess. Asashi had sent the divorce papers with no warning. There was no call beforehand, and he didn't pick up any of her calls afterward. He offered a generous alimony and had promised to send child support every month. Working at a law firm meant that she knew it would be stupid to not take the deal. So she did, and for months afterward she thought she was doing a good job at hiding it from Izuku, waiting for the right moment to tell a 6-year-old that his father was never coming back. But one day, when she brought him home from kindergarten, he rushed to get into the house before her, and by the time she had slipped her shoes off and came into the kitchen, he had set a plate on the table and was pulling out her chair. Izuku was struggling with the chair. It was taller than him and heavy, so she swept in and discreetly pulled it out the rest of the way. He smiled up at her when she settled down. "What's going on, baby?" she asked him. "Am I getting a treat?" She held out the empty plate in front of her and spun it between her hands. Izuku giggled. He still had his backpack on and started digging through it. "Mommy has been sad, so I saved my snack for you." He pulled out a package of gummies and held them up triumphantly. When he put them on the plate, the sound of the plastic packaging hitting the ceramic of the plate echoed in her head. Sometimes she could still hear it when Izuku did nice things for her without asking. When he cleaned up the house without her asking. When he brushed over issues like his father easily. Sometimes he would make her favorite cookies after she got off a hard case. And the soft plink of the plastic and ceramic meeting would be deafening. This was the sound echoing in her ears when she came back out of her musings to Aizawa repeating her name. "Midoriya-san. Midoriya-san, are you still there?" Aizawa called. "Yes, yes." Inko hurried to whisper into the phone. "I'm still here. I would like to meet you in person to talk about my son. When are you available?" Izuku was out. Aizawa was set to show up in 10 minutes. Inko was stress-eating the cookies that Izuku had made while she waited for a knock on the door. As soon as Inko had told her son about Aizawa coming to talk to her, he had gotten nervous. Not his usual brand of nervousness, where he stuttered and fidgeted and wouldn't look her in the eye. No, he had gone still these last few days. He was out of the house even more than usual. He was barricading himself in his room. He had kept even quieter. Inko had thought she knew all of her son's tells, but recently she was thinking the opposite. Izuku made 2 kinds of cookies. Inko had watched him discreetly from the living room. She had never really seen him bake before. She had never thought of it. She was noticing more and more that she hadn't thought about a lot of things when it came to Izuku. He was a good kid. They had fun conversations and sometimes played board games on the weekend. He had good grades, he did his chores, he made her cookies when she was sad. It was almost always a surprise. He made them while she was out so she could come back to something that would make her smile. Aside from his hero fixation, he was the perfect child. He baked like a scientist. While she watched from her place on the sofa, he took out all of the ingredients and lined them up on the counter. He was silent, his eyes were far away. He moved methodically. Every time he used an ingredient, he would put it away right after. He moved with a familiarity that Inko expected. He had taken it upon himself to make dinner during the weekdays a few years ago. But he was careful in a way she didn't expect. All of his movements precise, measured. He did not make a mess. Inko had laughed at first, under her breath and hidden behind her book, when she had noticed how careful he was. Her baby was always making things easier for her. No mess to clean up like when other young boys messed around in the kitchen. But then she watched as he spilled a tiny bit of four and his eyes sharpened. He had wet a paper towel to wipe it up instantly. He was a neat kid. He kept his room clean. He did the dishes. His backpack was always organized. It wasn't in an obsessive way. Or at least she hadn't thought so. She was second-guessing a lot about what she used to think. He made 2 batches of cookies. One was her favorite, a shortbread that he had made her over and over again cut into the shape of hearts and stars. The other was some dark bitter thing with powdered sugar dusted on top. Izuku had cut out a piece of paper so that the sprinkled sugar was in the shape of a cat. Inko assumed the second batch was for Aizawa. She didn't have a taste for bitter sweets and no particular love of cats. Izuku wasn't even going to be there, but he was trying to make a good impression. He left early that morning, in athletic gear that allowed Inko to see muscle that Izuku hadn't had before. Aizawa wasn't set to arrive until around noon, but Izuku had told her that he wouldn't be back until dinner. She tried to speak with him on his way out, but he had smiled at her and she couldn't. Inko stuffed another star cookie into her mouth and straightened the platter of cookies on the table. She glanced over at the door, then jumped when a knock came. As she stood, she ran her hands over her skirt to smooth it out and straightened her cardigan. She recognized the man she opened the door to. He had on a dark jumpsuit and a scarf piled on his shoulders. He was also tall. He towered over her by almost a whole foot, and Ko had to take a small step backward to get a good look at his face. "Aizawa-san?" she asked, her eyes going up and down his frame again, trying to remember the night, months ago, that she had seen him in person. "Yes." He removed one of his hands from his pockets and held it out for her to shake. She shook it. "Good, good, great," she repeated. "See, come in." They settled in the living room. Aizawa sat in a chair. Inko sat diagonal to him on the sofa. As soon as they both settled, they made eye contact. Inko looked away. So Inko began, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. "Izuku." Her voice went high-pitched. "Izuku," Aizawa repeated, leaning forward to talk to her. "He's an incredibly bright young boy. I believe that he has the potential to become an asset to the hero world." Inko cleared her throat. "Izuku is quirkless. I am aware of that," Aizawa told her. then you know that he can't be a hero. He wouldn't be able to protect himself. He and Ko looked away from Aizawa's dark eyes. He's defenseless. Your son is one of the most intelligent children I have ever met. Aizawa's voice was like steel, unbending, cold. He took out his phone and tapped a few times before setting it on the table in front of her. He has these journals that he writes his analysis in, and Ko picked up the phone, looking at the pictures. It was definitely her son's handwriting. They are on par with professional analysis written by court counselors or consultants. The difference between these professionals and your son, aside from years of experience, is that your son has no official training or schooling and very limited resources. The fact that Midoriya-kun is able to write analysis on this level is indicative of his intelligence. And Ko's eyes skimmed over the passages. There was vocabulary that she could barely grasp, diagrams of wings and vocal cords, full-body action shots of heroes with arrows pointing to things that seemed insignificant to her. Izuku wrote these. Yes, Aizawa took his phone back from her and settled deeper into the chair. He has also shown an aptitude for strategic thinking and profiling, two skills that many heroes use daily. Midoriya-san, your son is not helpless. He is an intelligent kid who has the makings of a great underground hero. And from what I've seen from him, he does want to help people. Of course, he wants to help people. Inko replied without thinking. Ever since he was little, all he's done is try to help people. Aizawa blinked. On the phone, you said that he didn't want to be a hero anymore. He told me he wasn't interested in that kind of future. He said he was thinking about law. Inko shifted, uncrossing and then recrossing her legs. Did he? You said you had been in contact. Did he tell you otherwise? No, Aizawa answered. Then he looked down at the table, at the platter of cookies. Did Midoriya make these? His eyes were trained on the cookies with cat-patterned powdered sugar on top. Yeah, I think he made the dark ones for you. I don't really like that kind of stuff. Inko trailed off as Aizawa picked up one of the cookies and took a bite. His eyebrows shot up. Inko giggled at his sudden change in expression. This is good. Aizawa sounded surprised. Do you not usually like sweets? She tilted her head to the side. No, Aizawa said. Not really. He probably figured that out. Izuku has always been good at guessing things about people. She smiled. Once when he was only 7, he managed to find all my hiding spots for his birthday presents. Aizawa finished his cookie and whipped his hand against his knee to get rid of the crumbs. Have you noticed anything odd about Midoriya's behavior lately? Inko nodded, her hands knotting themselves together in her lap. Has your son ever lied to you, Midoriya-san? Inko felt her eyebrows scrunch together. Her mouth fell into a frown. Are you trying to imply something? I'm just trying to gauge how much you know about what your son is going through. Aizawa's words cut through to Inko's heart. Her nails dug into the flesh of her palms. What do you mean, what my son is going through? Even to her own ears. Inko's voice was high and reedy, panic and worry already leaking into her tone. Please calm down, Midoriya-san. Aizawa's voice was even and calm as he continued. Do you think your son has been lying to you at all? I don't see what this has to do with. She watched as Aizawa picked up another cookie and bit into it, like he had all the time in the world. This broke her. Her hands unclenched, the red half-moons created by her nails stinging in the open air. She wiped at the tears on her cheeks that she couldn't remember falling. Izuku is a good boy. He doesn't lie to me. Her hands shook as she tried to keep her face clean. Images flashed before her eyes. Izuku's bare walls, bruises that she barely caught glimpses of. Izuku's back as he walked out of the door every day after dinner and every morning on the weekends. Her baby wasn't lying to her. He wouldn't. He had never done that before. Maybe he has been lying. Inko whispered, looking into Aizawa's nearly black eyes. Was there a way to read what he knew? And she didn't, just through his eyes. What have you noticed? Aizawa asked, taking a second bite of the cookie he still held. Just small things. Inko hurried to say, nothing serious, I don't think. Just, he took down the posters in his room. And he doesn't talk about his interests with me that much anymore. He's been spending more time outside on. He usually just tells me he's going out to chase hero fights or that's what I assumed, and he seems on edge. I don't know the last time I saw him relaxed was but Izuku is my son, she continued, her voice thick with the tears she wasn't wiping away anymore. He would tell me if something was really wrong with him, right? While she was speaking, Aizawa had finished the rest of the cookie. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. I don't think he would. What do you know that I don't? Inko forced the words out. It was hard to keep her focus on what Aizawa was saying and not the horrible feeling of dread that was rising up inside of her. Aizawa sighed and talked slowly. I met your son on the roof of your apartment building 3 months ago. I was barely fast enough to catch him before he hit the ground. He jumped with the intent to kill himself, and then he lied to you about it. Inko felt her hands cover her mouth from outside of herself. She was watching a woman with green hair and a man with black hair have a discussion. She was floating above it all. She could feel the fabric of the couch. She could smell the air freshener she had sprayed before Aizawa arrived. She could taste the remnants of the shortbread cookie on her tongue, but she was not present. This is not your fault, Midoriya-san. Izuku went to great lengths to hide how he was feeling from you. Inko felt her chest rise raggedly as she gasped for air. She couldn't stop picturing it. Her son falling toward the ground and smashing into the concrete. "You're lying," she choked out, the sensations becoming real and overwhelming as she slammed back into her body. "He wouldn't do that, Izuku, as he's happy. He's never mentioned anything about feeling like that, and he would never leave me. He would if he thought you would be better off for it though, wouldn't he?" Aizawa said. "My life would never be better without my son." She snarled at him, her shock and anger grounding her. She could almost feel the heat rising up inside of her, wanting to spew out and burn anyone who dared to suggest such a thing. "He's the most important thing in the world to me, and he has been in pain for a long while," Aizawa replied. Inko felt the fire rise further up her throat at his stoic words. How could someone talk about her son this way and feel nothing? "When you picked him up from the clinic, he blindsided me. I didn't expect him to be able to get you out of there so quickly after what he had just done. To me, this indicates that your son has been hiding things from you for a very long time. Long enough that he has a go-to plan for concealing things from you." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Can you think of anything that he would feel the need to lie about from a young age? Something that started this behavior?" Inko racked her mind, trying and failing to think of a moment from Izuku's childhood where she had caught him in a lie. Her searching chilled the flame inside of her as she thought. When she was a little girl, she would lie about sweets and whether or not her playmates' parents said yes to sleepovers, but she couldn't remember Izuku ever doing any of that. He had always been such a good child, maybe a bit energetic, but he had grown out of that fairly quickly. "And no, I can't remember Izuku ever lying to me." She bit her lip. "That's now that I'm thinking about it, that is weird, isn't it? I've always trusted him. He always just told me if he thought he might have done something wrong." Aizawa's face fell into consideration. He would just confess. Inko's anger dissipated completely as she became more focused on the conversation. "I'm not very strict, Aizawa-san," she told him. "I would punish him if he did something wrong, but it was always easy to tell that he felt bad about what he did. At worst, he wouldn't be allowed to play outside or not have dessert or something." Aizawa grunted in affirmation. "We're getting off topic." Right. Inko shook her head to clear it. "I can't say that I've ever caught Izuku in a lie. Until now," Aizawa told her. "Your son lied to you about how he got into that clinic 3 months ago. He contacted me using my business card soon after. Since then I have gotten to know your son. He has very little self-worth. He values others' needs above his own, and, again, he is very talented. Aside from informing you about your son's suicide attempt and getting into contact with you about his well-being, I also contacted you to talk about training him. Midoriya has proved to me that he has promise. I want to make sure he can hone his skills, and that he stays alive long enough to make a difference in the world. You just told me that Izuku is having that he's suicidal. How would training him into a job that revolves around danger and frankly martyrdom help him?" Inko asked, her long-held fear about Izuku and hero work flooding into her chest. "And he already told me he doesn't want to be a hero anymore. And you believed him." Well, why wouldn't I?" Inko found herself saying defensively. "Isn't it a good sign? If Izuku is troubled, and I still doubt that I wouldn't notice something so drastic like that, then it's good that he's moving away from danger." Aizawa shook his head. "I know that he's your son, but I have to disagree with that. You've barely known him for 3 months. You couldn't possibly know what means what." Inko snapped at Aizawa. "I'm not trying to overstep my bounds here, Midoriya-san. But Izuku has told me things he doesn't tell you because he has known you his whole life. He knows you and he doesn't want to disappoint you. Even if you're a stranger, Izuku wouldn't want to disappoint you either," Inko argued. This entire conversation was starting to become too much for her. A strange man, claiming to be a teacher at UA, wants to talk about her son. She invites him into her home, only for him to tell her that she doesn't know her own son. Izuku seems to know him. He even made cookies specifically for him, but he's never talked to Inko about Aizawa. "No," Aizawa agreed. "The benchmark is just different. You are his mother. He wants you to see him as a good son. That doesn't include being suicidal. I've already seen that side of him, so he's had to find different ways to prove himself to me." "And how has he done that, Aizawa-san?" Inko asked, glaring at the man across from her. "If I'm being completely honest, this situation is strange. I'm not sure if I should believe anything that you're saying." Aizawa leaned back into his chair and dragged a hand down his face. "He's been cleaning a beach," Aizawa told her, his eyes slightly closed as he looked up at the ceiling. "You said that you noticed he's been out of the house more. He's been cleaning a beach under my suggestion." It seemed obvious in retrospect. Izuku hadn't mentioned the fights that she assumed he was chasing after. He always came back exhausted. There had been sand on his shoes. Why couldn't she have put that together on her own? Why wouldn't Izuku just tell her that? Why wouldn't he just tell me that? The anger and confusion and shock were all mixed up now. Inko couldn't be sure what was real and what wasn't. "My best guess is that he's rationalized to himself that it's connected to something about him that you wouldn't like." Inko unclenched her jaw. When had she clenched it? Her teeth ached. Maybe you should just explain what you know about what Izuku is going through, and then we can talk about what I believe and what I think is best for him. And so he did. And while he talked and explained and rationalized, Inko felt hot tears dripping down her face. She bent over so that she was almost folded in two, and she sobbed into her hands. Aizawa put a hand on her shoulder. It was a stiff touch, but firm. He continued to talk, and she really started to listen. In the first grade, Izuku became the scapegoat of his class. At 7 years old, he had lost any hope of getting his quirk late, had semi-accepted his role in society as the quirkless nobody. Kindergarten had proven to him that people did not want to be friends with him. And that was fine. He could be their friend. They just didn't have to be friends back. It was like when his mom brought in a cake for the class on his birthday. It was almost summer break, so it was lucky that they were still in school at all. His mom told him to make sure to share extra with his friends. Everyone got the same amount, even though no one told him happy birthday outside of the song that the teacher made them sing. Izuku was happy to see everyone enjoying the cake. He could be a good friend. Even if people didn't like him, that didn't mean that they couldn't appreciate his actions. Like if Kaken was going to get in trouble for knocking over the markers, Izuku could pick them up for him. Or if his seatmate got glue on his desk, Izuku could help him clean it up. It was his way of being helpful. Nobody liked a mess, and Izuku was good at cleaning them up. One time a girl drew all over her desk, and Izuku knew she would get in trouble for it, so he stayed in during recess to wipe off all the ink that he could. This is when people realized that they could point fingers at him and he wouldn't say anything about it. That's just what a friend would do, wasn't it? Izuku wasn't going to be a tattletale. If he had to stay in during recess to put all the scissors in the right drawer, he didn't mind. It wasn't like anyone wanted to play with him during recess anyway, and he could always go outside after he finished picking up. It got easier as time passed. By 4th and 5th grade, people didn't even have to point fingers anymore. Teachers would just assume that it was him. Izuku was deemed the type of student to cause trouble just for attention. If he made a mess, just make him clean it up and don't pay attention to him. That would make him feel like his tactics were working. It didn't happen as much in middle school. Izuku had long since given up being a good friend. All he could hope for was not being a nuisance. He never stopped trying to help, though. He had been cleaning up other people's messes for so long it would feel wrong to leave pencil shavings on the ground or not pick up a crumpled paper. Hello, this is Asami speaking. Asami's voice came through Izuku's phone speaker eagerly. Hi. Izuku glanced over at the pile of scrap metal he had put together for her as reassurance for why he was calling. This is Midoriya, Izuku. Asami cut him off immediately. Izuku-chan, she shouted. Do you have stuff for me to pick up? Why, yes, Izuku stuttered out, a flush starting to bloom on his cheeks from her excitement. Cool, I'll be there in about 20 minutes. Hold tight. She hung up. Izuku took the phone away from his ear and stared at the screen for a solid minute before he decided to take a break while he waited for Asami to show up. He sat down heavily onto the concrete steps that led down to the beach, dragging the tip of his shoe through the sand to make abstract patterns. He could feel himself getting worked up. Izuku smoothed his hands down his thighs, trying to straighten out the tension he could feel building up in his entire body. Asami was nice, and she wanted these parts. She wasn't going out of her way. He wasn't being a burden. She asked him to call her. It was going to be fine. She would just show up with her truck and Izuku would load it, and then she would leave and he could keep working. It didn't help that he still felt stressed about his mother and Aizawa meeting that day. He was confident that Aizawa wouldn't betray his trust. But after what he told his mom, would she even agree to hero training? And the cookies, what if Aizawa didn't like them and Izuku just looked like an idiot? What if Aizawa had just been joking that whole time and now he and his mother were laughing over Izuku's stupidity? No, that didn't make any sense. Izuku tried to focus on the present. He dragged the tip of his shoe through the sand harder, swirling it so that he created a spiral pattern. Get out of your head, he told himself. Focus on what you're doing, not on you. As soon as that thought was finished, he heard the roar of an engine approaching. He hurriedly raised his eyes from the swirls in the sand to look over his shoulder. The truck was red and rusted and beat up. If he squinted against the glare of the sun, he could just make out Asami in the driver's side, singing along to something on the radio. She looked to the side as she parked, her orange hair bouncing with the movement. Izuku followed her eyes and felt a jolt of panic run through him when he saw that someone else was sitting in the passenger seat. He scrambled up from his seat when he realized that the mystery passenger's eyes were on him. He dusted off his shorts and his hands automatically came in front of him to pick at his fingertips while he watched the pair get out of the car. The girl in the passenger seat looked about his age. She had pink shoulder-length hair that was styled into thick dreadlocks. She was wearing a plain black tank top with workshop coveralls tied casually around her waist. The girl and Asami had the same kind of energy, relaxed and hyper at the same time. Izuku watched anxiously as they approached. Izuku-chan, Asami shouted out after she closed the door of the truck. Her hands were cupped around her mouth. I brought my goddaughter with me. Hope you don't mind. And no, that's fine, ma'am. Izuku shouted back. He absent-mindedly picked at the skin under his nails as they approached. A pinprick of blood flooded the area under his nail, creating an arc of red that was accompanied by a dull stab of pain. Easily looked over, Asami walked forward confidently, her hands swinging loosely at her side and her shoulders back. She was wearing a tank top and coveralls as well, but her coveralls were still on her shoulders, just the buttons undone. In contrast, the girl seemed to bounce forward. She moved quickly, overtaking Asami until she was standing right in front of Izuku. Right in front of Izuku. Her face was so close to Izuku's that he could see that her yellow eyes didn't have regular pupils, but crosshairs. Izuku felt her breath against his cheek briefly as she prepared to say something. Before she could, Izuku took a step back, right off of the stairs that he was waiting on the edge of. Izuku let out a squeak of surprise and braced himself for a tumble into the sand. The girl acted quickly though, lurching forward and firmly grabbing his arms, stopping his tumble in its tracks. Asami laughed. "Hey, what did I tell you about scaring people? You can't get that close to young boys. They get nervous." Because that was the girl's name apparently, settled him back onto the concrete and then took a small step back. She was still uncomfortably close to him. Izuku shuffled to the side. He carefully watched his feet so that he didn't fall again. "You did tell me that," Mei said. "However, I fail to see the reasoning behind distancing myself from people I might want to become close to." Then she stuck out her hand for Izuku to shake. "The name's Hatsume and inventing is the game." Izuku didn't take her hand. He just clutched at his own hands tighter. He glanced over at Asami. Her eyes were kind and she had a warm smile on her face. She nodded at him, urging him to shake her goddaughter's hand. As soon as he grasped it, Hatsume swung their joined hands wildly up and down, bringing her other hand on top of their clasped ones to further enhance the alien approximation of a handshake that he was currently participating in. "Asami told me that you're cleaning up this beach all on your own," Hatsume told him. She disengaged from the handshake as she spoke so that she could gesture. "As an inventor, I'm interested in the parts I can find this way, but I can get those from my godmother. What I'm really interested in is the physical labor that you are apparently very capable of doing." She took another step closer to him and he took a step back on instinct. His heels were halfway off of the top step. He took the plunge and decided he would just stand on the second step. This was a mistake as it made him shorter than Hatsume, and she was now looking down at him with a manic glint in her eyes. "I've been told by multiple people that I am not very adept at making friends," Hatsume said, with no trace of embarrassment in her voice. "You, however, would not be my friend, but my assistant. I need someone to help me with heavy parts that I cannot lift on my own. I am fairly strong." At this, she flexed an arm right in front of Izuku's face. She was fairly well muscled. "And you are too." At this, she lurched forward and grabbed his arms again, squeezing his biceps. Izuku squeaked again and reflected on the fact that he had squeaked in front of these two twice in under 10 minutes. He heard Asami laugh but couldn't see anything beyond Hatsume's sparkling eyes. "Together we would be able to lift the heavy parts that I need for my babies." "Babies?" Izuku yelped. Asami's laughter turned into full-on cackling. Izuku tried to peer around Hatsume and he saw Asami bent over and clutching at her stomach. Hatsume seemed not to like the loss of attention and she brought her face even closer to his. Izuku flinched back again and lightly windmilled his arms when this set him on the precipice of the second step. Asami laughed harder. This was all beginning to get too overwhelming for him. "Yep. For example," Hatsume pulled away suddenly and whipped her phone out of her pocket. "I'm currently working on a pair of goggles that will." Hatsume cut off suddenly as Asami patted her harshly on the back. "Doll, you really gotta calm down when you meet new people. I'm gonna die from dehydration at the rate that you're making me tear up." Hatsume rubbed at the back of her neck where Asami had hit her. Right. Sorry, Asami. It's fine, doll," Asami said, ruffling Hatsume's hair. "Izuku-chan, this is Mei, my goddaughter. Her mother was one of my first customers when I started my yard. We got really close and when she had this little darling, she took the opportunity to make me a free babysitter." Asami looked sideways at Izuku. "I hope you don't mind that I brought her. She can be a bit much at first, but I thought you two might get along. You're cleaning a beach out of the kindness of your heart. Mei wants to go into support so that she can help heroes. You're both good kids." Izuku stumbled over his words, trying to regain his footing in the situation. And also on the stairs. Now that Hatsume had moved away, Izuku could step back onto the same level as them. "That's fine. Mei seems nice." Asami grinned at him. "Good. Then both of you can start loading up all this scrap metal you've gathered for me." Izuku nodded and Hatsume gave her godmother a thumbs up. It was an affair that Izuku could only describe as bubbly. Hatsume and Asami had an easy kind of rapport that could only be established by years of familiarity. They joked with each other and Asami ruffled Mei's hair and touched her arm easily. It was a kind of physical and emotional intimacy that Izuku had only ever experienced with his mother. Izuku knew it wasn't odd for people to have close relationships outside of family, but it wasn't something he saw in person often. Izuku got the distinct impression that if he wasn't so nervous and sweaty he would be having a good time. Aside from the relaxed atmosphere that Asami and Hatsume created, he was also burning with questions about Asami's quirk. She didn't show off, but some of the scrap that he gathered with a lot of rust on it would find itself into the truck bed without either of the middle schoolers loading it, as it was though he couldn't stop being aware of the heat, of how he moved sloppily, of how he fumbled for things to say whenever the conversation moved to him, of how he was out of place. Eventually, they got all of the scrap metal that he had separated from the garbage into the truck. Asami slammed the truck closed and then dusted her hands off. She turned to lean against it, looking her helpers up and down. Izuku was sweating through his t-shirt. He grabbed the hem and shook it up and down to try and circulate some fresh air across his skin. Hatsume wasn't much better. She had her arms above her head and was taking deep breaths to slow her heart rate. Asami seemed pleased with this. "Well, kiddos," she began, "you did good work, so I think you deserve a treat." Hatsume's eyes zoomed in on her godmother's face. Izuku knew this because as he watched the crosshairs in her eyes twisted and got bigger just like a scope would. "Yes," Hatsume shouted. She pumped her fists in the air and then slid her gaze over to Izuku. "You like ice cream, don't you, assistant?" Izuku knew that this was a decision. He could say yes and go with them and maybe make his first friend in a long time that would be his friend back. But they didn't know. Asami and Hatsume didn't know, and it hadn't come up in conversation yet. This would be the perfect opportunity for them to get to know him, for them to ask him about things he desperately didn't want to be asked about, things that would end the first nice relationship he had had for years before it even started. He could say no, make up some kind of excuse and wait until the next time he needed help with the metal to see them again. It would be his normal, alone. But what if he offended them? Would it be rude to turn down ice cream? Hatsume was obviously interested in him becoming her helper or something. Would Asami see it as a slight to her goddaughter if he said no and crushed their budding friendship? There was a lot to consider. However, at the end of the day, Midoriya Izuku was a middle school student who hadn't gone out with friends, ever. If you want to," Izuku said, "as long as I'm not imposing." "Nonsense, assistant," Hatsume shouted. "It would be a pleasure to have another audience member to listen to me complain about the extremely lame costume designs of the top 10 heroes." Asami grinned at him and pushed herself off the edge of the truck. "Plus," she said, "I can't lift this much metal at a time with my quirk, so I'm kinda bribing you to help me unload this later too." Izuku felt much steadier on his feet knowing that he would be doing something in exchange for their kindness. "Cool," he rushed to say, "that's no problem." Asami got into the driver's side and Hatsume opened the passenger for him. "You don't want to sit next to Asami?" Izuku questioned, eyeing the middle part of the bench nervously. "Nope," Hatsume said, shoving at his shoulder so that she could get in. "The middle seat is the worst. And don't call me Asami," Asami shouted, sticking her keys into the car. "It's Asami-chan, we're old friends, right?" Asami winked at him. Okay, Izuku mumbled, sliding down the bench and clicking his seatbelt into place. He tried to sit as still as possible while Hatsume settled in so that he wasn't touching either of the girls. "Oh," Asami said, snapping her fingers, taking her hand off of her keys mid-twist. She turned toward Izuku. "Maybe text your parents. Let them know you're leaving the beach." Izuku felt his stomach sink. "Right," he mumbled, pulling out his phone and opening the chat between him and his mother. "Right, just tell his mother, who he lied to about what he was doing. Just text her about leaving the beach that she didn't even know he had stepped foot on." The car started while Izuku stared at the keyboard. He mimed texting and then shoved his phone back into his pocket. Hatsume and Asami were too focused on arguing over what place they were going to pay attention to Izuku's phone screen. Here was a list of things that Aizawa Shoda noticed the moment that he walked into Midoriya & Co. and Midoriya Izuku's household. 1. It was only Co. and her son living in the apartment. As soon as he toed off his shoes and stepped out of the Genkin, Co. was ushering him forward toward the living room. His eyes swept over the doors and the picture frames that lined the hallway. Co. was nervous and she moved quickly through the halls, so Aizawa only caught glimpses of the photographs. It was only them. A chronology of their life together in snapshots of Co. and Izuku at the playground or blowing out candles on birthdays. The lack of a paternal figure was evident in the photographs, but also the decor of the house. It wasn't overly flowery or girly by any means, but it was neat and put together enough that Aizawa could tell there was only one strong interior influencer within the household. 2. It was clean. Aizawa had almost chalked this up to Inko's own anxieties that were apparent in the way she held herself, but it wasn't that clean. It wasn't the spotless clean that meant someone had rushed to make their home presentable for a guest. It looked like this was the normal state of the home. Aizawa had grimaced just a bit at that, thinking of Hisashi and his apartment with its buildup of cat hair all over the floor and couch, the miscellaneous hero gear dropped in the corner of their bedroom. So they had a healthy relationship with each other, one that was strong enough that their shared living space didn't show any signs of discord. Aizawa was relieved at this. Izuku had rarely, if ever, spoke of his mother, but when he did, Aizawa had paid extra close attention. Despite this, he hadn't been able to read anything in the boy's tone about how he felt about the woman. His worries were for nothing. Everything about their home spoke of comfort and familiarity. They had a stable relationship. A stable relationship that Izuku seemed to have carefully manufactured. Here was a list of things that he noticed halfway through the conversation. The conversation where he told Midoriya and Co. about her son's suicide attempt and asked her if he could train her son. 1. Midoriya and Co. loved her son with a passion that many parents did not. She cared for him deeply. The idea that he was hiding things from her, intentionally, was heartbreaking for her. And yet despite that, she sat on that couch and listened to him with a single-minded determination. Her hands shook and her eyes watered, and she bowed under the incredible pressure that Aizawa was dropping on her, but she listened. Aizawa couldn't imagine what was going through her head. He had tried his best to be straightforward, but the conversation had still been long and drawn out. It included a lot of backtracking, explaining, and bad attempts at comforting on Aizawa's part. 2. It was horrible to stare into her eyes and see the pain there. So much that it overflowed and created streams of despair that she kept wiping away. Aizawa had no question in his mind, however, that he had done the right thing. Alongside the pain and the shock and the tears, there was relief. Relief and strong shoulders and setting dates that she wouldn't mind Izuku staying with him overnight. They had each other's numbers now, and a synced Google Calendar so that they could be on the same page about how Izuku was spending his time, so that they could keep an eye on him and make sure he wasn't endangering himself. Aizawa had met this kid only a few months ago, but he couldn't help but feel like he was in just as deep as Izuku's own mother was. He wanted to see Izuku in person again. He wanted to see the kid without the dead look in his eyes that he had when they first met. He wanted to watch Izuku develop one of his analyses in person. He wanted to know if Izuku would be as adept at detective work as Aizawa thought he would. Here is what he noticed as he left Midoriya and Ko's apartment. 1. It was late. He had been there for almost 5 hours, and Izuku wasn't home yet. Ko was nervous about this, but she waved off Aizawa's offer to call him. She said, "I want him to know I trust him." 2. He and Midoriya and Co. were going to be good friends. It wasn't something he noticed, really. It was more like a feeling he got deep in his stomach when she pushed a Tupperware into his hands as he left. She cared about her son. She cared so much she was willing to do as he asked to make sure that Izuku had the highest chance of recovery. What he asked was that she not tell Izuku about the first half of their conversation. The half about Izuku attempting suicide, the half about his son's deep-seated need to be useful, the half about his wholehearted belief that he didn't deserve to be alive. She cared so much, and she was willing to do anything to help her son. It was the warmth that let him know they would be getting along. It was the same kind of warmth that he tried to hide when he looked at his students, or when he and Hisashi went out on dates together in public, or when his coworkers insisted on dragging him along for lunch. She cared and he cared, and they were going to work together to help the kid that he had grown unreasonably fond of in a short amount of time. Here is what he took with him. Bleh. Hisashi playfully stuck out his tongue after swallowing his bite of cookie. This is so bitter. Who would like cookies like this? Aizawa raised an eyebrow as he dunked his fourth cookie into a glass of milk. Right, Hisashi pouted. You're a caffeine-addicted, bitter taste-loving psycho. Hisashi let out an overdramatic and prolonged sigh. The listener is apparently great at baking, and yet I cannot reap the benefits. What a tragic turn of events. Aizawa rolled his eyes and snuggled deeper into his husband's side on the couch. I'm sure that if you asked him to make you something, he would jump at the chance to please someone. Hisashi flailed his arms wildly. Nuo, Shota, I can't take advantage of his insecurities. That would make the sweets taste like ash in my mouth. Aizawa snorted at the theatrical reaction. Then I guess you'll just have to come to some of the training sessions and see if you can help build his confidence enough that he isn't motivated by insidious insecurities to make you cookies. Okay, Hisashi began, but now I have ulterior motives. Aizawa cut him off by slapping a hand over Hisashi's mouth. SHHHHH. He wrapped his arms more tightly around his husband. I've had a long day, and the only thing that can comfort your aching soul is snuggles and cuddles from your amazingly handsome husband. Hisashi managed to wiggle out of Aizawa's silencing hold and wrap his arms around Aizawa, pulling him to his chest. I think you can really do this. I think you can really help this kid. Aizawa's words were muffled in Hisashi's shirt when he replied, I think so too. Hatsume was the kind of girl who didn't care how close she sat to people, or how much of the conversation she was monopolizing, or how odd she looked to the people around her. Mei knew that as a teenage girl she most definitely should care about things like that, but she didn't. Mei liked to learn about people she thought were interesting. She liked to take apart machines and then put them back together. She liked to do research late at night and then bombard her mother with ideas about pro-hero gear over breakfast while they ate cereal. She liked to ask her dad a million questions about his inventions when they all sat down to dinner. Mei, she was deciding, liked Midoriya Izuku. His beard and mustache appear to be made of fire, but when he voluntarily turns off the flames on his face, a small amount of stubble shows around his jaw. Izuku was fiddling with his spoon while he spoke. I only know that because of, like press stuff, gossip magazines. May stuck another spoonful of her ice cream into her mouth before she answered. A perfectly reasonable thing to know, assistant. Because Izuku would be her assistant. They had already discussed All Might's costume. Or costumes, because Izuku knew a whole lot about all the different variations of All Might's costumes over his career. It was fascinating. He had so much insight on things that May had never even considered. Appearance, for one. She had only ever thought about practicality, maneuverability, how cool it would be to use against a villain. It had taken him a moment to warm up to the conversation. May had dominated the first half, spouting statistics and opinions while Asami licked her vanilla cone with a smile on her face and tried to subtly kick Izuku under the table to encourage him to cut her off. May's eyes were darting all around the small shop they were in, taking in the white tile, the group of college students eating at the table across from theirs, the way Izuku kept anxiously stirring his bowl of chocolate ice cream, the happy crinkles around Asami's eyes as she watched the two of them. At some point, May had moved on from talking about All Might's fighting style and how she could enhance it with one of her babies and started to talk about how boring his costume was. Izuku's nose had scrunched up, and when he opened his mouth to speak, May closed hers instantly. She may not care about how much she talked, but she did want to hear what her new assistant had to say if it made his nose scrunch up all cute like that. He talked about inspiration to the public and color theory and symbols. He talked about history and literature and things May had never been interested in but was now finding incredibly interesting because her assistant was lighting up in a way she hadn't seen before. Since the moment she had gotten out of her godmother's truck, Izuku was nervous, polite, and helpful, but nervous and twitchy as all get out. He relaxed when he talked about this. She tracked his body language using Zoom and was happy to see that she had finally pulled him into the false sense of security that she needed for him to participate more firmly in the conversation. And hopefully, for him to let her put her number in his phone so that she could call him when she wanted him to test one of her inventions. Go on, May spoke through the sherbet that was currently melting in her mouth. While Izuku's voice got quieter as he continued, May had to lean forward across the table to hear his mumbling. His hero costume consists of a tight, navy bodysuit with lines of flames streaming across his chest, upper torso, arms, and, most prominently, his shoulders. He uses his flames as a makeshift mask around his eyes. And the tall boots he wears appear to be either made of fire themselves or constantly left alight, as only their soles and laces are visible around the flames. He sports white bracers on his lower arms, styled in a cage pattern, and a blue belt with a pouch attached on either side. May nodded. Yeah, not gonna lie, assistant, that's a pretty lame costume. No bright colors or cool babies. Yeah, Izuku responded. I know that he's the number 2 hero and that he's powerful and stuff, but like... Izuku trailed off when he noticed that May was still bracing herself against the table to hear him better. He leaned back in his chair and shot a glance at her godmother. May decided then and there that she didn't care much about if Izuku thought she was too close. He would have to get used to it eventually. To go on Izuku-chan. If May was trying to rapidly increase their platonic relationship to one on par with a best friend status, using a nickname would ensure that Izuku was more familiar with her. She might as well borrow Asami's for convenience's sake. Well, it doesn't make him very approachable, does it? Izuku stuttered. Hatsume hummed in interest, prompting him to continue. Well, All Might may be physically intimidating, but his image is purposely curated to look friendly and appealing. His catchphrase is "I am here" because he knows that his presence is comforting to civilians. And that's on purpose. He's nice. Izuku's tone shifted slightly. He's almost always nice to his fans and he inspires people to be better. In contrast, Endeavor is, well, Asami cut in. He's an asshat. Izuku choked on air. Asami patted his back. May giggled. A little bit, Izuku conceded after he recovered. And almost half of that is because of his costume. He's covered in fire. No one wants to run into his arms even if he has the amount of control necessary not to burn them. Because fire is scary. Asami let out a huff of amusement. I never really thought about that before, but you're right. Even if it was life or death, I would hesitate to run to him. And I mean, aside from that, despite his charity work, all his public appearances make him seem like an asshole. May giggled again as Izuku shifted uncomfortably at her godmother's brash words. Izuku ate another spoonful of ice cream while he got his thoughts together. That's actually the other half of what makes him kinda unappealing to the public. He has no personality beyond the stoic strong flame hero. That's the main reason I never got into him. He may look cool, but he also looks kinda scary, and he doesn't counteract that with any of his media appearances. Getting back to costumes though, because that's what you like, right? Hatsume. At this point, May and Asami were both done with their ice cream, but Izuku's was turning into a soupy mess in his bowl. His costume uses blue and orange, and that's maybe the only good thing about it, aside from the intimidation factor that comes from literally being covered in flames. Blue and orange are complementary colors, and the high contrast of complementary colors creates a vibrant look, especially when used at the full saturation that's naturally appealing to people. Complementary colors are especially pleasing to the eye because different types of photoreceptor cells, which contribute to color vision and perceive different types of light in the color spectrum. They are especially dynamic since they simultaneously stimulate different parts of the eye. It's a natural example of opposites attracting. May blinked at her assistant and then leaned so far over the table that separated them that the edge dug into her stomach. You may be useful for more than just testing her assistant. Izuku leaned back from her eager eyes, dragging his ice cream with him and cradling the melted treat to his chest. Give me your phone, May demanded, sticking her hand out for the device. Izuku compiled immediately, transferring his bowl from both hands to one and digging around in his shorts pocket to get his phone. As soon as the cell was dropped into her hand, she opened his contacts and added her own name and number. They reached her arm out and struck a peace sign next to her cheek. The photo was perfect. She set it as the icon of herself in Izuku's contacts and then texted herself to ensure that she had a line of communication with her brilliant new assistant. When she handed it back to him, Izuku fumbled with it and stared at her contact for just a moment too long. May zoomed in on his expression, trying to read it. Welp, Asami sighed. I should probably get you kiddos home. It's like 6. Asami checked the clock. Yeah, just about. Izuku-chan, I'll just drop you off at the beach, alright? I don't want to be that creepy lady that asks you for your home address after taking you to a second location. Asami wiggled her fingers at him. What about unloading the scrap metal? Izuku asked, twisting to toss his mostly empty bowl into the trash. I don't want to take advantage of you or take up too much of your time. It's alright, kiddo, Asami told him, reaching out and ruffling Izuku's hair. I was kidding about that. You don't need to do anything for me. You're already doing me a huge favor sorting out the good from the bad on that beach. Don't worry about it. May watched Izuku as he fidgeted with his fingertips and bit his lip. Oh, okay. When they dropped Izuku off, May stared out the window, tracking his moments. She zoomed in on the reflection of his face in the side mirror as they drove off. He looked sad. Hey mom, I'm home, Izuku shouted from the entrance, kneeling to untie his shoes. He heard a clatter from the kitchen. He looked down the hallway, trying to untie his shoes faster. Are you alright? Izuku called. Yes, Inko yelled. I'm alright, sweetheart. Izuku lined his shoes up with his mother's in the Jenkin and then padded down the hallway. He hesitated at the corner and peeked around the wall to see his mother in the kitchen. She was standing over the plate of cookies on the counter and had a half-eaten one in her hand. The other hand held a mug and there was a small puddle on the counter. That must have been the clatter he heard. Izuku rounded the corner. His mom turned to look at him. Izuku could immediately tell that she had been crying. Are you alright? Izuku asked, rushing forward. I am fine, baby, Inko said. She put the rest of the cookie in her mouth to avoid talking to him. How did your meeting with Eraser Aizawa-sensei go? It went well, his mom hurried to say, taking a sip of her drink to wash down the cookie. It went well. He wants to train you to be a hero. Izuku flinched. Yeah, I know I told you that I wanted to go into. His mom interrupted. Baby, you don't have to explain yourself. I know you're going through a rough time. I get it, sweetheart. That was when Izuku knew that Aizawa had not kept his promise. Aizawa had, without a doubt, told his mother that he had thrown himself off of their apartment building. And whatever else Aizawa had inferred about his state of mind from their phone conversations. So, did he like the cookies? Izuku asked, steeling himself against the panicked and frantic gusts of wind that bit at him, filling him with cold. He rocked back and forth on his heels with his hands on the edge of the counter. He tried to project a carefree attitude. His mom didn't need to worry more than she already was. She seemed to grasp at the normality with both hands, metaphorically. Literally, Izuku watched as her fingers tightened around her mug. He liked him. She smiled at him. I even sent the rest of them home with him and he seemed pleased. Well, it's tough to read a man like him, but he ate more than one while we were talking, and he doesn't strike me as the kind of person to do things he doesn't want to do. The biting cold ceased slightly. That's good. He flashed his mom a fake smile. Yeah, Inko sighed. Well, Izuku said, I'm not hungry or anything, so I might just go to bed. Inko's face scrunched up as she took her next sip. Are you certain? Yeah. Izuku rubbed one socked foot against the other. Good night, Mom. Good night, baby. Inko rounded the counter and gave Izuku a tight hug. I love you. I love you too, Mom, Izuku mumbled into her shoulder. Sometimes Izuku lied in bed at night and he couldn't sleep. It wasn't that he was filled with anxious energy. It wasn't that he was tired and just couldn't fall asleep. It wasn't that he couldn't get comfortable. It wasn't that he was hyped up on caffeine or sugar. It wasn't that he had stayed up too late and was just waiting for morning. It was nothing reasonable that kept Izuku up on these nights. Sometimes at the perfectly reasonable hour of 11 o'clock at night, Izuku would realize that he was not going to fall asleep and he would think about drowning. He would think about it romantically. The pale blue of the water with the sun streaming through it, or the deep dark blue of the water after sunset. The way that the salt would only sting his eyes for a second before he would adjust and be able to look around at the inky blackness surrounding him as he sunk deeper and deeper into the water. The feeling of weightlessness that came with being underwater, even if you were tied to an object, tethering you to the seafloor. How water was fluid, how it would allow him to float, suspended between the bottom of the sea and the surface. How he might be able to look up, see the bubbles from his breath rise to the surface in beautiful pale circle. The feeling of water, cool, smooth, water flooding into his mouth and down his throat. The feeling of it filling his lungs so that he wouldn't have to bother to breathe anymore. The feeling of fading out of consciousness and leaving. He would think about it practically. Drowning is defined as suffocation due to immersion in a liquid, usually water. Water closing over the victim's mouth and nose cuts off the body's supply of oxygen. Deprived of oxygen, the victim stops struggling, loses consciousness, and gives up the remaining air in their lungs. The heart may continue to beat feebly for a brief interval, but eventually it ceases. Until recently, the oxygen deprivation that occurs with immersion in water was believed to lead to irreversible brain damage if it lasted beyond 3 to 7 minutes. It is now known that victims immersed for an hour or longer may be totally salvageable, physically and intellectually, even if they lack evidence of life and have no measurable vital signs, heartbeat, pulse, or breathing at the time of rescue. Up to 15% of drownings are dry, presumably because the breath is held or because a reflex spasm of the larynx seals off the airway inlet at the throat. When aspiration does occur, the volume of fluid entering the lungs rarely exceeds a glassful. The lungs fill with water because of an abnormal accumulation of body fluids that is a secondary complication of oxygen deprivation. Commonly, quantities of water are swallowed and later vomited spontaneously or during resuscitative procedures, a natural biological mechanism that is triggered by contact with extremely cold water, known as the mammalian diving reflex, enhances survival during submersion, thus permitting seagoing mammals to hunt for long periods underwater. Scientists have determined that vestiges of the reflex persist in humans. The mechanism is powerful in children and teenagers. It diverts blood from the limbs, abdomen, and surface areas of the body to the heart and the brain. It also causes an interruption of respiratory efforts and reduces the rate of the heartbeat, even though the heart functions at a slower rate. In other respects, it performs normally. Drowning typically occurs silently, with only a few people able to wave their hands or call for help. In 2XXX, there were an estimated 4.5 million cases of unintentional drowning worldwide. That year, there were 324,000 drowning deaths, making it the third leading cause of unintentional injuries after falls and motor vehicle collisions. Of these deaths, 56,000 occurred in children less than 5 years old. Drowning accounts for 7% of all injury-related deaths, with more than 90% of these deaths occurring in developing countries. Drowning occurs more frequently in males and the young. He would think about it horribly. Waterboarding is a form of torture in which water is poured over a cloth covering the face and breathing passages of an immobilized captive, causing the person to experience drowning. Drowning is not a pleasant experience. The instinct not to breathe underwater is so strong that it overcomes the agony of running out of air. No matter how desperate the drowning person is, they don't inhale until they're on the verge of losing consciousness. At that point, there's so much carbon dioxide in the blood, and so little oxygen, that chemical sensors in the brain trigger an involuntary breath. That's what's called the break point. Laboratory experiments have shown the break point to come after 87 seconds. After that, a spasmodic breath drags water into the mouth and windpipe, and then one of two things happens. In about 10% of people, water touching the vocal cords triggers an immediate contraction in the muscles around the larynx. In effect, the central nervous system judges something in the voice box to be more of a threat than low oxygen levels in the blood, and acts accordingly. It's called a laryngospasm. It's so powerful that it overcomes the breathing reflex and eventually suffocates the person. A person with laryngospasm drowns without any water in their lungs. In the other 90% of people, water floods the lungs and ends any waning transfer of oxygen to the blood. The clock running down now. The drowner, only half conscious and enfeebled by oxygen depletion, is in no position to fight their way back up to the surface. The very process of drowning makes it harder and harder not to drown, an exponential curve of disaster. That is only if you fight the drowning. If you don't fight it, like Deku didn't plan to fight it, if you breathe in the water on purpose, it can be peaceful. Sometimes, Izuku would think of drowning and of death and of taking his last breath, and he would yearn. Midoriya, Aizawa greeted. Aizawa-sensei. Izuku greeted back. You know, if you and my mom are gonna be talking more often, you can just call me Izuku. So it doesn't get confusing or anything. Aizawa grinned, showed all his teeth. Sure thing, kid. So, you told her. Izuku went on. Aizawa's grin fell. Did she confront you? No. Izuku told him I could tell, though. Of course you could tell, Aizawa grumbled under his breath. Listen, Aizawa said. I know I told you that I wouldn't, and I don't want you to think you can't trust me. It was just a logical ruse. And if I hadn't told your mother and she found out later, it would have been a mess. I understand, Izuku said. A long sigh echoed down the phone line. I'm sure you do, kid. So my mom agreed though, right? Aizawa could hear Izuku manually injecting pep into his voice. Yes, Aizawa got down to business. He transferred his cell phone from one hand to the other. Your first break in school is in a few weeks. I want to work with you starting 2 days before this break. Oh, sure, Izuku replied. Aizawa heard some papers shuffling on the other side of the phone. That works for you. Yeah, I can always work on the beach later. Okay then, Aizawa replied. I'll text you the details. I already spoke to your mother, but my second lesson plan involves late night activities, so you might get home late. If mom is already okay with it, that's fine, Izuku said. Good, I'll see you then. See you then, Izuku told him. Then the line went quiet. Izuku knew. He just knew Aizawa had waited until the last second to text Izuku the address that they would be meeting at precisely because of the phone call he was about to make. Izuku's hands shook as he navigated through his contacts to find Aizawa's number. No longer at the top of his history because May had been texting him about when he could come and test some of her babies. He was currently hiding out in the boys' bathroom. Aizawa's cavalier text had been delivered to his phone during second period. Izuku had managed to check his phone under his desk and then promptly broke out into a coughing fit when he choked on his own spit in shock. Yue, Eraserhead, the underground pro hero that he had been communicating with for just under 4 months, somehow had access to UA training grounds. Izuku hesitated to claim that he was a staff member just yet because a UA staff member being interested in his potential to be a hero might make him faint, and he didn't need to faint at school again. Izuku checked to make sure that the lock on the bathroom stall was secure and that his feet were balanced on the toilet seat before he hit the call button. He briefly wondered if Aizawa would even be able to take his call at this time of day, but then the call connected. How do you have access to UA training grounds? Izuku whispered furiously into the receiver of his phone, one hand cupped in front of his mouth to ensure the sound didn't travel farther than it needed to. Izuku listened as a muffled but high-spirited laugh echoed over the receiver at the same time as a sigh. Hello, Izuku, Aizawa said. Hello, Aizawa-sensei. Izuku spat out. Are you actually a teacher? Do you teach at UA, or are you just, like, an alumni who has access to training grounds? Or Izuku cut himself off abruptly and waited for an answer. The laughing on the other side of the phone got more intense as Aizawa answered. I am a teacher. Izuku resisted the urge to swear that was suddenly overpowering. A teacher at UA wanted to train him. It was already groundbreaking that someone, let alone a hero, had taken interest in his so-called potential, but a hero who also worked at UA. That was unfathomable. Cool, he managed to reply with a strangled whisper. Oh my god. A breathless shout echoed over the line. Shota, you didn't tell him. Aizawa's voice was farther away as he responded to the other person who was apparently in the same room as him and who could hear their conversation. Shut up. Shota, why didn't you tell him? Literally just a text that said, oh, by the way, I teach at UA would have been less dramatic than just texting him the address for him to meet you at. I'm questioning if you actually hate dramatics right now because holy shit. I'm on the phone. Izuku heard Aizawa grit out. Oh sure, the muffled voice responded. When I offer to make sure no one interrupts your nap, you're all thank you babe, I love you so much, but when I point out your bad communication skills, it's all shut up Hisashi. I'm on the phone Hisashi. Izuku listened to something that sounded suspiciously like the zipper to a sleeping bag be zipped, and the voice became even more muffled as it went on. Is there a problem with that? Aizawa grumbled. And no, Izuku squeaked out, a bit surprised that he was finally being addressed again. It's fine. I'm just surprised, that's all. You shouldn't be surprised, Aizawa responded. You're an incredibly bright young boy. Any teacher worth their salt could see that. That's very nice, sir, but I'm more surprised that you, specifically, are a teacher. Izuku digested his word choice. Not that there's anything wrong with your demeanor that would suggest you would be bad as a teacher, he hurried to say. It's just that you're kind of more direct than teachers usually are. Silence. I'll meet you at the gates if you're nervous about walking up to UA. Aizawa mercifully changed the subject. Oh, no, that's okay, sir, you don't have to go out of your way for me, Izuku replied without thinking. Are you sure? Izuku hesitated to answer because the truth was that he was extremely nervous. Off the charts nervous. He was a quirkless nobody. Walking up to UA would make him feel entirely out of place even if he was explicitly invited there. Aizawa was offering. He wouldn't think less of him. Yes, I'm sure. I don't want to be a bother, he ended up saying. Aizawa hummed in response. I'll see you then. See you then. As soon as he hung up, the lunch bell rang, signaling that everyone should start making their way back to their seats. Izuku carefully dismounted from his perch, then slid his phone into his pocket. He only made it one step out of the stall before a hand settled on his shoulder. Thought that it was you whispering in their Midoriya. Jubiyu, a boy that sat behind Izuku in class, smirked down at him. He had brown hair that was parted in the middle to cover both of his eyes. Izuku's shoulders immediately became hunched and he looked at the ground. Juba wasn't a bad guy. He usually only messed with Izuku when he was part of a group and he wasn't the type to participate in the more vicious pranks. But he was currently in a group. Behind him were two boys from another class that Izuku didn't know the names of. He had seen them once before though, that time that someone had put a giant spider in his shoe cubby and a bunch of students had lurked around to see his reaction. Izuku kept his gaze on the grubby tile as he responded. Hi, who are you talking to in there? Juba questioned him, his hand tightening in a silent threat. When Izuku didn't respond, he continued, What? You got a girlfriend or something? He mocked. The two boys behind him let out amused huffs. She doesn't want you telling anyone that she's dating a quirkless loser. Izuku had learned that it was sometimes best to just look scared and not say anything in these types of situations. He willed a tremor to the surface. He peeked up through his hair to see Juba's reaction to his fearful trembling. Because he couldn't see Juba's eyes, he had to go off of his mouth alone. Izuku watched keenly as the grin on Juba's face got just a tad sharper. He would be able to get out of this without his head getting stuck in the toilet then. What was I thinking? Juba said, looking back at the boys behind him. Someone like him could never get a girl. He's practically shaking in his boots and I haven't even done anything. That's because he's a wimp. Backup guy number one spat out happily. The other two laughed, shooting each other grins, drunk off of the power that ganging up on someone inferior to you provided. Juba roughly shoved Izuku back into the stall to disconnect his hand from Izuku's shoulder. Izuku's back collided harshly with the edge of the toilet and had to fling out his arms to catch himself from collapsing completely. They walked out of the bathroom. Izuku took a second to catch his breath, grounding himself by placing one of his hands on the cold tile. Then he pushed himself up, washed his hands, and went about the rest of his day. As Izuku took the train to UA, he abruptly became aware of the probability that he might run into another pro hero. His fingers tightened on the handhold above his head. Half of him was extremely excited by this possibility. He might be able to get their autograph and maybe confirm some of his theories on quirks. The other half was aware of how out of place he would look. A middle schooler in a different uniform, making his way through campus and looking down at his phone to make sure he had the right area. And if they asked what he was doing there, did he tell the truth and embarrass Aizawa or did he lie? It was a social interaction nightmare scenario. It would probably be fine. Some of the teachers were still very active heroes. They wouldn't stick around after school. And even if they did, Izuku would just keep his head down and head to where Aizawa had told him to go. It hurt him a bit to imagine walking past a pro hero without expressing any gratitude for their work, but it would be for the best. All of his panicked musings were cut short when he realized that he had at some point gotten off the train and walked to UA. There was a darkly clad figure standing at the front. Aizawa was waiting for him at the gate, despite Izuku saying he didn't have to. A flash of warm gratitude filled Izuku. He walked faster so that he wouldn't keep Aizawa waiting. Thank you for meeting me out here, Izuku said when he got within hearing range. It's no problem, kid, Aizawa told him. He pushed off from the part of the gate that he had been leaning against, his eyes sweeping up and down Izuku's form. Glad to see you don't have any more burns. Izuku pulled on the high collar that made up his school uniform. He had packed workout clothes, but unlike tomorrow, where he would have time to go home and then meet with Aizawa, today he had to rush from school to meet him on time. He was glad Aizawa's quirk was erasure and not something that let him know about Izuku's well-being. He got the impression that he wouldn't be happy about the blooming bruise on his back or the other fading bruises. I don't usually have burns, Izuku explained. Kyle, one of my classmates, was just kinda mad at me that day. Kind of mad, Aizawa repeated. He gestured to Izuku to follow after him and walked through the gate. Izuku took 1 second to take in the giant structure that made up the UA buildings and then jogged to catch up. Aizawa looked at him out of the corner of his eye to make sure he was keeping up. Today we're just going to do an assessment. I need to see where you're at physically so that I know what to help you with. Okay, Izuku said, his hands habitually coming in front of him so that he could pick at his nails. It's nothing super challenging, Aizawa told him. You'll be fine, kid. Aizawa took him away from the main building toward what Izuku assumed were the PE grounds. Izuku changed into his athletic clothes in a giant locker room that made him feel very insignificant, and then Aizawa had him do some tests, all of which Izuku had done before but none of which he had ever tried as hard on as he currently was. Izuku wasn't ashamed to admit to himself that he desperately wanted to impress Aizawa. Aizawa had told him that he was already impressed with Izuku's analysis and his ability to read people. Izuku didn't think that stuff was impressive. It was something he had done since he was small, since he was little and looking for a way to prove that he could be a hero. It wasn't anything special. It was a bad habit that made him look at people for too long and mumble under his breath. So, he ran as fast as he could during the 50-meter dash and meticulously paced himself on the distance run. He went beyond what he had ever been able to accomplish in the push-up and sit-up tests. By the end of the whole ordeal, he was panting heavily, braced against a wall so that he didn't sprawl out on the ground. Aizawa was flipping through some papers that he had been sporadically writing on throughout the assessment. Izuku tried to keep his curious looks to a minimum while Aizawa made more notes to himself. You did well in some places and average in others. The only place you're significantly lacking in is flexibility. Aizawa's tone was impersonal as he continued. You're built for speed. You're small and did above average in the running exercises we did. Have you been running? Izuku caught his breath for a second. Yeah, I have to carry stuff back and forth while I clean the beach, but I want to be fast, so I've been running. That's good, Aizawa said shortly. Tomorrow we're going to try some stealth exercises, see what you're inclined toward and what we should be working hardest on. Aizawa dug through his papers, have some paper tests for you to do. He held out the packets while he continued. You can give them to me when we meet up here tomorrow evening. From there, if you agree with the plan I have lined out, we'll work together over the break and I'll give you a training plan to work on when we can't meet. Izuku gaped at him from where he had started to slump against the wall. He was doing a lazy approximation of a wall sit. Aizawa raised his eyebrows at him and then shook the papers he was still holding out. You're really serious about this, aren't you? Izuku said, heaving himself up and taking the papers, leafing through them. It looked like a lot of short answer questions. Aizawa huffed. So are you, kid? He turned his clipboard around to show Izuku his results on the tests. These aren't the results of somebody half-assing it. Izuku brought the packet of papers closer to his eyes to hide his face as he felt heat crawl up his neck. Thank you, sensei. You can go ahead and get changed. I'll walk you to the train station, Aizawa told him, somehow putting the clipboard away in his scarf. Izuku watched over the top of the tests as Aizawa left the gym building. Aizawa did walk him to the train station. Izuku was quiet and twitchy. Aizawa ignored this and went over more specifics of his plan. Izuku was surprised at the amount of detail that Aizawa had already planned. He had mostly thought that Aizawa was just humoring him, but it was dedication. Izuku was sure that half of the reason for these extensive plans was as reassurance for him. Aizawa was saying, without the words, look at how much effort I'm putting into this. This isn't a practical joke. I really do believe in you. Izuku got home, showered, and got into bed. He stared at the ceiling and he thought about how this was, maybe, the first person to ever put so much stock into him. Aizawa was betting on Izuku. The heat at the back of his throat flared and he let the feeling consume him. The hope and sadness and sorrow and shock all mixing together and settling over him like a weighted blanket. Izuku had cried a lot more from sadness in the past months than he had in years. He had developed a relationship with tears that Izuku knew would be considered unusual. Crying was something that he'd done frequently as a kid. But around 4th grade, when teases about his uselessness and leaky eyes started mixing together, Izuku had told himself, this is something you can control. And so he stopped crying when people got mean. He stopped crying when his friends pushed him into rivers. He stopped crying when his teachers didn't let him participate in class. When he cried that day, on the roof of a different apartment than the one he jumped off from, it felt like a betrayal to his younger self. A betrayal to a younger him that had fought to find some way to be in control of the cruelty he was facing. Now that seemed silly. A stupid pact that just suppressed his emotions and made it so that when he did cry from sadness, it was a silent and harrowing experience. Izuku always felt like he was going to cry now. He always felt a little bit like he was going to cry, but laying in bed under his blanket and the blanket of feelings pressing down on him, he didn't want to cry, not like how he usually did when things got to be a bit too much. No, he didn't want to cry, but he was. Izuku was hiccuping and there were warm streaks running down the sides of his face. He had to struggle to get his hands out from under the covers to wipe at his tears. He wasn't sad he shouldn't be crying again. He was happy. He had taken a magnifying glass to his feelings about Aizawa training him and his mother finding out about his attempt and to everything that had been going on, and he decided that this was the best he had felt in a good long while. Not completely happy. Not really. He still had water lapping at the forefront of his mind. But he was keeping busy and he wasn't useless right now. So, why? Hatsume, assistant. Hatsume, when are you going to be free? Greater than? Hatsume, I want to run some tests on my newest baby and my newest assistant should be the test taker. Midoriya Izuku, I'm sorry. I'm just busy over the break. Maybe once it's over I can help. Hatsume, I'm holding you to that. Hatsume, anyway. I also wanted to consult with you on this color palette that I have for the prototype Hover Souls. Ever since that thing you said about white being one of the least practical colors for footwear, I've been thinking about trying to brand my own color palette. Like how some schools have colors. It would be the Hatsume palette and I would color all of my babies like that. And obviously it can be recolored to go with hero suits, right? But it would really elevate the Hatsume brand, don't you think? Izuku blinked down at his phone, trying to process the fact that that text had only taken Hatsume about 30 seconds to type. Before he could coordinate his fingers enough to move them under the desk, another text rolled in. Hatsume, and I know you have a few more design inputs outside of color. You have totally proven that with your sketches, but as an inventor I must admit that I need to refer to your expertise regarding most things advertising. I usually just shout at people about the functions and applications of my babies, and for some reason that scares people. Izuku, at this point, had completely tuned out his teacher's speech about the way gravity affected the tides. He had already studied ahead on this unit. He moved his thumb slowly over the keyboard to form his response. He was about a fourth through his response when a pen was tapped against his desk. Izuku whipped his head up and away from his phone. The hand that wasn't under his desk twitched against the desktop. His science teacher glared down at him. Midoriya, I don't think that texting will help you learn about the moon's gravitational pull. His classmates giggled. Sorry, sensei. Izuku started to explain, but his teacher cut him off. Give me your phone, Midoriya. You can have it back after class. Izuku fumbled to give his phone over quickly. As his teacher walked away, Izuku picked his pen back up to take notes, or more accurately trace over notes that he had already taken from the textbook. Taking a brief look around the room, Izuku smothered the spark of anger that burned just under his ribcage. At least 3 other people were on their phone. They weren't even trying to hide it. The teacher seemed to realize their own hypocrisy and reluctantly went around to collect a few more phones. The class giggled again as Izuku's phone vibrated on their teacher's desk amid the other silent devices. Izuku could only imagine Hatsume's playful rage at Izuku typing for a bit only for the message to never come. Izuku's phone continued to vibrate every few seconds. Izuku watched through his fringe as the teacher got more and more irritated, and his classmates got more and more excited for the blowout. Kaken was gritting his teeth, likely irritated by the distraction. Izuku braced himself. Midoriya, his teacher bellowed, turning away from the chalkboard and glaring at him. Can you come and tell your friend to stop texting you and disrupting my class? Izuku scrambled out of his seat and rushed to his phone. He typed out a quick text and hit send, then went to set his phone back down on the desk. Midoriya, Izuku. I'm really sorry, but can you stop texting me for a bit? I'm gonna get in trouble in class. Before Izuku could even turn the screen away from himself to set it back on the desk, before his finger could even twitch over the power button, more texts from Hatsume rolled in. Hatsume, Izuku-chan, please, I can't keep staring at color swatches. Hatsume, I feel like I'm going craz. Why? Hatsume, oh, sorry. I'll hit you up later then. Have fun in class. Izuku reels from Hatsume's complete tonal shift but then skitters back to his seat. As he tries to get back into an acceptable mindset, he lets his eyes wander over his classmates habitually. He and Kaken make eye contact. Any hope Izuku had of walking out of school without some kind of confrontation abruptly dies. Of course, Izuku ranted in his head, pressing his pen down harder on his notes. Everything was going fine. He was flying under Kaken's radar for the first time in years and maybe actually finally being valuable to someone, and he just had to go and fuck it up. He never should have drawn attention to himself like that. He should have taken extra precautions, turned his phone all the way silent, or maybe just not texted in class in the first place. Hatsume and him had been talking more and more these past weeks. At first it was purely shop talk. Hatsume drilled him on the far reaches of his knowledge on hero support gear. That evolved into more talks like the one they had at the ice cream shop. Little back and forth arguments about hero gear or branding decisions. And that became Hatsume sending him pictures of hero merch and demanding he rate it out of 10 and mixing in her own inventions and sketched out marketing. Now, Hatsume seemed to text him about anything and everything. And Izuku, he really liked it. He had never been able to relate to the way his classmates grinned down at their phones before, but every time he got a text from Hatsume, he would feel a thrill go through him. She was just so nice. Nice in a way that Izuku had never experienced before. Hatsume was almost nice by accident. Nothing she said or did was her trying to be nice to him. Not like how the guidance counselors always tried to be nice. They offered him candies from pretty glass dishes on their desks while simultaneously stabbing him through the heart with the shards of his shattered dreams. Not like how little girls and boys in his elementary school would be nice. They raised their hands in supplication, begging for his understanding when they decided that they didn't want to play with him. Hatsume, 1, didn't know that he was quickless, and 2, didn't seem to care at all that he didn't know how to be normal friends with her, because she didn't either. Social norms had been thrown out the window the second he met Hatsume, and they hadn't managed to crawl back in. Hatsume texted him at odd hours about odd things with odd syntax, and Izuku loved it. Every time he saw that it was Hatsume who had blown up his phone with messages and not his fretting mother or Aunt Mitsuko bugging him to come over for dinner, he was filled with joy. Hatsume texted him just to talk to him because she enjoyed what he had to say. It was something Izuku had never experienced before. The easy familiarity between them. No pressure, no complications. So, he got kind of carried away. He wanted to be a good friend to Hatsume. He didn't want her to get bored of him or decide he wasn't as useful as an assistant as she had originally thought. If he didn't answer all her texts, she would realize that he wasn't this cool expert on heroics that she thought he was. She would realize he was just an unreliable nerd who couldn't help her with anything, let alone be her assistant. Hatsume was brilliant. She had prototypes and blueprints and ideas for thousands of inventions. Inventions that were all elegant, beautiful, streamlined. They were masterpieces of technology created by a middle school-aged girl who was homeschooled for most of her life. She was absurd and amazing, and she had no reason to like him at all. He didn't deserve her brightness or her effortless kindness. He didn't deserve any of it, but he was going to hang on to it for as long as he possibly could. It had been the same with Kaken back when they were little. Not exactly the same, obviously, but he had grasped at Kaken's friendship with the same kind of desperation that made sure he replied to all of Hatsume's questions, even if they were buried deep in a rambling paragraph about her latest idea for a baby. With Kaken it was a lot harder. It was running to keep up with him in the woods. It was pretending not to know him at school but then helping him test his quirk out at Auntie's house. It was brushing off the roughhousing that got a bit too rough. It was a lot of things that in retrospect were not hallmarks of a healthy friendship between first graders. At some point, Kaken got tired of him though. And that's when it stopped being teasing and play fighting and became something much crueler. That's when Kaken started turning whole classes against him and eventually whole schools. Well, Izuku knew that that wasn't entirely Kaken's fault. An entire school isn't one person's fault. It's just what happens when someone doesn't fit. All humans have a natural instinct to fit in. Izuku knew this firstly because he was a human and he desperately wanted to fit in, even if his role ended up being the scapegoat. He knew this secondly because it was the foundation of herd mentality, or mob mentality. Izuku, at 7 years old, had carefully Googled "why doesn't anyone help me?" His small fingers pushed down the keys one at a time until he could hit enter. He clicked on a few articles, the results of the search slightly botched because of his inability to spell at that age, until he found one about mob mentality. Under a mob mentality, people can watch another person get bullied and feel inclined to join and to feel validated. Or people can watch. That was the bystander effect. And even reading about it in a bad light, through an article about anti-bullying measures schools could take, Izuku thought that it was perfectly understandable. Bystanders don't want to stand up for someone that has already been outcast, because there's a big chance that they will also be outcast as a result. Izuku had even fallen victim to the bystander effect once. Kaken was pushing around a boy in the grade below them in the sandbox, and Izuku had hesitated for a whole minute before he stepped in front of the boy. There was just something about a predator, someone you knew could hurt you, that made it harder to take that leap to help others. He had to think very sternly to himself about what All Might would think if he didn't stand up for the boy in order to pluck up the courage to become the one under Kaken's glare again. This all meaning that after the final bell rang and Kaken strolled over to his desk and loomed over him, their classmates filed out around them and passed around interested looks. Their science teacher even shot them a curious glance before they left the classroom, leaving Kaken and him alone. "What the fuck is going on with you, Deku?" Kaken questioned, leaning down to get in Izuku's face while keeping his hands in his pocket. "Who the fuck likes you enough to disrupt class by texting you?" Kaken slammed one of his hands down on Izuku's desk. It was really fucking aggravating. Izuku bowed his head. "And nothing is going on with me, Kaken." "Like hell," Kaken shouted. The hand on his desk crawled forward to grip the inner edge of Izuku's desk. Kaken's knuckles brushed against Izuku's rib cage, and Izuku flinched back so that his back was flush with his desk chair. "Don't think I haven't noticed you sneaking around." Kaken sneered at him. "You're not going home after school, you're sneaking off somewhere during the weekends. I heard Auntie and Co on the phone with the old hag about how you've been around less, but I haven't spotted you at any fights recently." Kaken bared his teeth, leaned even closer by bracing himself against the hand wrapped around Izuku's desk. His scarlet eyes raked over Izuku's form. "And you've been bulking up somehow." Kaken let out a bark of sarcastic laughter. "Don't fucking tell me that you're still trying for the hero course." Izuku could tell that Kaken wanted to continue, but he took his chance to speak in the gap of silence. "I'm not." Kaken slowly leaned away from him. Izuku watched the muscles in his forearm contract as he used it to push himself up. His expression stayed the same, but Izuku had known Kaken for a long time. He could see the confusion come into his eyes. "What the fuck are you talking about?" Kaken said. "I'm not trying for the hero course." Izuku was almost whispering with how quietly he replied. "I'm not even applying to UA." "You're not," he growled out. Now Kaken's confusion showed, his eyebrows coming down harshly on top of his eyes and his mouth screwing up from the loose grin he had had it in, into a pucker of thought. "No," Izuku confirmed. He studied Kaken's expression, then carefully reached down to grab the handle of his backpack. He gripped the yellow strap tightly, then started to slide out of his seat, keeping his eyes on Kaken's face. When he was standing across from Kaken, the desk between them, Kaken spoke again. "So what?" he scoffed, stuffing his hand back into his pocket. "You applying to one of the lame-ass schools? Shiketsu, Ketsubutsu, Isamu, Sei, Seijin?" "No," Izuku answered carefully, pulling his backpack on. Kaken met his eyes again for the first time since earlier in class. "Finally giving the fuck up, huh? Realized that you would just get in the pro's way." Izuku could tell that Kaken was baiting him, and for once in his life he didn't feel the need to take a swipe at the carrot on a stick. Yeah, Izuku replied casually. He tried to keep his posture relaxed. Kaken's eyes burned into his, and because of this Izuku saw the exact moment that rage poured into them. Kaken's hands were out of his pockets in seconds, curled into his signature claw, cradling a series of small explosions that filled the classroom with the sickly sweet smell of burning sugar. Izuku instinctively made a break for it, sprinting down the aisles of desks toward the door. He heard Kaken's feet slam into the ground in pursuit. He heard more explosions, probably being used to propel Kaken so that he could head off Izuku at the door and cage him in. Izuku pushed himself harder, reaching out for the handle to the door. His fingertips just brushed it, sweet relief digging its claws into his heart, when Kaken's burning hand clamped down on his bicep. The explosion immediately burned through his school uniform and left a scalding mark on Izuku's arm. Kaken wrenched him back, pulling hard enough that Izuku fell with the momentum. He collided with the ground painfully, his backpack being the only buffer between him and the floor. Something inside of it dug into the day-old bruise on his back and he groaned. Kaken stood above him glaring. When he spoke it was quiet but with force. What the fuck do you mean yeah? When we were kids all you talked about was how you would never fucking give up, never stop trying, how you would catch up with me, and now you're just forfeiting the fucking race. Why the hell are you bulking up if not to beat me, huh? Don't be a dirty fucking liar and maybe I won't have to keep putting you in your place. Then he spat at Izuku, a sneer taking complete control of his face. And then he stormed out, his stomps echoing down the hallway. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Despite knowing Kaken for years, he was the one person that Izuku couldn't understand. Why get so furiously angry over something 1 minute, just to decide Izuku wasn't worth his time the next minute? Why get angry at all when Izuku was following his advice, don't apply to you or else right? It just didn't make sense to him. And he had accepted that it never would. Kaken would always be ahead of him. Izuku brought up a hand to wipe the spit off of his face, cringing when he accidentally pulled on the new burn on his arm with the movement. He had gotten off easy. Hopefully, the lesson that Aizawa had planned didn't involve anything too physical. Izuku wasn't afraid that he wouldn't be able to mask his pain if he had to move his arm too much. He was afraid of how suspicious it would look if he wore a jacket the whole time they were together. Izuku pushed himself off of the floor, cast a glance at his arm. It looked like it would be okay until he could bandage it at home. He still had some burn cream stashed away in his closet, bought from a drugstore with his allowance one day when a burn that ended up scaring had looked just a tad too bloody to be left alone. Izuku dragged himself out of the classroom and the school building and down the streets that lead home. He got through his front door, toed off his shoes, carefully removed his uniform and put on some sweatpants and bandaged his arm. Then he set an alarm on his phone, put on a long-sleeved athletic shirt, and crashed into bed, exhausted. He was late. Izuku slipped his running shoes on, one finger getting caught inside of the heel as he stood up. Pulling it free, he grabbed a water bottle from the fridge and then snatched up his backpack. His mom had left an hour earlier for her work dinner. Izuku remembered hearing the door close and looking at his phone, thinking that he should get up, that his alarm had gone off 30 minutes ago already, and then he remembered not doing that. He should stop taking naps. Izuku fumbled with his keys as he locked the door. It was his second day meeting Aizawa in person and he didn't want to start off with a bad impression, lest his teacher decide that Izuku wasn't worth his time after all. Not that that would be incredibly problematic, Izuku thought to himself as he started at a light jog out of his building. Yesterday's assessment had gone well, but as much as Aizawa's words had ignited a long dead fire in his chest, there was still a strong wind in the shape of the rest of the world trying to blow it out. The likelihood of Izuku even living to 20 was low. The likelihood of him becoming the first quirkless hero at 20 was even lower. Izuku could appreciate the effort that Aizawa was putting into him, but at the same time he knew that this was only temporary. As he was rounding the corner of his building, Izuku spotted a group of kids across the street that were probably only a year or two younger than him. He pushed himself just a bit harder, letting his feet hit the pavement with enough force to ground him. He just needed to get around the corner and then it was just a bit farther to the train station. It was kinda warm out to be wearing sweats and a long-sleeved shirt, but he would be fine. They were only 2 years younger than him, Izuku realized, because they were wearing his middle school uniform. They were laughing with each other, showing each other things on their phones, and one of them was walking backwards. There were 5 of them. It was already nearing 6. Shouldn't they be home already? Izuku ran faster. With luck, he would be out of sight before they even looked up from their phones. Midoriya Izuku did not have good luck. He had just passed the group, relief billowing behind Izuku like a cape, when a shout rang out behind him. He pumped his arms harder, his backpack hitting him with each step as it swung up and down with his momentum. He winced. The bruise there was still a bit tender. There was a sound of scuffling before someone called out, Deku, and Izuku didn't look back, but he still felt a sharp pain in his cheek that stopped him in his tracks. As he slowed down, beginning to stumble with his abrupt halt, more pinpricks of pain made themselves aware on his legs and back. Rocks bounced joyfully against the sidewalk, the sound of them rebounding off of the concrete, echoing in Izuku's ears. "Deku!" came the shout again. Izuku, still facing away from them, brought his hand up to his stinging cheek and fingered it. His face was wet. "Where are you going, Deku?" one of the kids shouted. "And in such a hurry," another mocked. Their voices got closer with each moment. Izuku turned around, his shoulders hunched. He had one hand on his backpack strap, mindlessly gripping it in case they tried to take his bag. The tension in his arm pulled at the recent burn. His other hand settled firmly over the wetness on his cheek and then adjusted when he realized that the cut started at his temple. There were 5 boys. They were 2 years younger than him. They went to his middle school. He had never talked to any of them before in his life. The one in the front, the leader of the group, was clutching a handful of gravel. He was almost an entire head taller than Izuku and had pale brown hair, almost blonde, and delicately pointed ears. The other boys behind the leader were blurry, panic clawing at Izuku's senses until all he could focus on was the biggest threat. He already had to deal with Kaken today, and now this. The boy grinned. He sedately picked out a piece of rock from his hand, then wheeled his arm back and threw it. Because the rock was smaller than the ones that were originally thrown at him, Izuku barely registered anything as it bounced off of his collarbone. "What does someone useless have to do that you're in such a hurry over?" the boy asked, his fingers sorting through the gravel again. If Izuku tried to focus, he could see that they were surrounding him. A boy with a square jaw was coming on his left, and another with a shaved head was standing with his arms crossed to Izuku's right. Izuku tried to focus. He had somewhere to be. He didn't have time to indulge these people in whatever sick fantasy they wanted to play out. He cleared his throat, but it didn't work and his words came out shaky and uncertain. "I'm going to meet someone. And I'm already late." So the boy picked out another stone from his hand and threw it. This time it hit Izuku's head, getting lost in his hair. "Yeah, right," barked the boy to Izuku's right. "What are you really doing?" he leered. It struck Izuku that something was off about this. The panic that had started bubbling in him since he spotted the kids lowered from a roaring boil to a simmer. "Do you even know why you're bullying me right now?" Izuku found himself saying. The hand holding his cheek from where the pebble had hit him tightened, the nails digging into his skin just slightly. "Do you know my name or why people call me the name that you're calling me?" They were only 2 years younger than him, but as he looked up at the boy and his friends, all Izuku could think was that they looked incredibly young. "Yeah," the one with pointed ears scoffed, pouring out his handful of pebbles except for one that he threw up into the air and then caught. "It's because you're useless and a freak. That's what everyone says about you." That Deku, the boy leaned forward, getting into Izuku's face and sneering, "isn't going to amount to anything. And that you keep journals of everyone in school that you hate so that you can kill them all when you realize you don't have anything else to live for." Izuku almost wanted to laugh. The rumors had gotten even more creative while he hadn't been paying attention. Since when did he have a killing diary? "Right," Izuku told the group plaintively. "Right, and why am I useless?" Izuku was sure that they had no idea. They had only been at school for 2 terms, and he had significantly cut down on noticeability since exams. The number of public confrontations that he was forced to endure had been oddly, yet wonderfully, absent over the last few months. It was entirely plausible that this group of first years was still in the dark regarding Izuku's fatal flaw. Izuku watched as the kid's pointed ears flushed bright red. "Well, I dunno, but it must be true if everyone says it." One of the other kids piped up. He had sharp teeth and gills on the side of his neck. "Yeah, even Ig-senpai says that stuff and she's the nicest girl I know." "Oh," Izuku said out of surprise. "Ig Naoki." The name felt odd on his tongue after so long. The boys nodded at Izuku's question. "She is nice. I didn't know she went to school here. We were together in elementary school for a while. She used to tag me out when I couldn't catch anybody during recess." The kids all glanced at each other, confusion riddling their features. The boy with pointed ears threw the pebble up into the air again, but he didn't manage to catch it. "I'm quirkless," Izuku told them, lowering his hand from his cheek and rubbing the blood between his fingers. It was sticky and hot, and the panic and the calm and every feeling that had begun the conversation abruptly drained out of Izuku, leaving an empty cavern in its wake. "That's why everyone calls me useless, because I am." The group of boys were glancing around at each other nervously now. The one with the shaved head was rubbing the back of his neck, and the ringleader was playing with his fingers now that he didn't have anything to toy with. The first year of middle school was an awkward time even if you weren't unanimously hated by all of your peers. "Have a nice day." Izuku bowed shallowly and then turned around and started back up on his jog to the train station. It hadn't taken that long, all things considered. He should still be able to catch the train if he hurried. As Aizawa watched Izuku approach, the only 2 words going through his head were "oh no." The kid looked exhausted. Even from a few meters away, Aizawa could see the bags under his eyes. His shoulders were slumped and he was jogging sloppily, nothing like the precise movements Aizawa had noted during the assessment yesterday. He squinted. Was that blood on his face? What? Aizawa shifted from where he was leaning against the UA entrance, now leaning forward in concern. The kid definitely had some kind of cut on his face. Aizawa grit his teeth. If he had set the meeting only an hour earlier, Recovery Girl would still be on campus, and maybe the kid wouldn't have had whatever encounter that led to him receiving a cut on his face. When Izuku got close enough for Aizawa to see properly, he realized it wasn't a cut, more like a gash. Aizawa's hand reached out to turn Izuku's cheek towards him without him giving it permission to do so. Kid, what the hell happened to you? With the gash fully turned towards him, Aizawa could see through the blood that it wasn't as big as he had initially thought. A jagged cut stretched from Izuku's temple to partway down his cheek. If Aizawa really squinted, he could make out some dirt mixed in with the still flowing blood. His pupil immediately began spouting an excuse. Oh, it's nothing really. Izuku strained against Aizawa's firm hold on his face, trying to remove the wound from view. I just fell down on my way. I was rushing B because I was late and I just tripped and Izuku trailed off as his eyes met Aizawa's for the first time since he had arrived. Aizawa had to try very hard to not roll his eyes. Izuku seemed to settle in the face of Aizawa's silence. The fight drained out of him and he relaxed, letting Aizawa keep his face tilted up. On my way here some kids threw rocks at me. I guess one of them was sharp and caught me the wrong way. Izuku shrugged. Aizawa sighed. He removed his hand from Izuku's face, only to settle it on his shoulder. Before we do anything, I'm bandaging that. It doesn't look too big, but it looks deep. If we get something on it now, it might not scar. Aizawa pushed gently on Izuku's shoulder to guide him through the gate and into the main building. Izuku, in protest, dug his heels into the ground. Aizawa, again, had to fight to keep the humor out of his expression as he easily strong-armed Izuku into moving or else falling on his face. Sir, that's really not necessary. I just need a napkin or something to wipe off the blood and I'll be fine. I don't want to mess up our schedule, the kid argued. Aizawa ignored him. He dragged the kid through the building towards the nurse's office. Every now and then Izuku would insist that he was all right and didn't need Aizawa to do anything. But by the time they reached the nurse's office, he seemed resigned to his fate. Wash your hands and then sit down there, Aizawa told him, pointing toward one of the cots. Aizawa pulled open one of the cabinets. He had to push a jar of tongue depressors and a container of quirk suppressant tablets out of the way to reach what he needed. He grabbed a rectangular-shaped bandage from Chiyo's neatly arranged supply and then picked out a few cotton balls with the same hand. Aizawa watched Izuku out of the corner of his eyes while he grabbed the bottle of hydrogen peroxide. The kid was making a clear effort to stay still, to look relaxed, but his leg was jumping up and down and his fingers were running circles around each other in his lap. There was still a bit of water clinging to his hands. The kid had clearly rushed through washing the blood off of his fingers so that he was seated by the time Aizawa turned around. Aizawa slotted the bottle under his arm and dragged a stool from the corner to sit across from Izuku. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the tile made the kid flinch. Tilt your face towards me, Aizawa said, making an effort to keep his voice down. Izuku was obviously on edge about something. Aizawa sat down heavily on the stool, setting aside the bandage and dousing one of the cotton balls in peroxide. No, that's fine. I can do it, Izuku hurried to say. His hands untangled themselves and he reached out for the cotton ball and the bottle. Aizawa just gave him a dry look, moving the objects just out of Izuku's reach. Izuku's eyes met his and then the kid deflated. He turned his face to the side without protest, looking down at the ground. Aizawa made quick work of the gash, threw the bloodied cotton balls in the trash, and then delicately put the band-aid over it. Aizawa got comfortable on the stool, his shoulders and spine curving as he settled into wait. The kid started to hop up, but Aizawa just raised his eyebrows at him and Izuku slowly settled back down. There were a few minutes of silence. Aizawa watched as Izuku internally debated over whether or not to tell the truth. The clock above the door ticked away. Aizawa closed his eyes. He reworked his lesson plan. I don't think they really meant to hurt me, Izuku mumbled. Aizawa slid his eyes back open to see the way that Izuku was staring at his hands, anxiously playing with his fingertips. They didn't even know I was quirkless. The kid sighed. They just knew that no one likes me, so why not throw rocks at me? Well, they weren't even really rocks, just gravel. The one that hit me in the face must have been weirdly sharp. Aizawa tilted his head back and stared up at the ceiling. And you are aware that even if people at school don't like you, that does not give them the right to throw rocks at you on the street, right? Of course, Izuku answered automatically. Of course, he repeated under his breath, but not like Izuku's way of saying it. Matter of fact and indifferent and numb, so numb. Aizawa said it with a hatred that he didn't even know he was capable of. The words had to fight their way past his vocal cords, which were pulled taut with anger, and past his teeth, which were clenched in horror at the injustice of it all. In Aizawa's formal opinion, Izuku was an extremely gifted child. He was kind, he was smart, and he was polite. Under normal circumstances, Aizawa would never have noticed anything wrong with the kid, and that made him incredibly angry. Under normal circumstances, he might have said the same thing that All Might said, that Izuku should look for a different career path with his intelligence. That such a well-adjusted, quirkless kid shouldn't risk his life trying to do something that other people can do better. But because they had not met under normal circumstances, Aizawa knew that that would be a mistake. Helping people, saving people, sparing people, making people happy, these were the things that motivated Midoriya Izuku to do anything and everything. Aizawa was certain that with such pure motivation, allowing Izuku to be anything less than a hero would be a complete waste of his unique brand of talent. It was hard to see on the surface. Izuku was a very good actor. The kid made it very easy for someone to see what they wanted to see in his actions, in his words, in his existence. Right now, Izuku was relaxed and nervous at the same time. Aizawa could choose either state to be the real one, and he would be wrong because Izuku was purposefully presenting both of these options for him to pick from. The jump in his leg was choreographed. He made sure to move it every 5 seconds on the dot. The way he played with his fingers was absent-minded, sure, but it was also habitual in the way he repeated a pattern of which fingertip he pulled on or twisted on. His posture was measured to be just the right amount of relaxed while still looking proper. His face didn't betray anything beyond what he wanted it to. His words were chosen specifically to please. These were tactics that underground heroes used during undercover work, presenting different personality options to someone to choose from, and then, based on what they gravitated toward, adjust your personality to get as close to the target as possible. A middle schooler should not be using tactics like this. Izuku should not be treating everyone like a hostile entity. The worst thing was that if Aizawa hadn't talked to Izuku over the phone every single day for 3.5 months, he wouldn't know the truth of Izuku at all. If he hadn't stopped Izuku from jumping, he never would have met the boy, never would have come to care for him, never would have met his mother, never would have seen that Izuku was a sad, depressed, lonely, and lost child, one that was searching desperately for release that he was willing to kill himself over, release from undeserved torment. Aizawa didn't know if Izuku knew that the torment was undeserved. Izuku seemed to have a lot of uncanny insight into his own situation. However, in cases like this, it was common for the abused individual to cope by rationalizing others' actions, saying that they deserved it, that everything happening to them was their fault, that if only they had been better, then their tormentors would be happy. It was hard for Aizawa to tell where Izuku was at mentally. He had to rely on external signals that, in reality, could mean a variety of things. Take the cookies, for example. It could be a legitimate signal that Izuku wanted Aizawa to like him, or it could just be a tool to make sure his mother's image of him as an anxious child stayed intact, or deciding to train with Aizawa. It could be Izuku moving toward recovery, rekindling his dreams and interests, or it could just be a way to appease Aizawa so that the hero let his guard down. The hardest part of trying to help this kid was that Izuku was so wrapped up in trying to please everyone else that it made it impossible for Aizawa to be certain that he was doing the right thing. Izuku wasn't a professional, though. He wasn't a grown adult with formal training and years of experience hiding his emotions. He was just a middle schooler, barely a teenager, and teenagers were fallible. So when Izuku cast another glance at Aizawa in the silence and then sighed, Aizawa knew that he had been right to keep the kid from brushing this off. I also have another burn. Izuku saw the scrutiny in Aizawa's eyes. I only got it today. I wasn't hiding it yesterday. It's on my arm. I already wrapped it though, so it's fine. Aizawa didn't push. Okay then, let's get started on the lesson. Did you fill out that assessment? It's okay if you didn't. I did. Izuku physically jumped, at the chance to do something right. I did. Izuku whipped his backpack off of his shoulders and dug through a folder, pulling out the packet that Aizawa had given him the day before in pristine condition. It wasn't that hard. I mean, it didn't seem that hard, but I don't know how well I did or. Thanks, kid, Aizawa said, taking it from him and flipping through it briefly to make sure Izuku had answered all the questions. Great, then we're done for today. I thought you said, Izuku said, turning around from his backpack to look at Aizawa. Aizawa stretched his arms above his head, his spine popping in several places as he straightened up out of his seated position. I said that before you came to me injured. Sir, please, I didn't mean to throw off your schedule. I'm completely fine. I can still. This isn't a punishment, Aizawa amended. This is a rule. I'm not going to let you train if you're injured. This isn't going to be an excuse for you to torture yourself over your preconceived wickedness. Training is only going to happen if you are making an effort to take care of yourself. That means you tell me when you're injured and that you try. And it's not your fault if you can't get away, but you try to avoid any more serious physical wounds. Training you isn't something I'm going to do halfway. You need to be in the best shape you can be so that I can push you as far as you can go. He watched as Izuku swallowed. Yes, Aizawa-sensei. Good. Aizawa ruffled Izuku's hair. I'll walk you to the train station. We'll meet earlier in the morning tomorrow than planned. Since we didn't end up doing the exercise today, we'll have to squeeze it in then. Izuku put his backpack on while he answered, "Yes, sir." Again, it was hard for Aizawa to read him, but Izuku seemed relieved. Later that night when he told Hisashi about the whole ordeal, his husband agreed. "For sure. He probably thought that you would go easy on him because of his injury and he doesn't want to waste your time." Hisashi spoke around a mouthful of noodles. Aizawa pointed his chopsticks at him. "Don't talk with your mouth full, you heathen." Hisashi fake pouted at him from across the dinner table, but he finished chewing before he spoke again. "Have you looked at that memo that Nedzu sent out yet?" Aizawa felt dread creep down his spine instantly at Hisashi's tone. His husband was almost never neutral about something. The casual way that he mentioned this memo meant that he had very strong opinions about the content that he only felt he could reveal if Aizawa had indeed read the memo. "No," Aizawa said. Hisashi looked to the side while he responded. "You probably should then, it's a bit of a doozy." Aizawa whipped his phone out of his pocket and signed into his school email. To eraserhead@ua.com, presentmic@ua.com, midnight@ua.com, 13@ua.com, recoveragirl@ua.com, ectoplasm@ua.com, powerloader@ua.com, cementus@ua.com, lunkrush@ua.com, hounddog@ua.com, snipe@ua.com, vladking@ua.com, etc. From Nedzu. Subject: New staff members and changes for next year. Attachments: remodeling 2xxx.pdf, menu changes.pdf, recommendation spots.pdf, betting pool, Excel, meeting schedule.pdf, etc. Hello all. I know it is rather early to be sending an email about staff changes that will be happening next year when we have only just entered our first break. But I felt that this was exciting news. All Might inquired about a teaching position here 5 months ago, and today he signed the contract that will officially put him on the staff next year. There is much to discuss regarding All Might's employment because of his busy schedule and some health concerns that he brought up. As such, there will be a mandatory staff meeting 2 months from now in which All Might will be present. This meeting is mandatory for all staff members, but especially those who teach hero class courses, as this is the department that All Might will be transferring into. Since I am already sending this email, I would also like to announce the other additions to the staff that will be arriving next year. After years of wearing her down, the underground hero Splatter will be joining the art and design department, and Etincelle, a French hero, has agreed to substitute while they are here next year working as part of a task force. I have also brought on an underground hero, Dilemma, to teach a class about paradoxes once a week to help her deal with negative quirk backlash. I encourage all of you to welcome these heroes with open arms when you see them next year. I have also attached a few documents regarding changes that I am making that are relevant to all of your departments, so please take a look. The principal of UA High School, Nedzu, Aizawa, logically, knew that he wasn't frozen in time. That didn't mean he wasn't sitting with his mouth closed in a grim line and his phone held tightly in one hand as he processed the content of the email. His husband pushed his glasses up his nose from across the table and waved a hand at Aizawa to get his attention. "All Might," Aizawa gritted out. "Yeah," Hisashi sighed, then seemed to register his negative reaction. "I mean, it's great that All Might will be teaching the next generation of heroes. I know that even before Midoriya you weren't that big of a fan, but he is the #1 hero. He definitely has things he can teach to our students that will make them better heroes." Aizawa grunted in affirmation and slid his phone back into his pocket. "But," he said, prompting Hisashi, "but I'm not sure about how good he would be as a teacher if he told our sweet little listener to give up his dreams while he was on a rooftop." Hisashi cringed as he finished talking. "I agree," Aizawa said flatly. "Well, either way, it'll be cool to work with Splatter. You and her collaborated on that Fight Club thing a while back, didn't you?" Hisashi attempted to change the topic. "Yes," he answered shortly. "And Etincelle, I've heard of their work. Hopefully I'll get them to guest star on my show before they go back to France. And Dilemma, you and her work really well together, don't you? You said you admired her efficiency even back when she was just starting out." Aizawa stared into his bowl of noodles, pushed them around with his chopsticks, and nodded. Hisashi let out an overdramatic sigh and put his elbows on the table, resting his chin on his hands. "Shada-la," he groaned. Aizawa frowned and set his chopsticks aside. He sighed. "I had this whole plan and All Might. Well, he kind of throws a wrench in it." "Oh babe," Hisashi whined. He stood up and marched to the other side of the table and wrapped Aizawa in a hug from behind his chair. He rocked Aizawa from side to side. "I'm sure it'll work out, darling." Aizawa rubbed his temple while his husband rocked him. "We can only hope." "Sweetheart," Enko called from the living room. "Is that you?" "Yeah," Izuku shouted down the hallway. "I thought you weren't getting back until later. Did something happen?" Enko gingerly set down her book on the coffee table as she stood up and then peeked around the corner to see her son slowly undoing his laces. Her son started. Enko watched as Izuku's fingers expertly untied the little bows on his shoes. He slipped the red sneakers off and then set them next to Enko's flats. "Not really." When he said that, he looked up, down the hallway, and made eye contact with his mother. Inko blinked. "Oh dear, are you all right?" Her baby had a band-aid on the side of his face, long and rectangular. Her fingers twitched at her side. Aizawa's lies got clogged in his throat. His brain spat back information at him as he hesitated on what to say. Aizawa seemed to know that he had lied about the cut. Would his mother be able to tell too? Now that she knew the truth, would she want to know the truth? Would lying be worse than just telling her? On my way there, some kids from my school threw rocks at me. A half-truth then. He would be honest about what she could see. Izuku doubted that his mother wanted to know that Kaken wasn't as nice of a young man as she thought. Why? His mother sounded terribly confused. Izuku realized that he had dreadfully underestimated just how much he would have to explain. His mother was still under the decidedly wrong impression that Izuku was not universally hated at school, that he maybe even had friends that he just didn't talk about. He also realized that he really didn't want to explain. He just wanted her to understand. But no one understood, because no one else he knew was quirkless. No one else was as useless as him. No one else could. Well, it's just Izuku found himself stumbling over his words, partly because he really did not want to explain, and partly out of genuine nerves. His mother seemed to realize how uncomfortable he was despite him trying his best to hide it. "It's all right, darling," she swallowed. "You must be hungry. I'll make you something before you go to bed so that you don't sleep on an empty stomach." Izuku finally rose up from his crouched position over his perfectly lined-up shoes and offered his mother a grateful smile. "Thanks, Mom." He followed behind her to the kitchen silently. The only noise in the apartment was the ticking of the clock and the shuffling of their socked feet against the hardwood. They separated at the end of the hallway. Inko made her way into the kitchen. She pulled leftover rice out of the fridge and set the lid in the sink before she popped the container in the microwave. Then she got out a pan from the cupboard and set it on the stove. She took the rice out to cool a bit. As she turned the burner onto medium heat, Inko looked at Izuku out of the corner of her eye. He still had his backpack on. He was curled up on one end of the couch. He looked so small with his cheek pressed against the arm of the couch, his knees tucked up under his chin. He had one hand squished under his cheek and the other held his phone in front of his face. She could only barely see the screen over his hair, but it looked like some kind of article. The screen was crowded with small text and very few paragraph breaks. Inko smiled as she shook some salt onto one hand and then wet her other hand under the facet. She started to shape the rice into triangles, even though she had missed so much about him. Even though she hadn't known to look for so many obvious signs of him pulling away. Sometimes Izuku was wonderfully predictable. To see him curled up, small and compact on the couch, with his backpack still on because he was too tired to put it up, but he didn't want to leave it on the ground on accident. It reminded her of hundreds of other times that she had seen him in just that stance. She set the rice triangles into the pan and picked out a spatula in preparation for flipping them so that they would brown on every side. She remembered when Izuku was in first grade that he stayed home with a stomach bug. Inko stayed with him. She had expected him to want to stay in his room all day, surrounded by his blankets and toys. To her surprise, however, he had parked himself on the couch. He was shaking and clutching his blanket in his hands, and she knew he would be more comfortable in his room, but he threw a fit when she tried to move him. Or as much of a fit as Izuku ever threw, which meant that he started mumbling all the reasons why he shouldn't move and picked at his nails while she tried to tune into whatever frequency he was speaking on. In the end, Izuku had explained to her that he didn't want to be all alone in his room, but also he didn't want her to have to sit with him when he knew that his room wasn't the best for adults, and he didn't want Mom to not do work because of him in it. Inko just shushed him and tucked him back into his place on the couch. She stroked his hair until he fell back into the fitful sleep that accompanied a sick child. She brushed the sides of the rice with soy sauce and then browned them the rest of the way. Inko pulled a plate out of the cupboard and set the 4 yaki onigiri she had thrown together onto it. She didn't have to say anything to shatter the odd silence that had fallen over them. When she looked up from making the plate, Izuku was already standing on the other side of the counter, a timid smile on his face. Inko had thought he was completely engrossed in what he was reading, but apparently she was wrong. Inko felt like she had been wrong about a lot of things lately. Inko slid the plate across the counter to Izuku. The ceramic scraped lightly over the counter as he dragged the food closer to him and then picked it up. They sat down together at the dinner table. "Thank you for the food," Izuku said before he dug in. Inko smiled in response. Too soon he was finished eating, and Inko watched him rise his plate and put it in the dishwasher. He waved at her before walking silently down the hallway to his room, finally removing his backpack. As Inko watched her son close his door behind him, she thought, "I am so much farther behind than I thought." Then she sat down at the family computer because if she was going to catch up, she was going to need to do some research. "So what are we WOAH?" Izuku shouted, instinctively dodging a punch that Aizawa threw at him. "Your reflexes are better than I thought they would be," Aizawa remarked. He had thrown the punch with less speed and force than usual, but he was still impressed. "With you being beaten up all the time, I just figured you couldn't move out of the way." Izuku blinked at him, visibly thrown off by his teacher's behavior. "So what are we?" Izuku stepped back as Aizawa swiped at his feet with a leg. "Sir, are you mad at me for making you wake up early? Because if so, oh my god." Izuku was now jogging away as Aizawa aimed another kick at him. "Today we're working on the basics of a fight. The basics being, don't get hit." Aizawa was in a completely different mood from yesterday. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that Izuku hadn't walked up to him with blood on his face this morning. Maybe it had something to do with the coffee he had brought his teacher. Maybe it was just Aizawa revealing his desire to pound Izuku to a pulp on the UA training mats. Aizawa lashed out again and Izuku ducked. This time, however, after he came back up, Aizawa had hands on his shoulders and arms, a strand of his scarf pulling his leg into place. You want to stay light on your feet so that you can move and change direction without pausing or losing momentum. Izuku settled into the stance that Aizawa had pulled him into and looked up at him for approval. Good. Aizawa nodded. Aizawa explained it to Izuku like this. Izuku needed to increase his physical prowess and he needed to learn the basics of fighting. Aizawa was a teacher, but he wasn't a martial arts specialist. Izuku would have to find another teacher or pursue self-study if he wanted to become a master. Aizawa was teaching Izuku the basics of Bakugo, one of the martial arts that he had studied while he was developing his style, but one that Aizawa had ultimately dropped because it didn't mesh well with his capture weapon. Aizawa had stressed that they were focusing on building Izuku's general skills. They weren't going to be able to perfect anything over one break, and that Izuku shouldn't stress over doing anything perfectly. That he was going to give Izuku a training schedule to work on once the break was over, daily exercises to complete, both physical and mental. And he made Izuku promise to continue their daily calls when Aizawa wouldn't be able to see him every day. He ran Izuku through a list of goals and told him not to push himself too far. Bakugo, Aizawa told him, was very good for your fitness and overall health. The constant turning and spinning movements stimulate the joints and muscles to provide a workout for many areas of the body that are not normally exercised. These movements also stimulate acupuncture cavities by compressing and relaxing the muscles around them. Izuku was already fast and Aizawa could see that he was building strength. So when they were together they would work on form and flexibility. Things that Izuku couldn't do by himself, things he needed a teacher for. That first week passed in a blur of learning forms and stretches and exercises. The thing that they were focusing on the most was walking the circle. After the first lesson where Aizawa had taught him a few of the forms for walking the circle, he had looked up the technique. Bakugo used movement as its foundation. The movements were always changing, spinning and turning in curvilinear patterns. The practice of circle walking is Bakugo's characteristic method of stance and movement training. Practitioners walk around the edge of the circle in various low stances, facing the center, and periodically change direction as they execute forms. For a beginner like Izuku, the circle was 6 to 12 feet in diameter, but as he improved the circle would get smaller and smaller. Students first learn flexibility and proper body alignment through the basic exercises and then move on to more complex forms. Aizawa was the best teacher that Izuku had ever had. Going into the whole thing, Izuku was scared that when Aizawa realized he wasn't as promising and full of potential as Aizawa thought he was, that his teacher would change. His brisk but kind personality would transform into one of pity and anger. He would finally fall into one of the categories that seemed to dominate Izuku's life, and Izuku would have to spend the rest of the break with someone a lot more like one of his past teachers. Maybe he would turn out like Yumeda-sensei, his second-grade teacher, who would insist Izuku eat lunch with her every day instead of going outside with the other kid. She would keep him back during recess, smiling at him and helping him with puzzles that she'd bought especially for her favorite student. But Izuku didn't think that he was her favorite student, even back then. He would sit in a chair at the table she set the puzzles on and kick his feet back and forth and put the puzzle together piece by piece. Yumeda-sensei would sit across from him and talk to him about how pretty the picture was turning out. Izuku remembered, vividly, begging her the third week of second grade to let him go outside. Please let him go play. Yumeda-sensei would tilt her head and ask in that lilting voice of hers why he would want to go outside when none of the other kids would play with him. Why would he want to go outside when Kezue-kun had thrown sand at him every day for the first week? He spent that whole school year putting random puzzles together in the classroom while the rest of the class played outside. At some point she just had him do the same puzzles from the beginning of the year again because she wasn't willing to buy more. Izuku was exceptionally good at puzzles. Looking back, Izuku was sure that she hadn't been trying for creepy and controlling, but that was where she had landed in Izuku's mind. Yumeda-sensei was firmly in the pity category. Maybe Aizawa would turn out like Haga-sensei. If Yumeda had been a merciful teacher, then Haga-sensei would be the opposite. Izuku liked him infinitely more. As a third-grade teacher, he was fine. As their PE teacher, the students adored him. He was the type of PE teacher that didn't care what you were doing as long as you were participating in whatever sport they were playing that month. You did the warm-ups. You helped set up supplies. You were set. unless you were Izuku. When they introduced themselves on their first day of class, an unneeded ritual at that point because most of them had known each other for 2 years, he had looked up sharply when Izuku told everyone what they already knew, that he was quirkless. It had stopped being a thing for Izuku. He just wanted to get his introduction over with, condemn himself to any new students, and reaffirm his weakness for the 3rd time to the rest of his classmates. Later, during PE, Haga-sensei took one look at him and made him run the track. Izuku remembers the sinking feeling in his stomach when he did it the next day and the next after that. It was a slow and painful realization for a young Izuku. He was already barred from games of tag and hide and seek during recess. Losing team sports hurt. Even if he was always the last pick, he had at least known that he would get picked. Haga-sensei took that away. Haga-sensei was fine during class. He even called on Izuku to answer questions. He was Izuku's personal tormentor during PE. Not in an overt way. If any of the faculty had stopped by, they would have seen nothing wrong with the picture. Just Izuku, separate from the game of soccer or kickball or floor hockey or whatever the rest of the class was playing so that he could run track. They would probably tut at him over the imaginary disobedience that had landed him there. He couldn't say that Haga-sensei hated him, because he was a child and it was hard to hate a child even if they were useless garbage. But with Haga-sensei, Izuku came close to thinking that yes, his sensei did hate him. It probably had to do with the fact that Haga-sensei had never actually looked him in the eye that year. Or maybe it had more to do with the fact that in 3rd grade Izuku hated running. Izuku had recently rediscovered just how good he was at running, and he had Haga-sensei to thank for that. Or maybe Aizawa would turn out like Furutani-sensei. There was nothing wrong with Furutani-sensei except for her complete disinterest in all things Izuku. She was the one who watched over the rim of her glasses as Kaken shoved him into a janitor's closet and his lackeys set a chair under the handle so that he couldn't get out. Furutani-sensei wasn't overly patronizing like Yumeda, and she wasn't overly cruel like Haga. It was just that when other kids were getting teased or pushed around, she would interrupt with harsh words for the instigators. And she would never do that for Izuku. Izuku could remember her eyes with a clarity that pained him. He didn't know what her quirk was, but he was absolutely certain that it had something to do with her eyes. Her stone-cold eyes. They were slate gray, the color of cinder blocks and concrete and pavement, the color of being trapped. Her glasses toned them down. They were thick and circular, and they muddled the horrible harshness that lurked in her irises. But whenever she looked at Izuku, it was always over her glasses and down her nose. So not only was the layer of protection gone, but gravity accelerated her gaze until it felt like a punch to the face. When all the kids had left the school, and Izuku had given up banging on the door because he knew his mom would figure things out eventually, or at least the janitor would find him, only then did Furutani-sensei open the closet door. Izuku heard her drag away the chair to its place, and when a crack of light came through the door, he opened his mouth to say thanks, only to see her skirt flare out elegantly behind her as she turned to walk away, her heels clicking against the tile at a steady pace. Izuku had watched her walk down the entire hallway through the crack in the door, the light casting a pale line over his body while the rest remained in shadow with the cleaning supplies. She had looked back only once, as she turned the corner toward the teacher parking lot. When their eyes met, he pushed the door the rest of the way open so that she could see the hole in his shirt and the untreated burn that lay beneath. It was one of the ones that scared him. Every time he saw it in the mirror, 2 pairs of eyes laid over each other in his mind, gray and red mixing together into a gaze that made him tug his shirt the rest of the way down hurriedly. Izuku was deathly afraid that his and Aizawa's whole cool, rad mentor-mentee relationship would turn out to be smoke and mirrors. He was afraid that at some point he would have to watch Aizawa walk away from him, and Izuku would be left in the dark again. But it wasn't. Izuku had been falling for so long that it felt almost wrong to go up. His whole life people have been pushing him toward the edge. Mean words became gentle breezes, punches and kicks became bursts of warm air, zeros on his report card were sharp jabs of ice-cold wind, until he was finally out over sanding water. The wind could touch him, but it couldn't hurt him anymore. He had already made his choice, and he was floating toward his demise peacefully. No regrets, no hard ground to land on. It was almost impossible to catch something like a feather. It swooped and danced as it descended, its shape lending it to odd feats of aerodynamics that made it hard to predict where you should lay your hand to grasp it. Aizawa didn't use his hand to pull Izuku back over the edge. He used his capture scarf. Izuku kind of wanted to hate him, just a little bit. He wanted to hold Aizawa responsible for what he knew was going to be a painful trip back to land. After all, Aizawa had broken his trust, hadn't he? He had told his mother the one thing Izuku asked him not to. But he couldn't. Aizawa was nice, much like how Mei was nice. Nice without ulterior motives. Nice because it was in their nature to be nice. Aizawa wasn't nice in the same way. No, of course not. Could you imagine that? No, Aizawa covered his kind heart in a layer of harsh words and scary fashion choices. But despite his best efforts, it leaked through in the way that he would absent-mindedly ruffle Izuku's hair when he did something well, or how he would grin creepily down at his phone whenever his husband texted him, or how he would stop to pet cats that caught his attention on the way to the train station every day. He couldn't dislike Aizawa because he did not and would never fit into any of the categories that had dominated Izuku's social life for the past 15 years. Izuku knew that he was slow to trust. They had been talking for months and meeting in person before this possibility even dawned on him. But now that it had, he was certain. That race he was running with Aizawa, the one with the beach, Izuku was most definitely going to lose. As he moved through more of the forms Aizawa had taught him, Izuku thought that he wouldn't mind losing at all. He should probably start looking up a good woodworker to help him with the pier though.